He was a rising blade in the Miram until the woman he loved died. While searching for her soul, he got pulled into another world. No glory, just a journey from Ice Cream Man to Lord of the Northern Land. He sharpened his sword, conquered the frozen north, and earned titles, land, and an army of northern warriors. Now they call him the Ice Lord. But he didn't build this kingdom for power. He built it to be with her again. Let's go. One rainy night, the carriage was attacked, and the warriors fought back, but lost many men. Their commander gritted his teeth and asked how long they would continue to attack. Their opponents were still full of strength, but suddenly they all pounced on them at once, and they began to repel their attacks. A man from the enemy squad attacked the man, telling him to die already, and he, stepping to the side, dodged his blow and struck him with a heavy sword, inflicting a deep wound on his shoulder. He managed to wound several more people besides him, and they realized that these cuts were endless. The man cursed through his teeth and, remembering those people, thought that they had made a deal, and then they stabbed him in the back like that. But he must protect his master. He ordered his comrades to hold on with all their might. Help was already on the way. Then the leader of the enemy squad appeared, showed him the heads of his comrades, and asked, by help, he meant these idiots? He threw the heads right at his feet, and he thought in horror, were their reinforcements destroyed? He looked up at the banner on the enemy's clothes and nervously wondered who he was. It was the leader of the Miram Alliance, the first sword that pierces the sky. Dan Chunhak. He surveyed the battlefield and noted that the strength of the ice pavilion was truly formidable. They were able to resist them. The man chuckled and said that he was surprised that he had the courage to be so self-confident. If he met the master himself, he would be in trouble. The alliance leader's subordinates immediately became angry and began threatening to cut out his tongue for such words, and at that moment, Hwine climbed out of the carriage and asked them to wait. Her loyal warrior worriedly pronounced her name, and she said that everything was fine and that he should not worry about her. Dan Chunhak ordered his warriors to retreat, and she approached him. Looking up at him, she called him father, and he said that not only had she been deceived by those monkeys, but she had also run away from home. He had never been so disgraced. He extended his hand to her and said that, however, everyone makes mistakes and can be forgiven. As her father, he would give her one last chance to return. She was smart, so she would understand what choice she must make. She looked worriedly at the exhausted warriors and asked if he would let them live if she returned. Her father remained silent, giving her a menacing look that immediately made her tremble. Tears welled up in her eyes and she asked him for forgiveness. She refused to leave with him. Dan Chunhak remained silent, listening to the sound of the rain, after which he drew his sword, and the warrior immediately rushed to Hwine's aid. But the alliance leader was cruel to his daughter. He swung his sword sharply, inflicting a huge wound on her chest, and her warrior extended his hand to him, ordering him to stop. After this, Hwine fell, and Dan Chunhak said that he no longer had a daughter. She had fallen under the influence of the orcs. Now their only mission was to reclaim the soul of the Central Plains. He ordered his warriors to restore order here, and they immediately rushed into battle. Hwine's subordinate swung his sword, killing 3 at once, and ordered the rest to fight to the end. Their swords clashed again in battle, and Hwine, lying on the cold ground among the dead, looked at the warriors and thought that she should return, but she remembered her lover and apologized to him for not being able to keep her promise. She would definitely return next time. Soon, thunder rumbled over the palace of the Northern Sea, and the master of the palace, Sol Mudok, received grim news. The members of the Ice Pavilion, including Lord Bai Muyu, who had sent a messenger to negotiate with the Martial Alliance, clashed with the Murim Alliance and were annihilated. Mudok's icy energy immediately flared, spreading throughout the palace. He rose from his chair and furiously declared that this was unforgivable. He would never forgive them for this. He would wipe every single one of them from the face of the earth. He ordered his warriors to prepare. They were heading for the Central Plains. Immediately after, they set out. Amid the snow-capped mountains stood the palace. Their destination was there. Dan Chunhak, who had fought all night, sighed heavily and looked back at his dead warriors, wondering if they had been destroyed. His profound strength was exhausted. Was this really the end? He looked up at the Lord of the Northern Sea and told him to just kill him already. But first, he wanted to ask him one question. He approached him and asked in a rage, why did he kill her? For what sins? The man laughed and asked, he still didn't understand. The leader's daughter loved a barbarian like him. Wouldn't it be a big mistake to let her live? Mudok remained silent. After receiving the answer, he extended his hand towards him, and he said with a smirk that he could take over Jemnan, but he would not get what he wanted most. After these words, a beam of icy energy pierced his body, and he thought, is this how it will end? He remembered his daughter, how she grew up, ran away from home and betrayed her own father, getting involved with this barbarian, and then he killed her. He was furious and indignant. Why did she do this? That night, with the death of the leader of the Murim Alliance, Dan Chunhak, the great bloody battle that lasted for half a year came to an end. The living legend of the Northern Sea, Master Sol Mudok, killed him, and that's when he became the undisputed ruler of the Central Plains. However, he showed no emotion. He simply quietly averted his gaze to the moon. Time passed, and in his ice palace, only the red flower he loved to look at remained. He remembered how the flower appeared here. That evening, he was sitting in his study and working, but then Hwine suddenly ran into the room, joyfully calling him. She showed him a pot of flower and told him to look at it. Finally, the flower of love had bloomed. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked, "Is this the flower that blooms only when two people truly love each other?" She confirmed it, and with tears in her eyes, said that she never doubted her feelings, although she was so hurt that the flower of love did not bloom for a long time. But now the flower has bloomed, and it is so beautiful. It wasn't just her one-sided love, he sincerely loves her too. She burst into tears even more, and he hugged her, asking who else he could love if not her. She smiled widely in response. And now, looking at this flower, he thought that he was so grateful to her. He must fill the entire garden with flowers of love, for her sake. No matter how hard he tried, he could not forget her. He touched the flower, and something amazing happened. It bloomed again. Not understanding how this was possible, he called his subordinate Muyang, and ordered him to find someone who could explain what had happened before his eyes. Let him find this person, even if he had to search the entire Central Plains. Muyang went to carry out his order, and just a few days later, the Monbakja, who are said to know everything in the world, gathered in the ice palace of the Northern Sea. The scientists did not know why they were there, and suddenly a voice came from the sky, ordering them to appear. The people, although nervous, went outside to check what was going on, and a stunning view opened up before them. The entire garden was filled with red flowers. The old man sat down to look at it closer and said with delight that for the first time in his life, he saw a garden filled with the flowers of love. You would never see such a flower in your life. The symbol for love is inscribed on the stems. It's incredible. But how can there be so many of such rare flowers here? Smiling, watching their enthusiastic reaction, Mudok approached them and asked if they liked the flowers. They immediately turned around, admiringly telling him that this is wonderful, and asked who he was. When he told them his name, they were very surprised because they had just met the absolute ruler of the Central Plains. He said that, as they all knew, this garden was filled with the flowers of love. He and his beloved made the garden bloom with their love, but when she died, the flower also died. However, for some reason, a few days ago, the flower was reborn. The scientists were very surprised. At first they didn't believe him, and he said that he saw it with his own eyes. Now they began to ponder this. It was a very strange case, truly a mystery, and one of the old men said that there was one possibility. Mudok immediately approached him and asked with a serious face what this possibility was. He became nervous and told him that there was the possibility of being reborn in a new body. In other words, reincarnation. It seemed that the deceased love of the palace master was reincarnated somewhere in this world. He exclaimed, "Is this true?" He answered him that if this is not so, then there is no other explanation for the flower of love to bloom again. He smiled and touched his chin in puzzlement, thinking, is this really reincarnation? He finally had hope. He managed to enter the Central Plains and unite the entire region, fulfilling the wish of the Northern Sea. But all that was left for him was emptiness. The Northern Sea is thriving, and his longing for Huan only grows. He lost her and found no meaning in living. He asked the old man to quickly explain how they could find her, and he said that, according to rumors, the love flower glows when two lovers are in the same place. When the master of the palace finds his beloved, the love flower will shine. Now that MC thought about it, he remembered that the love flower that Huan brought glowed. He didn't attach any significance to it at the time, but there must have been some secret to it. The old man said that it would be difficult for him to carry a living flower with him, so he suggests turning it into jewelry so that he could carry it with him. Mudok said that he would entrust everything to them then. They would go in line for 10 days, so let them finish by then. If everything goes well, he would reward each of them with 100 gold coins. The scientists were almost speechless from what they heard. They immediately set off to carry out the task, and MC entered the palace. He thought he would never see her again, but now he had hope again, and he would not abandon it. Wherever she was, even in hell, he would follow her, so let her wait for him. Many days passed, and all this time, the ship was moving from one point on the map to another. At the moment, Mudok was in the hold, looking at the map. The last thing they hadn't searched was Hainan. 3 years and 5 months had passed since he started looking for her, but having searched the entire central part of the country, he still couldn't find her. During all the time they were looking for Huan, he had gone from the transformation level to the profound level, and had experienced complete metamorphosis twice. Wyong, she must be here. He touched his necklace made from the flower of love and thought of his beloved, namely, the day she left for the negotiations. As soon as she told him about this, he slammed his fist on the table in anger and exclaimed that she didn't have to go. Why was she going there? She told him that her father had decided to take part in these negotiations, and if she went, he would definitely understand his intentions. He disagreed, saying it could be a trap, and she said that she wanted to trust her father at least this time and let him let her go. MC remained silent, thinking about it, but since she wanted it so much, he couldn't do anything and allowed her. But if she felt something was wrong, then she should leave there without hesitation. Wyan was very happy and took out a necklace from her pocket and asked him to accept it. It was a keepsake left to her by her late mother. She said that the necklace had the ability to return to the one who gave it. This necklace would always guide her back to him, so he shouldn't worry, she would never leave him. Now, remembering it, he sighed heavily and thought that he should have stopped her at all costs. Feeling the shaking, he woke up and heard shouts from the deck that they were caught in a storm. People began grabbing at everything, and tying themselves with ropes to keep from falling overboard. And Mudok quickly dressed and went out on deck. The sudden storm seemed strange to him, and at that moment he noticed something large out of the corner of his eye. A huge wave towered over the starboard side. He immediately assumed a fighting stance and used a defensive chi technique, a 1,000-kilogram hammer. Thanks to this, he was able to stay on deck when the wave completely engulfed the ship, but the others had a hard time. People were scattered in all directions, falling off the ship. Seeing a little girl clinging to the railing and calling out for her mother who had fallen overboard, MC cursed and knew he had to do something about it. Using telekinesis, he gathered several planks around the ship and then threw them overboard, helping the people stay afloat. He looked back and thought that was enough for now, when an old man next to him looked up in horror and warned the others that another wave was approaching. This time much larger. The people were terrified. They could only hold on tight. Realizing the ship couldn't withstand it any longer, Mudok imbued his sword with the power of ice and began releasing the energy. The people felt the deck suddenly become colder, while MC prepared a technique to freeze the waves. But just as he was about to use it, his necklace suddenly began to glow. A bright golden beam of light shot into the sky, beginning to gather water around itself, thereby breaking the wave. Mudok's feet lifted off the deck, as if something had violently lifted him, and then the column of light disappeared along with a huge wave, leaving a bright flash amidst the clouds. The old man shielded his face from the bright light, unable to believe his eyes, and a second later, the clouds dispersed and the sea became calm. No one understood what had just happened. MC woke up in a cramped space, in some kind of carriage. He clutched his head and wondered what he was doing here. After all, he had just fought a storm. Suddenly, a scream rang out. He immediately got up to check where the sound was coming from, and saw several people running from huge flies and children hiding in the forest. The man and boy told them that they would save them, and at that moment a roar was heard behind them, and the carriage was cut in half. The man was terrified. It was a first-class carriage after all, and then Mudok emerged from a cloud of dust and said that he had probably ended up in a forest somewhere in the Central Plains. But something confused him. These were foreigners in front of him, which meant he was quite far away. Seeing a bunch of huge flies behind their backs, he was horrified. He had never seen anything like this in his domain before. One of the flies flew at him, and he dodged the blow by simply tilting his head to the side, then used a divine ice shot to freeze the insect. After that, the ice shattered into many pieces, killing the fly, and he asked how dare a simple creature attack a man just because it had grown in size. He could not forgive such a thing. He turned to the insects, then rushed forward, and quickly froze every fly in the area, and when the ice exploded, he said that this was more than enough for such worthless bugs. The people were surprised. They probably had never seen anything like this before. After that, they approached him, and the man said something to him with a smile, but he didn't understand it. He bowed to him and said something else, but MC didn't even understand what language he was speaking. He thought about what he meant. It looked like gratitude, but he wasn't sure. He said, confused, that he didn't understand their foreign dialects. Is there anyone here who speaks the language of the Central Plains? They looked at him, puzzled, and shrugged, and he thought that maybe they didn't understand him. After that, the two men started discussing something, and Mudok asked if anyone among them knew the language of the Central Plains. While he was thinking about how to explain his words, an excited guy ran up to the man and said something to him, after which he handed over a ring. As soon as the man put it on his finger, the language interpretation spell was activated, and for some reason he took a very eccentric and dynamic pose. MC felt uneasy about this. After this, the man asked, does he now understand what he is saying? And indeed, he really did understand him. He noticed that he suddenly spoke the language of the Central Plains very well. Is that the power of this ring? The man laughed and confirmed it. It seems that this is the language of a place called the Central Plains. Now he will introduce himself to him again. His name is Edmund Roll, and he leads the Roll Merchant Guild. He called him a magic swordsman and thanked him for saving the members of his guild. What is his name? MC, puzzled, answered him that they did not know what a magic swordsman was, but his name was Seol Mudok. Edmund was slightly surprised that he did not know such a thing and explained to him that a magic swordsman is a person who uses a sword and magic together, just like him. But Mudok didn't even know what magic was, which made the man even more taken aback, and he thought, he just shot ice in front of their eyes and doesn't know what magic is? Where is he even from? He was thinking about how to explain this to him, and MC waved his hand in front of him, calling out to him, but he didn't pay attention to him, as he was deeply immersed in his thoughts. This started to irritate him. He threatened him with ice and exclaimed that he asked him a question. Can't he answer him faster? This scared him a lot. He immediately moved away from him and thought that he was definitely crazy. He just told him that he doesn't know what it is, so how is he going to explain it to him? What if that crazy guy starts acting up here? He nervously asked him to calm down and said that he would explain everything to him now. Late in the evening, the man finally finished explaining everything to him, and now, sitting by the fire, Mudok asked if something called magic really existed in this part of the Central Plains. The world was so big. Edmund sighed with relief, having finally managed to calm him down, and asked where this place called the Central Plains was. MC looked at him as if he were some kind of idiot, and asked if he'd come here without even knowing where it was. But the man genuinely didn't understand what he was talking about, and he explained to him that he was saying this because it was stupid to ask where the central plain was while in their lands. His words only made Edmund more convinced that he was crazy, and told him that this place wasn't the Central Plains, but a forest on the way to Barkhan, the capital of the Drake Kingdom. Of course, Mudok didn't believe him and began to attack him. He rudely called him a foreigner and told him to listen carefully. In his entire life, he had never heard anyone call the Central Plains something like Drake. He didn't look that old, but hadn't he already started to go dementia? Edmund became angry. Who else here attributes dementia to whom? He answered with an irritated smile that he was only 50. On the contrary, he was worried about him, since he continued to insist that this place was the Central Plains. MC was indignant and exclaimed that he understood everything, then pointed to the boy hiding behind a tree and said that in that case, they could just ask that guy. Edmund called out to Leo and asked how he got here. The boy awkwardly walked up to them, and Mudok asked if this was the Central Plains or Drake. Leo was confused and looked up at him with displeasure, asking why he wasn't answering him. Edmund said that no matter what he said, Leo couldn't understand his words. He gave him a ring and told him to put it on his finger and say language interpretation, after which he thought that, although it was wasteful to provide such expensive magic to this crazy guy, he couldn't allow him to treat him like a feeble-minded old man. MC put on the ring and said the words, after which the knowledge crept into his head, and now he could understand what these foreigners were saying. He looked at the two men chatting with a smile and thought that this was an incredible spell. After that, he turned to the child and asked his name. He told him his name and said that he would ask him one question. Is this the Central Plains or Drake? Leo looked at him slightly confused and asked where the Central Plains were. Now they were in the forest, located on the way to Barkhan, the capital of the Drake Kingdom. He expected him to say something completely different and exclaimed in bewilderment, is he also feeble-minded? After that, he turned to the man and asked, was he the one who asked the child to answer him like that? Edmund jumped up from his seat and began to defend himself, saying that this was not true at all. If he had any doubts, then he should ask everyone in the guild. Mudok thought that since he said that, it did not seem like he was lying. Does this mean that these really are not the Central Plains? And then he remembered. He had fought the storm on the ship until the very end, but when he opened his eyes, he was already in a carriage. Did this mean that he had moved through space? This news greatly shocked him. He jumped up from his seat and asked in confusion, so this isn't the Central Plain, but the Drake Kingdom? At that moment, something inside his chest changed. He felt a strange feeling in his dantian. Because of this, he sat back down and clutched his chest with a heavy sigh, and the man asked, now does he believe him? But he had no time for him now. He was focused on the energy. It was different from anything he had ever experienced. Realizing that something was clearly wrong, he headed into the forest to make sure of something. This was a different, pure energy. Definitely different from the energy of the Central Plains. Leaping high, he rose above the forest and then applied himself and released his energy, causing the air around him to instantly cool. So he learned that the amount of chi accumulated in his dantian had doubled compared to the usual amount. But why was he here and not in the Central Plains? He rushed forward, wanting to quickly find his beloved, and then his gaze fell on the necklace, and he wondered if it was because of the light that emanated from the crystal at that moment. Wen said that this necklace could return to the one who gave it. In that case, most likely, he came here to meet her. He sank to the ground and thought that she was definitely here. After that, he returned to the camp and Edmund irritably asked, what was that? Where did he suddenly disappear to? Would he care to explain to them where he was? MC approached him and said with a smile that he had some business, so he left for a while. And he also had one more question for him. Edmund even became nervous. His smile seemed unpleasant to him. Mudok said that according to a boy named Leo, this place is called Drake. Is this true? The man confirmed it and said that if they keep moving, they will soon be able to reach Barkhan, the capital of this kingdom. MC asked him to explain again where it was, and then a boy named Luffy chimed in with a mischievous smile and asked that since he didn't know where this place was, it seemed he trained in the mountains. He had heard a lot about weirdos like them, but this was the first time he saw one in real life. Mudok laughed at him and said that everything was right. He trained in the mountains and only came out into the world today, so he doesn't know anything about what's going on. After that, he thought, Barkhan, the kingdom of Drake. These are all names of places he's never heard of before. Maybe he can learn more from this guy. Since only foreigners live here, he'd like to think that it would be a country of Western barbarians, which he's only heard about in stories. The boy was delighted and offered to teach him something. And as soon as he agreed, he laughed and told him to follow him. MC followed him and decided to get to know him. Meanwhile, Edmund looked after them with displeasure and thought, why did he suddenly become so friendly? This guy is so disgusting. He is too unpredictable a person. That night, Mudok began to study this place and the language they used from Luffy. He couldn't believe it, but it turned out that this wasn't even the country of the Western barbarians. It was a completely different world. The terrain looks strange, and the letters are different from those in the Central Plains. In this world, there are not only other races, such as elves and dwarves, but also similar races, such as beastmen, and the most powerful creatures in this world are dragons, which are winged lizards, or something like that. There is also some kind of warp magic. As Luffy explained to him, this magic can be used by wizards of the 5th circle and above. To do this, you need to draw a round magic circle on the floor and say the spell. After that, the magician can instantly travel wherever he wants. They say that the better the magician's abilities, the farther he can travel. In short, there are spells here that are completely impossible to understand. Now he wonders how many more such amazing things are in this world. While Luffy was enthusiastically explaining something to him, he looked at the sky and saw something that amazed him. There were as many as 3 moons. He smiled nervously and thought that now he should definitely admit that this is another world that does not exist anywhere in the Central Plains. He touched the necklace and thought, did Hwen really call him here? Suddenly, a loud scream was heard. A man called out to Sabine and told her to stop. MC immediately looked towards the sound and wondered what that noise was. Sabine shouted back at him that she would not stop. Let them not dare come closer, or she will kill them all. Now she was in a panic, and for some reason she took Annie hostage. The men cautiously approached her, asking her not to do this, and one of them, named Henry, said that he was sure that as soon as they reached the capital, they would be able to cure them, because there were many mages there. He would ask Edmund for a favor, so she should not scare Annie like that. She sharply waved the knife and asked, did he think she was a fool? Even in the capital, mage healers are rare, and even if they are, he knows how much money they will demand. Assassin bug eggs settle in the heart, and it is unknown at what point they can turn into larvae, so how can anyone cure it? Henry did not know what to answer to this, and she screamed with tears in her eyes that if the eggs turned into larvae, she and Annie would be torn apart. After that, she swung the knife and said that it would be better for them to die before that happened, while they were still whole. But before she could do so, Mudok ordered her to stop and said that he roughly understood the situation. Using telekinesis, he snatched the knife from her hands and said that he would heal them, so there was no need for a weapon. Sabine looked at him in surprise because she hadn't noticed how he had appeared there at all, and he asked them to sit down. The treatment was urgent. Edmund asked if he knew how to use healing magic. He answered that he didn't understand magic. He just knew a little about the healing methods of the place where he lived. So first of all, they needed to calm down. The men were glad that they had hope, after which Edmund grabbed Mudok's hand and asked him to save the children. He can't give him a gift because he has nothing, but he will do everything in his power to help him. He pulled away from him irritably and said that he was going to do it for free. He will start the treatment now, so let them step back a little. Edmund immediately pushed everyone aside, and MC approached the girls and told them not to be too nervous. It won't take long. He went behind them, and when they sat down, he asked them to close their eyes and relax. They did everything as he said, after which he also sat down and touched their backs with his palms. It was said that insect eggs are located near the heart, and he decided to check if this was true. After that, his eyes widened. The eggs were indeed there. Fortunately, they hadn't hatched yet. Now he needs to control his energy so as to burn the eggs without harming the heart. Cold began to emanate from his hands. The frost penetrated their bodies, reached the heart. They both exhaled cold air, and Mudok looked at them thoughtfully, checking for eggs, then stood up and said with a smile that everything was ready. They both turned to him in surprise and exclaimed, "Is this true?" He said that he removed all the insect eggs, so now they can rest easy. Everyone else was also surprised by this news, and Edmund and Leo asked, "Are Sabine and Annie safe?" He confirmed it and told the girls that there will be no side effects, so they don't have to worry. They both sincerely thanked him, after which all the guild members also bowed to him in gratitude, and he waved them with a smile and left. When he was alone, he sighed heavily, and sitting under a tree, looked at the sky and thought that the day had been long. Today he misses Hwan even more. He looked at the 3 moons and wished that they would meet again soon. A new day had dawned. They set off and were already approaching the walls of the capital. However, it was especially hot today, making the journey difficult. Mudok even had to tie his hair back. Luffy, hearing his heavy sigh, offered him some water, and he took the flask, thinking it was barely warm. He released some cold energy to cool the water, then drank it, and the boy said it was so hot here. "Is he okay?" He replied that he was indeed hot, but a little better than before. Luffy noticed a strange sound coming from his flask, and suddenly Mudok shoved it in his face, causing him to cry out. The flask was terribly cold. He told the boy to take it, and he exclaimed in surprise, "Why is it so cold?" He laughed and advised him to take a sip of water, and as soon as he touched the neck of the flask, he felt his mouth fill with cold. After that, he immediately perked up and became very happy. MC laughed, pleased with his reaction, and asked, "The water is refreshing, right?" Then Luffy excitedly handed him his canteen and asked if he could freeze it. He didn't really want to do it, but since this kid had been a big help to him, he agreed. After that, he used the ice technique on his canteen, and he happily exclaimed that it was so cool. And when Mudok looked away from him, he saw everyone crowding around them. They all handed him their canteens, excitedly asking him to freeze their water. And he thought it was easy, but he was afraid that fulfilling this request would cause even more problems. Edmund, who still didn't know what the reason for the noise was, approached them and asked them to explain what was going on. Luffy told him that the magic swordsman made his water ice cold, and everyone who saw it wanted it too. As soon as he said these words, Edmund called out to the magical swordsman enticingly, and he asked suspiciously what was the matter. After that, the man knelt in front of him and handed him his flask, asking if he could make his water cold. MC stared at him in shock, then sighed heavily and agreed to do so. While he should be away from the guild and exploring this place, they helped him solve the main problem, the language barrier, so he could cool their water. Edmund thanked him, and as soon as he took the first sip, he felt a strange taste. He inquired how he produced this ice, and he asked if there were any problems. Not at all. The man exclaimed with delight that it was incredibly delicious. He had tried all the types of ice sold on the continent, but this was the first time he had tasted such delicious. This is truly a completely different level. This ice cannot even be compared to any other. It is truly delicious. Mudok, confused, told him that he simply froze water, and now he was saying it tasted different. What did he mean? He explained that ice creation typically utilizes the cold properties of mana in the air to either freeze water directly or collect moisture from the atmosphere. During this process, mana impurities are added to the ice, and these impurities determine the ice's flavor. However, since every wizard has a different affinity for mana, few can make pure ice, but his ice was incredibly pure, which is why it tasted so good. MC touched his chin in confusion and understood why there was such an enthusiastic response. If they had such a reaction to something as simple as ice, he almost felt sorry for them. Since he was in a good mood, he decided to make them more ice, but Edmund stopped him, and he asked in confusion what was going on, and the man excitedly said he had a proposition for him. A few days passed, and work was already in full swing. The men carried buckets of water to the store, and Mudok froze them, producing incredibly delicious ice. Seeing his skill, the guild workers applauded him and immediately returned to work, leaving him lost in thought. The day Edmund told him of his proposal, he was slightly stunned and even outraged. He planned to rebuild his trading guild's business by selling the ice he made. But this wasn't even surprising to him, since he kept talking about how great his ice was and what a great wizard he was. All this time he had ulterior motives. Edmund said that fourth circle mages who can create ice are usually overconfident, which results in low-quality ice, so they should focus on a niche market. However, he didn't think there was any malicious intent behind it, and it seemed he just wanted to restore his lost reputation. He didn't seem to be very cunning, but he didn't want to do this just like that, so he decided to bargain. He said that since he was making the ice, and they were just going to sell it, he would take 70% of the proceeds, and they would take 30%. Edmund was a little taken aback at first, and weighed everything carefully. The ice would sell very well, so it was a good offer, but he could try to bargain further. He said that in order to sell the ice, he would have to hire not only a van to transport the ice, but also workers to pull the van and a magician to make sure the ice didn't melt. In short, he would need a fairly large investment, so let him make at least some concessions. MC immediately agreed and offered to split the proceeds 60-40, which shocked the man. It had been too easy for him. After that, he immediately offered him a contract, and that's how Mudok ended up here. He agreed to the deal simply because he thought it was a good place to explore the world, but things were going better than he expected. While they were working, Henry suddenly ran into the store and told the boss that he should go out for a while. They were curious about his out-of-breath appearance when he came outside. He saw a bunch of people who came for ice. He asked them to form a line, but they didn't even try to listen to him and kept making noise. Then the MC ordered them all to be quiet. His voice sounded right in their heads. He left the store and asked them all to remain quiet in the store. If they started making noise again, they would all be thrown out of here, so they should pay attention. They all immediately calmed down and became quiet. After which Edmund said that they only sell ice with experience. If they came here to make a small purchase, they would have to leave. In the future, they might sell small quantities, but for now, they don't do that. A woman was indignant, having come all this way specifically for this ice, and others began begging him to sell it to them. But one menacing glare from Mudok immediately silenced them. After that, they left, cursing at the waste of their time, and MC waved goodbye with a smile, while Edmund asked everyone who remained to come to him. In the end, only 3 remained: a man from the Meiji Merchant Guild, Benjamin, the butler of the Count's slave family, and a representative of the Arista family. Edmund was very happy. The Meiji Merchant Guild is one of the top 10 on the continent, and these families are very respected. He knew he could make a lot of money, but he never thought he'd be so lucky, and all thanks to the magical swordsman. Although the guild hasn't been fully restored yet, if it weren't for him, they wouldn't have had this opportunity. He offered the magical swordsman a break, and he asked if the part about when he was busy was over. He confirmed this and said that he would take care of the rest and let him rest. After that, Mudok returned to the shop, wishing him good luck as a farewell, and Edmund apologized to him in his thoughts. He has a reason to revive the guild: revenge for his parents, brothers, and sisters who died unjustly. Therefore, he must completely restore the Merchant Guild and use it to take revenge on Duke Icarus for destroying them with the help of the Akas Guild. And until this happens, he will not stop. Therefore, he hopes that the magical swordsman will cooperate with him until then, and if he succeeds, he will definitely repay him. Meanwhile, MC returned to his room and immediately lay down on the bed. He sighed heavily and thought that he was so tired. Since things are going well and his money is only increasing, he should start gathering information about Juan. He was distracted from his thoughts by a knock on the door. It was Sabine. He smiled, glad that they brought him food, and allowed her to enter. Sabine entered the room holding a bowl of ice cream, his favorite snack lately. It is a dish made by mixing ice and fruit. and it was accidentally invented by a girl named Sabine, whom he recently met. He thanked her for the treat and said that he would enjoy eating, after which she smiled and left, wishing him bon appetit. He tasted the ice cream in anticipation, and as soon as the cold mass touched his tongue, he immediately felt bliss. Cold, sweet, and juicy. He never imagined such a taste could exist when he was still in the North Sea. He heard that the Royal Trading Guild is popular for this ice cream, and he can understand that. While he was thinking about this, he ate everything without even noticing and decided to go get more. Of course, it was a hassle for him to go get food himself, but it couldn't be helped since everyone was busy. He left the store and immediately heard a noise. Some kind of conflict arose. Sabine asked customers not to do that and just get in line. And then one of them, a guy with a nasty grin, asked how dare she give orders to them. Aristocrats? Looking at them, Mudok immediately realized that they were some kind of idiots. That guy's friend Samuel said she didn't seem to know who they were. She should stop whining and get them some ice cream. His friend pointed at her and said that they heard rumors and decided to stop by, so she should be prepared for the consequences if the ice turned out to be bad. She told him that the Royal Merchant Guild doesn't sell ice cream to hooligans. And then the guy exclaimed in irritation, "She dares to tell an aristocrat to stand in line with commoners? They already feel uncomfortable being in the same place with them, and now she wants them to stand next to them. It looks like she's dreaming of death." MC continued to watch them, and she confidently told the guy that the ice cream she made isn't something you can eat first, just because you're an aristocrat. He was angry that she dared to contradict him, and she thought that if something went wrong, the swordsman would save her. Plucking up her courage, she told him in response that this was absolutely outrageous. She was just explaining the rules. Samuel became very angry. He drew his sword and exclaimed that she really wanted to die, but even so, she wasn't afraid. He clenched his teeth in rage, and then his friend Justin put his hand on his shoulder and told him not to act rashly. Did he want to humiliate them? He immediately apologized to him. And then Justin himself approached Sabine and said that they came to eat ice cream. She immediately noticed his cold gaze, which made her feel like her heart had frozen. She became very nervous. He said that he didn't like to wait, so she should hurry up and bring it to him. His gaze penetrated her, making her tremble with fear, and then she gave in and asked him to wait a little. At that moment, Edmund jumped out of the store. He called out to her discontentedly and approached them, saying that in the Royal Trading Guild, they do not sell ice cream to hooligans. Had she forgotten about that? She immediately pulled herself together and apologized to him, while Mudok thought that there must be something between them, since he was reacting so violently. Edmund furiously asked them to leave the place immediately. Further failure to comply with the aforementioned guild rules was unacceptable. The guys were very indignant and took this as an insult, so he said that they were wrong. The reason he was not selling them ice cream was not only because they barged in ahead of time. The guys exchanged glances, and Justin asked what the reason was. He responded by telling him to ask Duke Icarus himself, and his workers became nervous and began whispering about it. Justin asked how he knew his father, but he only remained silent. Then he looked at him more closely and noticed something familiar about him, namely his eyes. A smirk immediately appeared on his face, which he quickly covered with his hand, and said that now he understood everything. He was from the fallen guild role. A wide smile immediately appeared on his face, which made his friends very nervous, because they knew that he only smiled like that when he was angry. Justin pulled his sword from its sheath and said that insulting a nobleman is punishable by death, after which he pounced on poor Edmund and he closed his eyes, thinking that he can't even avenge his family. He is so angry. Luckily, Justin was unable to hit him. MC stopped his sword with his bare hand and then swung it, throwing the boy away. Justin became very angry after this and shouted, "How dare he do this? Is he so desperately dreaming of death?" He sighed tiredly and thought that he came here to eat another ice cream, and this is the situation he found himself in. They simply told the misbehaving customer that they wouldn't sell him any ice cream, and now he's trying to kill them. It's just ridiculous. He told the kids they had no manners. He'd take this opportunity to teach them a lesson. Justin, of course, was still arrogant and called him a jerk, then imbued his sword with mana and charged at him, shouting that they were all going to die. As soon as he swung the sword, there was a loud crash and dust rose around them. Approaching Mudok, he raised the sword above his head, then began swinging it wildly, trying to hit him, but he just continued to dodge with a smile, mockingly saying that he was so scared. At such a young age and such good stats, but the problem is, no matter how much he swung the sword, he couldn't reach it. Since ancient times, righteousness has been followed by reason, which created harmony. If this action shows aristocrats, then it seems aristocrats have no principles. But he is not such a narrow-minded person, so today he will personally clean up his manners. Justin was very annoyed. He still couldn't hit him and exclaimed, "How dare he talk about aristocrats like that?" MC moved behind him and said that it doesn't matter what he says, only discipline is needed to learn respect. This moment reminded him of the Central Plains. He forgot how the world works because of his affection for Huan. After all, the truth is, the strongest survive. He slashed with his middle finger, releasing a small projectile of formless chi, and it pierced his wrist. He felt intense pain. Justin gritted his teeth. Now he could no longer hold the sword. Immediately after that, he fell to his knees and clutched his wound, screaming in pain. But besides the wounded wrist, there was also a wild frost burning his skin. Mudok gave him a displeased look, and then Edmund approached him and exclaimed, What was that? He ignored him and headed towards the boys. Justin's loyal friends immediately stood up for him and began threatening him, telling him not to come closer. But he didn't care about the childish threats. And when Justin got up, he looked at him with interest and said that he needed to lie down. Why was he getting up? The boy told his friends to step back and confidently stood in front of Mudok, and he laughed and thought that he really had a talent for everything. After that, he enveloped his hand in icy energy and said that since he had decided to fight, they could see how long he could last. The boy was immediately thrown back under the frightened gaze of his friends, and when he fell, they ran to him and asked if he was okay. Seeing that the wound was bleeding, they called out to him worriedly, and MC seemed disappointed. He looked at the boy with confusion and thought that he only withstood one blow. He turned out to be weaker than he thought. Maybe he should stop. He wanted to teach him a lesson, but since he doesn't know anything about this world, he can't just kill people. After that, he stopped attacking and walked towards the boy, and he exclaimed, "Who the hell is he? Why is he acting like this? Doesn't he know who he really is? How dare he do this to him, the son of Duke Icarus?" After these words, Mudok was only more convinced that this guy was a complete idiot. He can't even think through the situation. He's truly possessed by evil. Maybe he should just kill him? But if he thinks like that, then he'll be no different from them. He sighed, trying to calm down, and then the boy's friends started to attack him. He quickly looked around, and a stick caught his attention. He pulled it toward himself with a wicked grin using telekinesis, which surprised Justin, and his friends asked, "What? A magic swordsman?" After that, MC walked menacingly toward them, imbuing the club with ice energy, which made Justin nervous, and when he took another step, he became very scared and asked him not to come near him. But he didn't listen to him. He enjoyed the idea of taunting them. His shadow loomed menacingly over them, and he swung his club, saying that for guys like them, this was the best medicine. After that, he began beating them so that they would remember this lesson well, and enjoyed the spectacle and their screams. Closer to night, he finally finished. The beaten guys knelt before him and apologized, saying that they were wrong and would not do it again. He threateningly hit the ground with his club and asked what they said. He heard nothing. Justin nervously clenched his teeth and thought that he would definitely kill them. He would chop off their heads and stomp on them for a long time if they did not say it. After that, he loudly declared that he was wrong, and he would never repeat the mistake he made today. Mudok laughed and thought that this was expected. A club works well anywhere. Finally, he told them to be more careful from now on, and Edmund almost burst into tears of gratitude. A new day dawned, and the esteemed lords and the king gathered for a council. Count Cotton's slave reported that a report had arrived from a subordinate he had sent from the Kingdom of Serbia several days earlier. King Tomilov III gave him the floor, and he said that his subordinate reported that the Kingdom of Serbia had managed to reclaim the Blackstone region in the north, which had previously been infertile. Furthermore, there were rumors that the Kingdom of Hazen was planning to develop the territory beyond the Sahara Desert. Duke Sergio von Icarus added that he had also heard that it was too dangerous for people to live on the other side of the desert due to the many monsters that inhabited it. Was the kingdom taking any measures? Count Slave replied that he was unsure, but he suspected that they might want to lure Inos over to their side. As soon as he mentioned this name, the king immediately became agitated, and Count Crash asked, "Is this true?" Slave confirmed it, and Baron Arista asked anxiously, "Is he talking about Inos, one of the 10 sword masters on the continent?" The king said anxiously that he had heard that he always refused despite the money offered to him, and that he wandered around the continent without stopping anywhere. Why did such a man go to Hazen? Crash asked, if not for money, then for what? Maybe he has a lover? The king thought about his words and noted that this was quite possible. Because of this, the lords became agitated and began to ask who this woman was whom he loved. Count Slave said that everyone knew her. She was the younger sister of the current king of Hazen, Laird II, Daphrin. One of the lords asked, "So does this mean that he gave away his precious younger sister?" It seems the Snake King is slowly beginning to act. Tomilov said that if this was true, then the kingdom of Hyen now had 2 swordmasters. Slave agreed with him and noted that now, after all their failed attempts, they would try to expand their territory, secured back during the time of Laird II. The king thought that in the east, the desert nation of Hyzen was expanding its territory, while in the south, the trading nation of Serbia was reclaiming land. Furthermore, the Empire of Ziva, located across the sea to the west, was also expanding its territory, so they couldn't just sit still. He looked up at the lords and asked if they had any ideas, and Duke Icarus said he thought it would be a good idea for them to expand their territory. The king said there were no places they could expand here, and then an idea occurred to him. He looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he really meant the other side of the Lazar Mountains, the one to the north. He confirmed this and said they had no other choice. The king thought, the northern lands are difficult to develop. Even if they are captured, this part of the world is useless because of the ice covering it. That's why everyone is reluctant to advance north. It means being ultimately ousted from the struggle for power over the continent. Sooner or later, someone will be sent north to resolve the issue of territorial expansion. He glanced at Count Slave, who nodded, and after that, he suggested that the lords finish today's meeting and meet again. Sergio noticed how they exchanged glances and immediately realized that the Count and his Majesty were hiding something. After that, the king and his loyal subject went to a place without prying eyes and ears to thoroughly discuss everything. Tomailov glanced at the Count with concern and asked if he had made any mistakes lately. He answered that nothing of the sort had happened, and he said that then the Duke was acting selfishly again. For the past 10 years, he has been sending everyone who stood against him to the north. Cotton said it was all his fault, and he sighed with concern, asking him not to say that. He was the only one of his subordinates he could trust. The Count bowed his head in gratitude, and the king said, "In any case, that's the way it is. He heard that there is ice cream in the capital now. Does he know anything about it?" Cotton immediately became interested and asked if he was talking about the lollipops of the Roll Trading Guild. The king did not understand what he was talking about, and he explained to him that the lollipops were called that because they tasted so sweet, unlike other types of ice cream. Tomalov asked him how long the guild store had been open, and he thoughtfully replied that he had heard that it had been quite a long time. Realizing that His Majesty wanted to enjoy the lollipops, he said that he would soon have to go to bed. Would he like to stop by Roll before it was time? Tomalov laughed and said that was expected of him. He really knew what he needed. The Count smiled and replied that for someone assisting His Majesty, it was only natural. The king immediately perked up and asked when he planned to drop in on them unexpectedly. Meanwhile, Mudok was eating ice cream as usual, but suddenly children came to him asking to be taught magic. He looked at them, stunned, and Sabine apologized for coming so suddenly. They knew it was impolite, and they also knew perfectly well that not everyone could learn magic, but they had to do it. Annie worriedly said that if something dangerous happened to the guild, like last time, it would be very useful. She would really study hard, so let him teach her magic. MC put down his ice cream and said that he was proud of their intentions, but as he had already said, he was not a wizard. He used something else. Luffy asked with a smile, "Is this martial arts?" He remembered because he had told him earlier. He smiled and remarked that he remembered everything perfectly. Then he showed them his ice energy and said that what he uses is not magic, but martial arts. It's called Divine Ice Shot. He can't teach them magic that he doesn't even know. Leo shyly asked, "Can they learn martial arts then?" Mudok objected, but the children didn't listen, and happily said that they also wanted to learn martial arts. They again began to pester him with requests to teach it, and MC saw honest eyes in everyone, in which there was determination to achieve their goals. It was as if he was remembering his childhood. With the same shining eyes, he asked his teacher to show him martial arts. He felt a little awkward teaching someone at a time when he needed to find Huen as soon as possible, but these children wanted to protect someone. Moreover, weren't these the children who had helped him, the one who knew nothing, little by little? According to the rules, he couldn't just teach them the martial art of the North Sea, but that was another world. Sabine distracted him from his thoughts by asking him about it again, and he said that he would think about it, so let them come tomorrow at the same time, then he would give them his answer. They were very happy, and the boys asked, was he really going to teach them? They would never forget his grace until they died. They took his words completely the wrong way. He jumped out of bed and exclaimed that he hadn't said that he would teach them, but they no longer heard him, and happily headed towards the exit of his room. Having wished him good night, they left him, and he sighed heavily, thinking, how could everything have turned out like this? But everything will work out somehow. Taking some ice cream, he opened the window and thought that he was the same when he was little. The teacher must have had a hard time with him. These children are so restless. And then he heard the clang of iron from the forest, especially at such a late hour. Apparently, he won't get any rest today. Meanwhile, in the forest, Count Slave was sword fighting the assassins who attacked the king. Having wounded one of them, he caught his breath and wondered if he could hold out until reinforcements arrived. He didn't expect to be attacked when they were just out for ice cream. Hearing a strange crackling sound behind him, he immediately turned around and saw several fireballs cast by a mage, one of the attackers. He aimed a spell straight at them. Count Slave stood firm, protecting the king, and as the fireballs approached, he gritted his teeth and braced himself for impact. There was an explosion, and Tomilov worriedly called out to his loyal subject, then ran to him to check on his condition. Fortunately, he was alive. Cotton told him everything was fine, and he exclaimed that his arm was hurt. The Count cut him off and asked him to forgive his rudeness, but it was urgent, and he told him not to worry. Cotton looked at the enemy and thought there was a wizard there. He hadn't thought of him because of the similarity in their clothing. He ordered the warriors not to hesitate to regroup and attack again, and the assassins did the same, then rushed into battle, shouting that they would wring the neck of this noble cur. The Count concentrated, then lunged forward, killing the assassin, and the other two jumped aside, dodging the blow. Immediately after, they turned and headed towards him, intending to attack him from behind, but before they could strike, he turned and parried. His sword clashed with the blade of another assassin, and he exclaimed, whose destiny told him to come here? He replied that they would soon die anyway, so they were unlikely to find out. Slave looked behind him. His remaining warriors and the king were there. Just now, thanks to magic, the enemy's number had increased significantly. These guys have absolutely no intention of leaving them alive, and if they lose, it will be the end. But for the sake of the kingdom, They must protect his majesty at any cost. He turned his gaze to the mage and, noticing that he had raised his hands, thought, was another magical attack? He warned his subordinates about this and told them to gather together and protect his majesty. But it was too late. The spell was already prepared. Luckily, Mudok arrived in time to help. The mage's body was suddenly pierced by a sharp piece of ice, and the captain of the assassins, Morian, turned around, not understanding what was going on. The count and the king were also perplexed. Morian looked up at the place where the piece of ice was released, and MC smirked, noticing that it looked like he was caught. The next second, he descended and jumped down, and Morian frowned and looked at him. MC appeared behind his comrade and knocked him out with a punch, saying that he wanted to admire the moon for once, but apparently he had been so noisy that he had attracted them. He smiled, and then Morian looked at him, wondering in surprise when he had managed to do so. The protagonist approached him and suggested that they finish quickly before the ice cream melted. Morian frowned, annoyed, and thought that he had let him out of his sight for a second. This unusual guy was keeping him from relaxing. Then he shouted indignantly, "You idiot!" The remaining bandits surrounded the protagonist, and Morian thought that even though he had caught them by surprise, they outnumbered him. In that case, we need to kill the king as quickly as possible and get out of here to avoid any other unforeseen situations. At that moment, the protagonist looked at his weapon and thought, that sword. Morian leaped forward to attack him and shouted that he would deal with him, and the others must quickly kill the king. The next second, MC drew his weapon, blocked his attack, and smiling, said that he never thought he would see such a sword here. So, he would also let him play with the newest item in the Solin Northern Sea Ice Palace. Then he pointed at himself and said, so he should attack. Morian gritted his teeth indignantly and shouted, idiot. He leaped forward to attack and shouted that he never thought he would be able to return alive. The protagonist smiled and replied, all right, is that how he attacks? The next second, he blocked his attack with his sword. He frowned slightly, and then Morian swung another weapon and released energy forward, but the protagonist easily dodged it. After that, Morian spun the weapon in his hands and, taking it from behind his back, delivered a cross-shaped strike in front of himself, shouting, oh, he's a rat. The next second, the protagonist easily dodged it and delivered his own blow. Then they continued to strike each other, as well as block the enemy's attacks. At some point, MC knocked the weapon out of Morian's hands, and then put his hand to his face and slammed his head into the ground. The next second, it started raining, and Tomolov asked in surprise, Cotton, what's going on there? He held his hand out in front of him and replied, Your Majesty, he needs to take a step back. He looked at him in surprise and then shouted, he is the hope of the kingdom, Cotton. Then he wondered, what the? At that moment, several bandits shouted in alarm, Captain Morian, that guy is a swordmaster. And the protagonist looked at them and said, those damn idiots, if it weren't for them. He waved his weapon, and they shouted in surprise, what? The MC added irritably, it's all because of them. His ice cream melted in the rain because of them. The bandits looked at each other in surprise, surprised by the word ice cream. Then the protagonist clenched his teeth and shouted in irritation that he would show them how much he was offended by the ice cream. He was counting to 3. After that, he couldn't promise that those here would survive. He raised 3 fingers, and one of the bandits stood up and shouted, what nonsense! They didn't need to be afraid. They could just kill him by attacking from different sides. The others agreed with him and, moving forward, shouted, yes, that's what he deserves. The protagonist said, 1. The bandits rushed to attack. One of them shouted, we need to shut him up. The protagonist said 2. The bandits surrounded him, pointing their weapons at him, and he said 3. He thought, energy spirit protection. The next second, a barrier formed around him, and the bandits looked at it in bewilderment. And the next second, the protagonist said that they shouldn't say his sword was too merciless. His eyes burned with rage, and then he directed a powerful attack forward, impaling all the bandits on sharp, icy tendrils. At that moment, Cotton cried out in surprise, this can't be. And MC said that he took revenge on the enemy. Then Cotton looked to the side and shouted for him to look there. Hey, he has to wait. He just left. The king looked at him and shouted, Cotton, he gives you 1 hour, his. Before he could finish, Cotton placed his hand on his chest and, bowing slightly, said to leave it to him, His Majesty. Sometime later, Edmund was sorting through documents and, looking ahead in surprise, asked, are they learning magic? Dean answered decisively, that's right, they are learning. He said magic isn't something you can learn on your own. Then he folded his hands in front of him and asked, does Mr. Magic Swordsman himself teach the children? Dean closed his eyes and waved his hand, noting that it was true. He, like most members of the Merchant Guild family, wanted to learn magic, so why only 4 children? Then he looked in surprise at Edmund, who lowered his gaze and said, that's right, he thought it was hard enough for them, because he had a lot of work. There were many people in the world who wanted to learn magic, but very few could truly learn it. But the children were so lucky. Then he sat up and, placing his hands on the table, asked, where do the children learn magic? He should show him the area. Dean sheepishly agreed, and Edmund laughed, thinking that the day their guild would take flight might come sooner than they thought. After a while, the protagonist leaned his back against a tree and, folding his arms across his chest, asked, what kind of nonsense is this? Edmund raised his hands to him and asked, why is he doing this? He knew all about it. The protagonist turned away and said he didn't understand what he was talking about. He laughed and said he was told that he, Mr. Magic Swordsman, was teaching their children magic. The protagonist closed his eyes and thought, is this what the guild people were gossiping about? Then Edmund, tears streaming down his face, said that he was sincerely grateful, but he didn't know how to repay him for this favor. Then Henry approached them and apologized, and Edmund looked at him in surprise and asked, "What's wrong?" He replied that a guest had come to see Mr. Swordsman. He was surprised. A guest? At that moment, Elliot approached them and said, "Magic Swordsman," with tears in his eyes. MC thought, that man. He turned away from him and told him to go away, but he fell to his knees and shouted, "No, please, he must spare him, Chamberlain. His Majesty said that if he can't bring him today, he will take everything himself." He grabbed the protagonist by the leg and he looked at him indignantly and shouted, "What business is it of his?" At that moment, Edmund put his hand to his face and thought, Chamberlain? His Majesty? Then really His Majesty. At that moment, Elliot, continuing to hold the protagonist's leg, begged, "Please, if he pities him, he must not refuse His Majesty's invitation today." Then MC waved his leg and said, "Come on, this isn't the first or second day he's been coming here and bothering people." He walked forward and said, "Stop sweating in vain. He must go back." Elliot desperately reached out to him and shouted, "Swordsman." The protagonist added, "Oh, by the way, maybe he doesn't know if this holds the key to solving the Huen story, but these things fit together." He then looked at the pendant in his hand and remembered how he'd shouted that he didn't want to. William sat across from him and wanted to object, but the protagonist added, "In just 3 years, they've captured the entire region north of the river, and soon, the Central Plains will join them too. What kind of negotiations can they possibly conduct with these cunning mirror masters?" William reached for his drink and said that there are times when one needs to show one's strength and times when one doesn't. He thinks now is the time to show that the Ice Palace in the Northern Sea suppresses its rivals with more than just force. MC thought for a moment, and William added, "Of course, even if this doesn't work, they'll have to demonstrate their strength again. Then he'll take the initiative." Then the protagonist looked at him and said that he understood, and then they'll go according to his plan. He said, "Your Majesty." The protagonist took a sip of his drink and added, "But if they don't cooperate, they'll attack them again." William smiled and noticed that there was something to it. The protagonist thought that on the way to the negotiations, he met the woman of his destiny, Huen. He remembered her happy smile and thought that that day was the best day of his life. He laughed slightly and thought that he should just think about Huen. There's no need to worry too much about such things, but he thinks he should come up with a plan. After a while, Luffy raised his hand and said, "Master." MC thought there are many ways, so he thinks he should think it over calmly. After a while, Tomalov sat at the table and said, and indeed he refused again. Elliot bowed before him and asked for forgiveness. The king said that the more he thought about it, the more he realized how bad he was. He was going to thank him for saving his life. And then Elliot looked up at him and said he'd be back tomorrow. Absolutely. But he waved his hand and said, "Okay." How many times had he promised him that already? At that moment, a voice came from behind the door. "Your Highness, it's Princess Eskold," he said. "Let her come in, and he can go." Elliot burst into tears again and agreed with him. After that, he passed by the princess, and she looked at him in surprise. Then Tomalov said, "She must come in quickly, Eskold." She bowed, holding the hem of her dress, and then said, "Father." The chamberlain has a very displeased expression. "Is something wrong?" He looked at her thoughtfully and said, "That's what I'm talking about." A few seconds later, she was sitting with him at the table and, covering her mouth with her hands in surprise, shouted, "What?" She grabbed his hands and asked, "Is he all right, father? Is he hurt anywhere?" He laughed lightly and taking her hand said, "Everything is fine. He's here now. She shouldn't worry so much." She sighed and asked, "But why did that warrior refuse the invitation?" He closed his eyes and said, "That's what he's talking about. He's a capable young man. He wants him by his side, but he just won't respond to his requests." Eskold said, "From his words, it sounds like he really is a wonderful person." In response, the king nodded and remarked that he really is wonderful. "Did she know that the ice cream the Roll Guild has been making lately has become a hit?" She replied, "Yes, she'd already tried it once." He said that the Roll Wizard who creates it is the one who saved him. She was surprised, right? He sighed and replied, "That's right, knowing that makes him want it even more." She said, "Is that so? I see." After some time, she tasted the ice cream and thought that she couldn't forget the feelings she experienced the first time she tasted it. But the wizard who created it is the very person her father is looking for. What kind of person is he? She looked out the window, noticing children enjoying ice cream, and thought, maybe this time she should try to meet him herself? After some time, the protagonist watched the children training. He thought it had only been 2 weeks since he started training them, but they could already emit energy. Well, that made sense, since the energy concentration here was much higher than in the Central Plains. Then he clapped his hands and said, "That's enough, guys. Now that they can control their mana well, they should move on to the next step." They looked at him happily and shouted, "Yes!" At that moment, Elliot appeared from behind a tree and, apologizing, called out to the magical swordsman. The protagonist thought irritably, "Again?" He thought that since he hadn't been seen this morning, he could at least go a day without him. Then he scratched his neck and asked, "So why is he here again?" Then, surprised, he noticed his necklace glowing. He wondered if that was where the light was coming from. He looked ahead and wondered, really? The next second, Eskold took off her hood and, smiling, said, "Nice to meet you. She is the princess of the Drake Kingdom." Eskold, he thought in surprise. "I found her. It's her." After a while, they all sat down at the table. and Eskald said that she heard that he saved her father's life, right? And he closed his eyes and asked, how did it all turn out like this? She asked. Turned out. Then she thought, what a rude man. After that, she smiled and said, she heard that her father invited him to the palace as a sign of gratitude, but why did he refuse the invitation? He replied, that's... Then he looked at her, and Hwan said that she heard that he mercilessly refused several times. He thought, even the angry expression on her face and the tone of her voice, that was really Hwan. Then he heard echoes of the voice. Why is he silent? Hello? He opened his eyes sharply, then took a sip of his drink and said that he understood her. Then, when should he come? She folded her arms over her chest and said, in that case. Then she put her hands on the table and cried out in surprise. What? MC put the cup on the saucer and said, she came to invite him, didn't she? She looked away and said that was correct. Then she sat down and nodding, added, yes, that's right. She came to invite him. He replied, then please, she should set a date and time for him to arrive at the palace. She thoughtfully said, tomorrow, probably around 11 a.m. She thought that was not the time. Then she got up from her seat, and the protagonist replied, okay, they will meet then. She said, good, now she will go. After a few seconds, MC thought that if he went to the palace tomorrow, he would be able to see her. But she was a princess, the daughter of the king, the highest-ranking person in this country. How could he get close to her and marry her? This time, he had to plan everything carefully so that nothing bad happened. He began tapping his finger on the table and said that he needed Edmund's help for this. After a while, he sat down on a chair opposite Edmund and said, yes, he wanted to marry Princess Eskald. And he, surprised, rose from his seat and shouted, are you crazy? The protagonist asked, what? Then he leaned back in his chair and folding his arms across his chest, said, I see. Then he must tell him why it won't work. Edmund said, Princess Eskald is the only child of His Majesty's late wife, Queen Swan, the only legitimate heir to the throne. A warrior without status or position proposes to a princess? He waved his hand and added, that can't be. To be the princess's fiancé, he must be a prince or grand duke from another country, or at least the scion of a high-ranking noble family in that country. MC rested his head on his hand and said, then, if he had the same status and fame, it would be a great help in marrying her. Edmund hesitantly confirmed this and added that he just needed to earn it all, perhaps. Before he could finish speaking, the protagonist rose from his seat and said, okay, he'll try it. Edmund pointed his hand at him and shouted, wait a minute, does he know anything about what should be guarded in the courtyard? He wondered what should be guarded. Then Edmund began searching for a book in the library and said he thought he didn't know. After that, he handed him a stack of books on the basics of etiquette. He thought that if he left things as they were and an accident happened, the guild would also suffer damage. Then he smiled and said that he would train him thoroughly. MC thought, why does he look so nervous? Well, it can't be helped. He took the book and said, okay, then he will trust him. That same evening, the protagonist was busy reading the book. Edmund said, Mr. Swordsman, please, he must sit up straight. Mudok had to listen to Edmund's sermon all night and the whole next day. After some time, he put on his suit and walking out the door, asked, well then where should he begin? After some time, the subordinate said, His Majesty, the magical swordsman has arrived. He bowed and said that he was glad to see him, His Majesty. In response, the king laughed and, stretching his hands forward, said, welcome. Then the protagonist adjusted his jacket and thought, isn't today the day to meet him? He thought it would be just them, but why are there so many people here? At that moment, Eskald awkwardly folded her fingers and whispered that she was sorry. She didn't deliberately schedule the meeting on such a day. He looked at her and thought that, judging by her agitated look, she didn't do it on purpose. At that moment, Justin, putting his hand on the back of the chair, was indignant. Why is this idiot here? Then MC looked at him and thought, that man? Then he smirked, and Justin's face contorted with anger. He said, this asshole is just. The next second, Sergio shouted, stop, Justin! He wanted to object, but father. He looked at him from under his brows and asked, is he really going to make a fool of himself in front of His Majesty? After that, Justin sighed and said that he understood. He thought that it seemed like he had some ideas. At that moment, Tomelov turned to Cotton and whispered that he thought it was true that he had been mistreated. In response, he whispered that he thought so, His Majesty. Then Tomelov asked, what suddenly made him accept his invitation? Did he have any idea how upset he was? The protagonist smiled and held his hand out in front of him, saying there was a reason for that. He asked what it was. He replied that, as far as he knew, the Royal Merchant Guild was currently very busy due to a shortage of workers. He was the busiest among them, having to make ice. That's why he wanted to prepare the ice in advance and then go to him, His Majesty. However, the orders were growing every day, so even if he made more ice, it always ran out. So, day after day, it was postponed, until today arrived. Then Tomelov laughed and said he hadn't even thought about that reason. Well, ice cream was selling like hotcakes, so he must have been very busy. MC smiled and thanked him for his understanding. He thought that compared to Dan Chunhak, he was a real fairy. Then the king added, yes, but his name. The protagonist came closer and said he had no name, just the magical swordsman, His Majesty. The king paused and asked, is that true? But he can't address him formally every time. Then he put his hand to his face and said that was a problem. He thought, if that's the case, then why not come up with one? Eskald then approached him and, smiling, asked, how about coming up with a name yourself, father? He asked, a name for him? She raised her index finger and said, no, she said to give him a title. At that moment, Sergio looked at her in surprise, and Tomelov asked, a title? She confirmed it and asked, didn't he save his life? It was worthy of a reward. At that moment, Sergio took the cup with the drink and remarked that it was true. She truly had an excellent idea, Her Highness the Princess. It was he who saved the life of His Majesty the King. How could he not praise him for this achievement? He believed that Her Highness's thoughts were truly excellent. She replied, not worth praising. Then Tomilov slammed his hand on the arm of his chair and said that he could not ignore the man who saved his life. He rose from his seat and, placing his hands on the table, said that he would bestow upon him a title. He picked up the sword and added, that evening, when he saw him save him, a word came to mind. Okay, he must step forward. The protagonist approached him and kneeling thought, this title, he doesn't like kneeling, but if this means he can marry the princess, then he will do it. Following this, Tomilov drew his sword from its sheath and added, he, the king of the Drake Kingdom, Tomilov III, addresses him, the brave man who saved him and his vassals in a critical situation, not sparing his own life. He placed the sword on the protagonist's shoulder and added that he hereby bestows upon him the title of Baron, along with the name Blizzard. MC thought, Blizzard means snowstorm in this country's language, right? And then Tomilov added, this will allow him to pass on his name to one descendant in the Drake Kingdom. Baron Blizzard, he must rise. The protagonist stood up, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said that if it weren't for him, he wouldn't be here now, and that he wanted to thank him again. The protagonist then smiled and said that if something like this happened again, he would do the same. Then Sergio said, Your Majesty, Baron Blizzard is the one who saved his life. He thinks it's only fair that he be granted an estate befitting his title. The king replied that it was unprecedented for a baron not to receive a fief. Questions would certainly arise. Sergio then asked who would dare to disobey his order. He frowned and added that if such a person were found, he would remind him of the meaning of His Majesty's order. At that moment, Tomilov wondered what the hell his ulterior motive was for such an act. Then he looked at the guests and asked if they thought so too. The boy asked fearfully, is he addressing him, Your Majesty? He replied, yes, Your Majesty. His companion added, that's true. Then Tomilov said thoughtfully, if that's what they think, then fine. But is there any territory they could give to Baron Blizzard? Sergio said, yes, Your Majesty. The northern icy lands he'd mentioned at the meeting a few days ago. The king looked at him in surprise, and he added, well, it just so happened they needed a lord they could call there, and it all just sort of worked out. Come to think of it, Baron Blizzard's name and the northern lands go very well together. Blizzard in the northern lands, he had a good feeling about that. The king frowned and thought that this had been his plan all along, to make him pay for hurting his son and his pride. He had his suspicions ever since he'd suggested giving him the title. At that moment, Eskald wondered if this was the northern land. So could it be that icy continent? She looked at the protagonist and wondered, is he really sending him there? Then MC looked at him and thought, a thief. He thought that the man was doing this because he wanted to drive him out of here because of his son, but he thought he shouldn't refuse since he was giving him the land. He smiled wryly and thought that he was using this as an opportunity to strengthen his reputation and close the status gap between them. After a while, Edmund was surprised. A northern land? He was really going to the northern lands, where snowstorms rage, avalanches occur, the cold is bitter, and even the mana is unstable. The protagonist sat across from him and, taking a sip of his drink, said that was true. He shouldn't worry. He wasn't catching a cold. He smiled as he said this, and Edmund, putting his hand to his face, said, a magical swordsman, no, Baron. Is he a Yeti or something like that? MC asked in surprise. A Yeti, he replied. A legendary clan that has lived only in the northern regions since ancient times. They resemble humans in appearance, but legend has it that they are approximately 3 meters tall. And because of this height, they are quite strong and, it is said, completely immune to cold and violence. The protagonist remarked that this was an interesting story, and Edmund added, well, considering that almost no one has actually seen them, there's a chance they are just a legend. Rumor has it among the people of the kingdom that one northerner is equal in strength to 100 people from the rest of the country. That's why they hate being ruled and don't acknowledge the existence of leaders. The protagonist smiled and remarked that this also sounded interesting. He asked, interesting? And MC headed for the door and, turning around, said that if he could gain the recognition of the northerners, his reputation would rise. He thought it was easier said than done. Then he opened the door and looked ahead in surprise, noticing the students. He wondered, what are they doing here? After a while, he shouted, no. For them, those who have only recently learned martial arts, the northern land is dangerous. Sabine countered, teacher, they still have a lot to learn. If he just leaves, who will they learn magic from? Leo pointed at her and noticed that she was right. Then Sabine bowed and said, please. She was begging him. Luffy also bowed and said that he was begging. At that moment, the protagonist looked to the side, noticing the princess. He thought, Eskald? She greeted him, and he noticed that she was in a bad mood and asked, what's wrong? She smiled, looking at Annie, and said that she thought they should talk after the children left. After that, MC waved to the children and said that he understood. Now they could go. Maybe they should go after all? Sabine and Leo looked at each other, and then she approached the protagonist and asked, will he then listen to their request? Leo added, if he answers, then they will leave immediately. He replied, okay, he will listen. After that, Sabine bowed and thanked him. He replied, that's enough, they should leave here. After that, Eskald walked forward and noticed that he had such energetic students. He placed his hands on his waist side and said, it seems that they are not so much energetic as they are rebellious. She laughed awkwardly, and he asked if she felt better now. She lowered her gaze and confirmed it, adding that she was sorry. She asked her father for a title for no reason, and it was because of this plan that he was going to the northern lands. He looked at her and thought they were very similar, but he hadn't even realized how much. She also apologized to him about Chunhak. Then he turned away and said that if he hadn't received this title, he wouldn't have gone north. She looked away and noticed that it was true. She really was sorry. He turned away and, blushing with embarrassment, thought, cute. Then she walked on and asked, but what changed after her apology? After all, he had to go. She anxiously put her hand to her face and asked how she could calm him down a little. He asked, well, maybe after he got a good luck charm? She was surprised. A good luck charm? What is that? He abruptly approached her and, lifting her chin, said, it's a kiss filled with genuine concern for another person. She cried out in surprise, pulling away from him. He held his hands out in front of him and said, judging by her reaction, he thought it would be better to say nothing. In any case, he needed to go get ready to leave. Princess, she had to forget what he just said. She clenched her fists and thought indignantly, he just said what he wanted and then he's leaving. What kind of man was he? Then she looked at his back in surprise and shouted, wait a minute. He turned around in surprise and she asked him to wait. He asked, what's wrong? She looked at him thoughtfully and he wondered, what was that? Had he done something wrong? And she thought, for some reason, this guy's behavior seemed familiar. Then she said, I get it, she'll do it. He was surprised to think he'd said it half-jokingly, but he hadn't expected her to react that way. He'd said it was fine. He didn't want to force something on someone who didn't want it, so they should just ignore it. But the next second, she tugged at his clothes and kissed him, rising on her toes. Then she pulled her hood back over her head and said, still. She walked in the opposite direction, and he opened his eyes in surprise and said, yes, he must definitely return after achieving success. After a while, people in the establishment were chatting among themselves. A new lord is coming this time, right? Rumor has it he saved the king's life, right? That's why they gave him the title and the estate. He heard he single-handedly defeated 100 enemies in an instant. Hey, he's lying. Kane, holding a mug of drink, replied, honestly, he's a sixth circle wizard, and they say his fencing skills rival even those of a master swordsman. Mason asked why such a remarkable fellow would come here. Max, sitting nearby, noted that it was obvious. He had fallen out of favor with Duke Icarus. Then he slammed his mug down on the table and added, even if that were true, it's just a rumor. He sat up and added, if they scared him enough, he'd just run away from them, right? After a while, Luna, looking around and breathing heavily, said, damn. Jake, standing back to back with her, asked, friend's wyvern, where the hell is it? At that moment, Luna looked ahead in surprise, and a huge paw of the ice wyvern hit her, throwing her aside. Jake called out to her in fear, ran closer, and he shouted, is she okay? And she, crying out in pain, grabbed her leg, and he thought, damn, they were just trying to get a couple of eggs. She said, damn. The next second, she looked ahead in fear, noticing how the wyvern opened its mouth, aiming at Jake. She shouted, from behind. He turned around and, trying to run forward, thought, the end. But the next second, the protagonist attacked the creature, cutting off its head. Luna let out a frightened cry, looking at the severed wyvern head, and the protagonist, smiling, asked, is everything all right now? She thanked him for his help, and he closed his eyes and replied, no, he just did what he had to do as Lord. She thought in surprise, Lord? And he turned around and, smiling slightly, said, well, I'll see you later. Then Luna, holding Jake by the shoulder, apologized and, looking ahead, said in surprise, the quick one, he's already gone. Then Jake cried out in shock. The wyvern eggs had disappeared too. Sometime later, MC sat on the throne in the castle and said, I see, it's empty here. Don't they all know today is his inauguration? Osborne Moriran stood before him, lowering his gaze and saying, he apologizes, my lord. He will send messengers to every village again. The protagonist waved his hand and said that even if he sent one, he didn't think anyone would show up. He wondered if this was how they carried out their duties. He seemed to understand why the lords here kept changing. He smiled and thought he had his own path. A few days later, Max said, no, what the hell is going on? He looked at the beaten men and asked, who the hell is this? Maybe the new lord did this? Mason said that was true. He was upset at how he treated them, but he thought he should acknowledge his skill. Kane added, it was so fast, and no matter what method he used, he couldn't move at all when it touched his body. His hands were so sharp that the pain was indescribable. Max looked ahead thoughtfully, and then Bob ran into the room and shouted, he's appeared, now in the town square. Max thought, already here? He said he'd go. And the others were surprised. Was he, the greatest warrior of Carolyn, finally stepping forward? Max, he believes in him. He must finish off this idiot. Meanwhile, in the square, the protagonist looked around and, sighing, thought, there are many more people here. At that moment, Luna was surprised. Was it him? Then Max called her. Was she surprised, Dad? He took her by the shoulders and asked what she was doing here. What's going on? She replied that she came here because she saw the people gathered. He asked, saw the people? They are all here because the new lord has arrived. She was surprised. Lord? Then she remembered the protagonist's words and said, so that's what he meant then. Max asked what she was talking about. She replied that she had already told him. There was one person who saved her when she was in danger, stealing ice wyvern eggs. Max frowned and thought, the person who saved his daughter is a lord. It's more complicated than he thought. Moreover, he had slain not an ordinary wyvern but an ice one with a single blow. This was no easy feat, even for a warrior of Caerleon. Then he placed his hand to his head and thought, as a warrior of Caerleon, he must acknowledge that man. But now he could not retreat. After that, he extended his hand forward and said that he was Max, the greatest warrior of Caerleon. The protagonist folded his arms over his chest and looking at his hand said, great? No, he was the recently appointed Baron Blizzard of Caerleon. Max said that he had heard rumors about him. They say that he wanders through town after town, mercilessly beating people. Is this true? He replied that this was not true. He simply sternly reprimanded those who tried to rebel. What, he wants to be in their place? Max replied, no, of course not. But he has a proposition. The protagonist asked, a proposition? He replied, in this place, Caerleon, it is very cold. That's why people have been drinking strong alcohol to fight the cold since ancient times. So what does he think? He should have a drinking contest with him. MC replied that they had an agreement, and Max put his hand forward and told him to think carefully and make a decision. It was a very strong drink that would get the blood pumping throughout his body. He replied that he didn't care. Instead, if he won, they would recognize him as their lord and follow him unconditionally. With these words, he smiled, pointing a finger at himself, and the people around him began to mutter, a drinking bet with Max? He was completely crazy. Was he really going to drink Faina? Max replied, okay. MC told him to keep his promise. Sometime later, they were sitting in a tavern at a table full of mugs of drink. Max said that if he wanted to give up, it was not too late. The protagonist smiled and said, how could he, a lord, not keep his word? He offered to begin, and Max smiled and told him not to regret it. After a while, Max heard his name being called. He opened his eyes, and Bob, holding him by the shoulders, asked, is he okay, Max? Did he just pass out? He thought he passed out? He, the best drunkard in Caerleon? Luna put her hands on his shoulders and said, Dad, he needs to stop drinking, and he wiped his mouth and said that he was not drunk yet. He slammed his mug on the table and thought, this can't be. He can't lose like this. And then he said, come on, he should pour him the next one. The protagonist poured him a drink and told him not to overdo it. Max, pouring a drink, thought in response, damn, why are there two of them? Then the protagonist told him to listen. They continue, right? Max put his hand to his head and thought, why is he okay? And he asked, how is he? He thinks that at this point he should just give up. Max said indignantly, enough, they have to continue. He replied, as he says. After that, they drank the next mug, and the others watched in amazement. Then MC put the cup on the table and thought, maybe because he hadn't drunk for a long time, but everything was going like clockwork. Then he looked ahead in surprise and smiling said, unbelievable. Max fell out of his chair onto the floor, and the protagonist said that this was the sound of his victory. Mason noticed that he had passed out. MC rose from his seat and said, well then, everyone present must gather in his castle in exactly 5 days. He pointed his hand forward and suggested that they see who kept their promises. After a while, he sat on the throne and, looking at everyone present, said that he thought they wouldn't come, but they were surprisingly good at keeping promises. Max asked, isn't that a given? The protagonist said that he knew it. It's okay, they probably know who he is, so they should let him get straight to the point. He gives them 10 days to prepare for the move. The others looked at him in surprise. He asked why they didn't say anything in response. Then Luna raised her hand and asked if he wanted them all to live in his castle. He replied, no way. Do they think all these villagers can live in this castle? She said he told them to pack their bags. He asked who said they would live here. She asked then, and he clenched his fist and replied that they were moving north immediately. The others looked at him in confusion, and he explained that he had been wandering around the area for the last 5 days and found a good place in the north where at least 10,000 people could live. From now on, instead of living in a city, they would all live together. Max spread his hands and said, but that's where the ice cannibals live in groups. MC asked, ice cannibals? He's talking about those bald guys with bear-like bodies who walk on 2 legs? He asked if he'd met them. The protagonist asked again if he had. He remembered how he'd chopped them up into several things and then said he'd destroyed them all. The others looked at him in confusion, and then the protagonist asked why they were so surprised about that. In any case, they shouldn't worry. He had prepared everything for the move and found a really great place to live. And now, they should go their separate ways. After a while, he stretched his back muscles and said, now all that's left is this. At that moment, he heard Luna greet him. He turned around and asked in surprise, they? She put her hand to her chest and said that they hadn't been able to introduce themselves to him because everything had happened so quickly that time. Her name was Luna. Jake, standing next to her, also introduced himself. MC said that he thought he knew why they had come to him. He was just about to call them. Jake asked what he meant. The protagonist walked past them and replied, oh, well, it's not that important, so they shouldn't be nervous. They just need to follow him. After that, they went into the tower, and he said, this way. They cried out in surprise. Those were ice wyvern babies. Luna screamed, just as she thought. That's exactly why he stole the eggs. How could he do that when they'd worked so hard to get them? The protagonist folded his arms and, smiling, asked who saved them that day. Luna clenched her teeth in irritation, and Jake said, but that's it. Before he could finish, the protagonist waved his hand and said, anyway, that's how it is. They're sleeping, so they should be quieter. Luna asked, what, ice wyverns? He confirmed it. And then he added that at first he thought about raising them, but they were so noisy and they ate a lot, and lately he was just going crazy. It was like they were surrounding him with their requests. Then Luna asked, but it's useless for them to take these guys? After hatching from an egg, a wyvern recognizes its mother in the first thing it sees. The protagonist was surprised. What? He put his hand to his face and asked if he should continue raising these annoying and troublesome creatures. Jake scratched his ear and said that ice wyverns were annoying. What kind of nonsense was he talking about? Luna crouched down next to the hatchlings and said that ice wyverns were larger and more powerful than regular wyverns. He had the ability to tame them. Jake added that if he were him, he would tame a wyvern. They could easily fly to Tenston. MC asked where that was. Luna replied that it was the second capital of the Kaya Kingdom, located 1,000 kilometers west of Caroline. It was a place where there was literally nothing. The protagonist asked if it was possible to fly that far on these things. Jake answered that it was true. The round trip would only take an hour or two. The protagonist thought, wait then. He folded his arms and asked how he could tame them. Lena asked if he had changed his mind. He smiled and replied, aha, he had a great idea. A few days later, the Carlin people began the Great Migration, as directed by Mudok. They walked through snowy places, and then Sabine caught up with the protagonist and shouted, Master, she thinks the people are having a hard time. He thought, it must be hard for everyone after 3 days and nights on the road, and it seemed there were still people who didn't trust him and were hesitant. But they would soon reach their goal, and then their hearts would change. Then he shouted, they must all listen carefully. They were almost there. Even if it was difficult, they must trust and hold on a little longer. Mason said, but they don't know where they're going. Kane added that he wasn't even sure there really wasn't an ice ogre there. Then the protagonist plunged his weapon into the snow and shouted, didn't he say he was the winner of all of them? And they were all brave warriors of Caroline. After that, he turned around and went first. And Sabine called out to him. He said, that's enough. They'll understand now. She agreed with him. And then he turned around slightly, smiling and said, they'll understand when they get there. After a while, they reached the cave, and Leo, looking around, said in surprise, wow. This is the place the teacher talked about. MC confirmed it. It took a while to find this place. He thinks they'll like it there. He thought, it looks like the others are finally feeling better. Then he told everyone to listen up. This place was once the ice ogre's hideout, but now they live here. And since they're going to live here, it would be easier to give this place a new name, right? The others happily agreed with him. He said thoughtfully, they should let him think about it. He used to live in the Northern Ice Palace, so they should choose a name similar to that. Then he opened his eyes and thought, yeah, that would be great. He put his hand on his hip and said that from now on, this place is called White Castle. The others happily agreed with him. He thought, now all that was left was to take the wyvern babies. The next second, he stopped in surprise and, turning around, asked, was that sound? He heard a voice, a lightning ball. Electrical impulses spread in different directions from the object and hit the ice wyvern babies. Jerome von Karawan said, why on earth is a wyvern here? He held the object in his hands, and the protagonist came up behind him and asked, what the hell is this? Where did a wizard come from? Jerome turned around abruptly. MC directed streams of energy at him, slashing his fingers into several parts of his body, and then grabbed him by the throat and slammed his head into the ground. He said he wouldn't ask twice who he was. He concentrated energy in his hand and asked why he attacked his wyverns. And Jerome thought, damn, is he paralyzed? He's not moving. Then the protagonist got close to his face and said, his mouth is not paralyzed, so he can speak, and now he must answer quickly. He answered, good, he will speak. He is Count Jerome von Karawan. The protagonist asked, a count? A nobleman? He is a baronite, so he is higher? Jerome was surprised, a baronite? So he is the same blizzard who saved his majesty's life and received the title and lands? He asked, does he know about him? Then he added thoughtfully, wait a minute. Is he by any chance the same former lord appointed here and then exiled? He replied that he believed so. There were circumstances. After that, MC grabbed him by the clothes and lifting him up said that it was none of his business, but that he looked down on him. He replied, now that he knows who he is, aren't they on the same side? What, is he wrong? The protagonist directed energy into his head and shouted, yes, he is wrong. He is equal to his dog, asshole. He didn't do his job. He should have just given up his title. What, equals? This time he would do him a special favor, so he shouldn't even think about fighting him again. After that, he threw him to the ground and added, the acupuncture needle has been removed. Now he can move. Jerome rose to all fours. MC added that if he talks nonsense, he will definitely kill him. He replied that he doesn't need to worry. That won't happen. After that, the protagonist pointed his finger at the baby wyverns and said, okay, now he needs to cure the wyverns and leave. He needs to cure them all. He asked, should he cure them? In response, the protagonist smiled and, pointing his thumb at himself, said that he was confident in his ability to understand people. Since he used magic, it means he can be useful. Then he turned around, and Jerome extended his hand to him and said, this. Then he fell to the floor and thought, damn, something's wrong. After a while, he shouted in surprise, what? He was sitting at the table, sorting through documents, and asked what he wanted him to send to the capital now. The protagonist asked why he was so surprised. Was it really that hard to send a letter to the king? He replied that it wasn't. Didn't he say he'd be sent a letter asking for a tax exemption? MC folded his arms and said that was true. This place was too busy trying to make a living right now. Then Jerome took off his glasses and said that the other nobles would be against it. He asked why? He replied, because from their point of view, it was unfair. If this bill passed, wouldn't they threaten His Majesty with tax evasion? saying that their conditions were no better than theirs. No matter how much His Majesty the King favored him, he would refuse. The protagonist wondered if the nobles were really the problem, and in the center of it all is the guy who sent him here. Then he said, "Okay, then they will put it aside." Jerome sighed in relief and then pointed to the stack of documents and asked, "Then what about this?" After that, he whispered something in Jerome's ear, and he shouted in surprise, "What? Is that possible?" He answered, "Definitely." He frowned and said, "Well, in that case, he will trust him." MC walked to the exit and answered, "Okay, and now he must start preparing immediately." After a while, Jake put his hand on Luna's shoulder and asked why the leader gathered them so suddenly. She answered, "Who knows?" After that, the protagonist shouted, "Is everyone here?" Kuna said that she came fully armed, but why did he gather them all here? He replied that he would explain now. From now on, they will go hunting for ice wyverns. Their target will be ice wyvern eggs. They were surprised. Ice wyvern eggs? It's not easy to target eggs. The protagonist held out his hand and said, "It's absolutely safe." They would split into teams of 30. They should focus on stealing eggs. Even just one would be enough. If they successfully completed their mission, they would receive a reward, and the team that brought back the most eggs would be awarded an additional 100 gold. They shouted in surprise. 100 gold? Cedric said that was a huge amount of money, something he would never be able to earn. Jake put his hand to his head and asked, "Will he really give a reward just for eggs?" Max then apologized and asked, "But will he definitely give them 100 gold?" MC replied, "Carlin warriors. He never makes empty promises. They can handle it, right?" The others looked at each other and then shouted that he could trust them. After that, the protagonist called Jerome and said that for the next 10 days, he would monitor each team and look for useful people. And later, he uses the most useful ones for other purposes. He asked if he was thinking about creating a nightly order. The protagonist looked at him. He asked, "Is something wrong?" MC thought. Despite giving him the job right after his arrival, he handled it quite well and realized what he said. As expected, he was quite useful. Then he said that he was right. "But every city has at least one nightly order, right?" Jerome answered, "Well, yes, in particular. They say that the Lion Knights from the Duchy of Icarus are especially powerful. So strong that they wouldn't lose even in a battle with the Royal Knights." He answered, "All right, you shouldn't worry. Sooner or later, they will become the best." He thought, this time he will make an army bigger and more powerful than the Snow Ice Troop, because he can't lose it a second time. Then he spread his arms out and shouted, "Well, then they should go." After a while, a wyvern was flying straight at them, and the protagonist, smiling, said, "Now!" The others rushed to attack, and Luna, firing several arrows at the wyvern, shouted, "Jake, he must cut from the tail." He twirled the weapon in his hand and shouted that he had cut it, and Max added a punch to the head and shouted, "Now!" Second squad, they must open the net. 1, 2, 3. The next second, the net flew forward, hitting the wyvern. MC, watching what was happening, said, "It looks good." Jerome stood next to him and said, "They've been hunting like this for days. Surely now their arms and legs would work perfectly in sync." He thought that he would never have thought of stealing an ice wyvern egg and taming it from infancy. If all went well, they could make a lot of money transporting and selling the spoils of the hunt, such as skin and bones, to distant cities using ice wyverns. After that, the protagonist shouted, "Well done, everyone. Well done, everyone. If they bring back a lot of ice wyvern eggs from this hunt, they'll get a great reward." Everyone continued with their work, and Jerome thought, uniting the unruly warriors of Carolyn into one unit, no matter how many times he saw it, it was still amazing. The next second, a warrior attacked the wyvern, and one of those present shouted, as expected, his storm finished him off. MC said, "Pretty well. Who is this guy who just slew an ice wyvern with his sword?" Jerome, checking the records, said, "He is. It's the real Storm Short." The protagonist said, "Judging by the fact that he even has a nickname, he must be quite famous." He answered, "Right, he's a hero of the common people, who raids the houses of evil nobles and distributes wealth to the common people." The protagonist laughed and asked, "Then why is this guy here?" He replied that he had been trapped and imprisoned, but it seemed he had escaped. The protagonist thought, judging by the way he handled things, he seemed like a decent guy. Then he said, "Jerome, if there was anyone else besides this guy who had escaped from prison, he should report it in detail." He replied, "Yes." The protagonist added, "Maybe they'll find something else useful." Jerome wondered if he had gotten more work to do again. After a while, the protagonist said, "Everyone did a great job. Thanks to the hard work of everyone involved in the wyvern hunt, they had collected a sufficient number of ice wyvern eggs. He would definitely give them the reward, as he had promised." The others cheered, and then Max raised his hand, apologizing, and called him over. He asked, "What is it, Max?" He said, as he had said, "They brought ice wyvern eggs." "But why?" MC answered, "That's right. He thinks everyone was curious about why he suddenly asked them to collect wyvern eggs. He'll explain everything now. As they know, ice wyverns, upon hatching, mistake the first thing they see for their mothers. In fact, he wants to tame them this way again. He plans to use the tamed ice wyverns as transportation. Their loaded wyverns will deliver their goods to every country." Max asked what goods they would specialize in. The protagonist answered thoughtfully, "They could specialize in many things, leather being the first. Among all, their main commodity might be ice ogre leather." The others were surprised. "Ice ogres? He wants to drive them all to the grave?" Luna said she wants to live a little longer. MC motioned for them to be quiet and, spreading his arms, asked, "Who, they must say, got rid of the ice ogres that had been swarming around this white castle for so long?" They replied, "He, sir." He pointed at himself and shouted, "That's right. So they really think he'll let them become their food? Bob looked at Cedric and said that the situation was definitely different from before. He said if they were with him. After that, the protagonist clenched his fist and laughing slightly asked, "So what? Does that give them courage?" The others smiled, looked at him and shouted that they would follow him. He said okay, then he'll give them a reward and tell them what his plans are for the future. At that moment, Leo ran up to him and shouted, "Teacher." He looked at him and said that they were still talking. What happened? He apologized and said that something big had happened. MC asked, "Is it a big problem?" He, trying to catch his breath, said, "Sister Sabine, she's dying." The protagonist asked in surprise, "What?" Meanwhile, Luffy was sitting next to her and said, "Sister, she should cover herself with this." He put his cape on her, and she, shivering from the cold, thanked him. At that moment, Annie, wiping away tears, sat next to him and said, "Little sister." Luffy said, "She must fight, sister. The teacher will definitely arrive soon." At that moment, MC shouted, "What happened?" They turned around and shouted, "Teacher." He walked forward and said he'd take a look. Then he thought, that's it. He put his hand to Sabine's head, and she said, "It's so cold, teacher." He thought the situation was more serious than he thought. He sat down next to her and asked, "How did Sabine get sick?" They should tell him everything. They answered, in fact, while helping Mr. Osborne find a place to build a pen for the ice wyvern hatchlings. They discovered a huge flower field full of ice flowers that they had only seen in books. Sis probably wanted to show it to them. Then she plucked a few flowers and said, "Guys, they should take some. Teacher will definitely like these." Annie added, so they returned with the flowers. Then Leo turned around and shouted in alarm, "Sister Sabine." Sis. In the present tense, he added, as soon as they arrived, she suddenly lost consciousness. "Teacher, what should they do now? If Sis doesn't wake up, The protagonist put his hand on his head and said that this won't happen. He should calm down. Then he took the flower from his hand and thought, "Ice flower. What the?" She asked. "This?" He thought, "Isn't this a snow flower?" So these ice flowers they were talking about? But this is the only elixir of the Northern Sea and the Central Plains, so how can they be in this world? Annie called him, and Leo asked him to save Sabine. The protagonist thought, right, that's the top priority. Then he said he'd take care of those flowers. Leo, he should pick up Sabine and follow him. He replied, "Yes, teacher." MC smiled and suggested they hurry to the training grounds. They all ran into the room, and the protagonist stopped near the bed and told Leo to put Sabine there. He came closer to the bed and replied, "Yes, teacher." He added that he should be careful not to get hurt. Excellent. Then Leo placed Sabine on the bed, and MC said, "Good job, Leo." After that, he put his hands on the children's heads and said, "From now on, he will begin the treatment, so they guys should not come near. They are strictly forbidden to enter this room until he gives permission." They replied, "Yes, teacher." Then Luffy peeked out from behind the door and said, "Teacher, he has to save their sister." He replied, "Okay, they should go quickly." Then he looked at the flower in his hands and thought, "Snow flower. In this world, it's called an ice flower. It seems that in this world, it's known as a mysterious flower that emits only a useless cold air. But in the Northern Sea, where Mudok lived, the fruit of this flower is an unrivaled elixir. Of course, due to the extreme cold emanating from this flower, harvesting its fruits can be difficult." The next second, he pulled out a fruit that glowed with bright energy. He thought, but for someone like him, who is proficient in ice chi, this is a different story entirely. Sabine fainted because her ice chi wasn't strong enough to withstand the cold. He then placed the fruit in her mouth, then covered her forehead with his hands and began concentrating the energy. He began calling her and told her to open her eyes. The next second, she sat up in surprise and asked, "Master?" He directed a stream of energy at her and said, "Yes, it is he, Sabine. When she wakes up, she should sit up straight and try to direct her chi." She rubbed her eyes and replied, "Yes, master." She then concentrated energy in her hands and took a deep breath. And the protagonist thought, okay, the cold chi in her body has been perfectly condensed into internal energy. The next second, she suddenly opened her eyes and falling onto the pillow, said, "Oh my." MC thought she had just fallen asleep. Her internal energy had increased significantly compared to before. The effect was better than he thought. If this continues, he thinks it would be a good idea to increase the intensity of his training. Of course, before that, when Sabine wakes up, he needs to go to the flower field with everyone. Maybe he can achieve his goal much sooner. Later, she woke up after a good rest. After collecting the ice wyvern eggs, a large-scale reorganization began at White Castle. First, Mudok checked the list compiled by Jerome and organized his own squad of elite knights, the Blizzard Knights. He said he wouldn't say much and would make them his knights, the Blizzard Knights. Shuart, who showed the best results in all aspects, was appointed captain of the squad, and then, with Mudok's help, schools, hospitals, restaurants, bars, a clothing store, and so on were built. He also assigned people to positions according to their talents. At one point, he was checking the records and said that if a reorganization was needed, then the appropriate employees should be brought in. Jerome noted that this was correct. Osborne was assigned to White Castle Security Service, and Jerome, who was a capable man, became his assistant. Then the protagonist said that Osborne would do better in the security service than as his assistant. Jerome, he will be his assistant. He put his hand to his chest and said, "But his mission is to teach others magic." The protagonist asked, "He doesn't want to?" In response, he confirmed it. The MC asked, "What does he mean, fool?" He replied that he will work hard. The protagonist noted that of course he should. Jerome put his hand to his chest and thought that he deserved 1,000,000 gold pieces. In addition, 2 armed groups were created. The protagonist said that for now they would only create 2. The guard squad would be responsible for guarding the outer perimeter of White Castle, and they would also conduct reconnaissance throughout the Karelun region and recapture stray residents. Then he pointed to himself and said that he would be the captain of the guard. The other group would be the Wyvern Knights, but Jake raised his hand and shouted, "Hooray! He must grant this to him, Lord." He thought that he was still worried, since there were no wyverns that an adult could ride or fly on yet. They were only just being prepared. Once the number of Wyvern Knights was determined, the remaining eggs would be used by the Karelin trading group. They would fly on wyverns and perform top-notch work. Then the protagonist looked at Luna and said, "It's a secret. He's the leader. She will be acting." She held the meat in her hands and agreed. He said, "That's all. Well done." A few days later, Jerome, holding the suitcases, said that he was really late. He should have asked him to lighten the load, or he wondered how much more chaos there would be today. Then he entered the room and, scratching the back of his head, apologized. He said that he was sorry he was late. He walked over to a chair, and Max looked at him and said that they were just getting started. Then, Jerome looked at Sabine in surprise and thought, wasn't she the one who got sick recently? Why on earth was she here? At that moment, MC folded his hands in front of himself and said, since he came, he should quickly sit down. He answered, yes. Then the protagonist said, Osborne, he must continue. He answered, yes. Then he looked at the recordings and said, only a short time has passed since the guard squad was formed, but there are already more than 20 people in prisons. The problem is that more than half of them are escapees who came from outside. Max stood up from his seat and shouted, sir, these are clearly criminals. They should arrest them all and lock them up so they don't cause any more trouble. Jake slammed his hand on the table and shouted that it was true, and MC said, if so, should they arrest him first? As the main culprits of the rebellion that led to the exile of such a capable former leader like Jerome for no reason? Max frowned and shouted that that was different. It was self-defense to protect Karelin's autonomy from the central nobility. The protagonist, frowning, turned his gaze on him and said that his actions were a noble struggle, while the actions of squad leader Schwart were petty theft. He looked away and said, no, this. He apologizes, Knight Schwart. He replied that he hoped he would never forget the cause of the common people's suffering, Max. They were in a meeting now, so they should talk about this later. The protagonist thought, God, how could he be so short-sighted? Then he asked, are there any other opinions? At that moment, Sabine asked if she could express her opinion. He replied, wow, yes. She rose from her seat and placing her hand on her chest, said that if Sir Max was saying that, then there was a negative public opinion about the fugitives in the village. The protagonist noted that this was true, and she added, and the cannibal hunt begins today. He asked, what does that matter? She asked, then why don't they put prisoners at the forefront of the hunt? The others looked at her in surprise, and MC smiled and thought that was a good idea. Then he said, she should continue talking, Sabine. After a while, the monster stepped forward and then screamed loudly. At that moment, Lennon peeked out from behind a tree and said that he thought they had lost him, Captain Schwart. The first-class fugitives, Gregory, Captain Schwart, and Lennon had gathered at this point. Schwart said, looks like it. Once they've gotten far enough, they should conceal their presence and attack as usual. His subordinates responded, yes. Then the monster advanced, and the rest of the team rushed to the attack. Gregory struck with his weapon. Lennon added his blow and shouted, we need to take this. Gregory then shouted, careful Lennon. Attack from the front. The monster spun around, swinging its weapon. Lennon, breathing heavily, thrust his sword forward and shouted, it's too late to escape this. At that moment, Schwart rushed forward and shouted, down, Lennon! He thrust his blades forward, flying straight toward the monster. The others followed, and everyone struck. Just before this, Osborne looked at Sabine and asked, does she mean they should put them in the vanguard and use them as human shields? That seemed like a last resort. She shook her head and said that if the teacher went with them, it would be much more humane than throwing them in jail. He wasn't one to waste human energy so easily. Then what if they fought together? In the present tense, Schwart asked, Lennon, is he okay? He replied, it was a bit risky, but they did it. Gregory laughed and said, Lennon's speaking out again. After that, Kane smiled and said, they all saw it, Lennon, and he said it was a crisis, just like that time in prison when he threw the pickaxe. He laughed and told him not to bluff anyway. Well said, Lennon. They received a solid reward. How about a drink? Gregory put a hand on his shoulder and replied that this was a chance for them to start over. Gregory. He laughed in response and remarked that he had really screwed up. Sabine had said shortly before that people's opinions of them would definitely change. The protagonist thought that it seemed they had become more united thanks to their cooperation. To think that his apprentice had suggested this. At that moment, the creature peeked out from behind a tree, watching what was happening. After a while, Jake pointed forward and shouted, there. The guy told him to take his time and approach the trap slowly. The archer replied, if only he could. The guy asked, did he hear? The archer drew his weapon and replied, yes. He was going to fire a few shots, so he should get ready. The next second, he fired several arrows that hit a tree, and the guy said that he thought it was the rustling of leaves blown by the wind. The archer agreed, probably so. They should first collect the arrows and inspect other places. At that moment, a creature peeked out from behind a tree. They were surprised. What was that? Meanwhile, MC folded his arms and said that the people of the duchy are no longer afraid of the ice ogres. Osborne clenched his fist, smiling, and noted that it was true. Everyone is full of energy. Jerome said, it's all thanks to his leadership, Lord. Everything is going according to plan. He replied, Jerome, he must instruct everyone so that they do not act rashly. He replied that he understood, Lord. Then he approached the man and asked, are they still studying monsters other than ogres and wyverns? Jerome said, yes, they need to systematize some more information. Then Osborne looked at Phil and shouted, "What happened? Is everyone safe?" He replied that everyone survived, but was seriously injured and is being treated in the hospital. The protagonist asked, "What's going on, Osborne?" He said, "It looks like they have a problem." He asked, "Is there a problem?" He answered, "A monster different from an ice ogre appeared." The protagonist asked, "A monster?" Phil approached him and said that 2 of those who went with him to investigate the monster activity were attacked by this monster. The protagonist asked, "Are you sure it's not an ogre?" He answered, "Yes, it's a different species." The MC asked him to explain, and he added, "It's completely covered in white fur and incredibly huge. It looked to be at least 3 meters tall." The protagonist looked away thoughtfully, and he added, "Ogres are about the same size, but this thing turned out to be more intelligent than ogres." Then the protagonist said, "Jerome, the hunt is over." He asked, "Does he plan to go on his own?" He answered, "Yes. It looks like he needs to act on his own. He must go after him as soon as everything is cordoned off." He answered, "Yes." And then MC ran into the forest and thought, if what he was saying is true, then this monster is someone he knows. Yes, he had already heard Edmund's explanation. Then he remembered how he told about the Yeti. The next second, he used his inner sight and, sensing a huge creature, thought that he found it. He took out his weapon and the next second found himself behind the creature, after which he swung the weapon and jumped to attack. At that moment, the Yeti turned around in fear, and then MC wounded its arm. The creature began to run in the opposite direction, and the protagonist thought that the attack was unsuccessful. This big guy is fast, but now he is absolutely sure when he saw it, it is a Yeti. They stopped, looking at each other. Then he thought, why is the creature that was roaring just recently now acting like a frightened wildcat? It seems he felt its strength. It is red in its bestial gaze. Then he asked, is he a human? After that, the protagonist held the weapon in front of him and thought that out of curiosity, he wanted to let it live, but he couldn't spare someone who had harmed his people. He said that in his next life, he should be reborn as a human. The next second, he kicked off the ground and found himself above the Yeti, who held his hand out in front of him, trying to block his attack. Then MC jumped to the side and thought in surprise, a flash of light, and he disappeared an instant before the impact. What kind of magic was that? Wait a second. Green light, green. When he came to this world, Luffy told him that warp magic can be used by mages of the 5th level and above, but most don't rise above the 1st or 2nd circle. So the 5th circle is something similar to the spiritual or earthly level. And yet, that humanoid creature covered in white fur used such powerful magic. Then he said, although who cares, he'll still catch him. The next second he rushed forward, and stopping in the forest said, so big, yet he runs like a rat. He wondered if he could sense it nearby. Even teleportation hadn't helped him get far, within 2 kilometers. He said it was definitely somewhere nearby. Then he turned sharply and put his foot on several fallen trees. Looking ahead, he asked, a cave? And then his eyes widened in surprise as he walked inside and asked, is this an archive? He looked at the bookshelves and wondered, in the middle of a snowy wasteland? Then he noticed a Yeti sitting behind the bookshelves and asked what it was doing. He should have at least tried to hide. Hey Yeti. In response, it fearfully told him not to come closer. The protagonist said he wouldn't kill him, he should calm down. Is he human? Condol folded his hands behind his head and replied that it wasn't. He was the great warrior Hori Condol. The protagonist asked thoughtfully, a Hori warrior, Condol? At that moment, Jerome approached him from behind and said that it meant Yeti, Lord. The protagonist remarked that he was right on time, Jerome. He agreed with him, then added that there were traces of destruction all around. Only he, Lord, leaves such things behind. Then he spread his arms out to the sides, looked ahead and said, this is the destruction of nature. In the present tense, he added, but why would a Yeti, the descendant of an ancient legendary family, be here? The protagonist said that he was just about to ask him that. Then he hit the bookshelf next to Condol and asked, hey, Condol, right? Where did he come from? He looked at him silently, and the protagonist asked, is he trying to escape again? He must answer. His patience is not infinite. Then Condol lowered his gaze and shouted, from Glack, and he asked, Glack, is this his village? He nodded in response, and the protagonist said, so there are many like him out there. He confirmed this, and the protagonist thought, next question. Then he asked him to explain why he attacked his people. His answer would determine what he was. Before he could finish speaking, Condol shouted that he hadn't killed. He was a great Haori warrior. He rose to his feet and added that he didn't attack people without reason. The protagonist looked at him thoughtfully and asked, is that true, Condol? He frowned in response and said that he was Condol. Jerome, studying the books, said that the Yeti doesn't lie, Lord. Yes, from his observations, most of them were seriously injured. There were no fatalities among them. MC remembered Phil's words and thought, come to think of it, there were no fatalities in the report. Then Condol crouched on the ground and, clenching his fist, said, that's right. The people themselves invaded sacred land and Condol drove them away. He never attacks first, never. Then the protagonist folded his arms and asked, so while hunting ice ogres, they encroached on the territory of the Yeti? Jerome answered, it seemed so. The protagonist thought, Edmund gave false information about the Yeti. And then he said, Jerome, he must heal Condol's wounds. He answered, okay, Lord. By the way, he is Condol. At that moment, Jerome pointed a magic item to Condol's wounded arm, and MC called him. He asked what he wanted. After that, the protagonist smiled and said that he showed him sacred ground. He will order his people not to meddle there anymore. Condol happily asked, really? He answered, yes. But how dare he address him so impolitely? Condole asked in surprise. What? And then the protagonist sighed and said, what else can you expect from someone who can't even speak properly? Then Jerome said that he was finished, Lord. The protagonist walked in the opposite direction and said that they needed to go. Jerome called him, and he asked what else. He folded his hands and said that he wants to ask him something. After some time, Edmund asked Henry how much had passed since the promised time. He answered, about 3 months. Edmund laughed and noticed that it was true. He was sitting on the ground and called Henry again. He looked at him and thoughtfully asked, yes, Sir Edmund? The next second, Edmund grabbed his head and shouted that they were finished. The magic swordsman had promised, after all. He remembered how MC told him to just be patient for 3 months. He would definitely send them ice. He covered his face with his hands and, sinking to the ground, shouted, but since then there was no news. Henry wondered, was it really said that way? Then he put his hand on Edmund's shoulder and told him to calm down, Mr. Edmund. He wasn't the type of person to break promises, was he? Then they looked forward in surprise, because a wyvern was flying straight towards them. It released its sharp claws, preparing to land. They screamed in fear. A wyvern? They jumped to the side in fear, and at that moment Sabine, sitting on the wyvern, said, Mr. Edmund. He asked in surprise, that voice? Then he looked at her and shouted, Sabine. She smiled and said that the ice delivery has arrived. He joyfully shouted, wow, it's ice. He believed in him, Mr. Magic Swordsman. And Henry thought in surprise, an ice wyvern? A monster whose power is equivalent to that of an entire army of knights? And he uses them to deliver crushed ice? What the hell is going on in the north? And then Sabine put her finger to her lips and added, oh right, the teacher asked me to give something to this person. She handed the letter to Edmund while he stroked the ice wyvern and asked, this person? Then he smiled and said, yeah, this person. Sometime later, in the gazebo, Justin said, Her Highness Princess Escald. She held the cup in her hand, looked at him, and he thanked her for accepting an invitation. Then she placed the cup on the saucer, and he added, Your Majesty, she grows more beautiful every day. She replied that he was too kind, Sir Justin. He took a small sip of his drink and thought that she was still straightforward. She didn't even try to fake a smile. Well, pleasure only comes from fighting for what you want. He would just wait and see the smile on that indifferent face. At that moment, the maid approached Escald and whispered, She apologizes, Your Majesty. She asked, What is it? And the next second, she cried out in surprise, What? Have you received a letter from Baron Blizzard? At that moment, Justin, perplexed, rose from his seat. The maid said that the letter had been left in the office. Escald followed her and said, then they should hurry. Justin shouted that she should wait. She was leaving already? He came this morning to see her, Her Highness the Princess. She turned around and said that she heard that one day is not enough for swordsmanship training. He must not waste time, and must return quickly. Then she told Lenzia that they needed to go. She agreed with her. They walked to the exit, and Justin irritably slammed his fist on the table and shouted, Blizzard, this guy! After some time, Escald read the letter, which said, Dear Princess Escald, how is she? He is doing well, thanks to a lucky charm from her. The northern lands are a wonderful place to live. Dazzling crystal caves, hot spring water, inside a cave where it is warm all year round, a city called White Castle was built. It is a truly beautiful place, but there is a small omission in it. She is not here. This fact alone makes this place feel so empty. He sends her a small gift, expressing his longing. She said, surprised, wow. She took the flower in her hands, and the last letter said that he would write to her again from Baron Blizzard, who missed her. She pressed the flower to her chest and then placed her hand on her forehead and asked, What's wrong with her? Why does she keep thinking about this man? Then she turned her gaze to the flower, and after that she got up from her seat and said that she must check everything personally, see for herself. Meanwhile, the protagonist was concentrating energy in the flower, then looked at it and said that he was sure he could break anything. It was difficult to control the creation of such small parts. At that moment, Jerome came up to him and called him. He asked, what happened? He replied that he thought he should go straight to the office. A great discovery, a real jackpot. MC said, okay, stop whining. Jerome said he wanted to be able to create something like that. The protagonist said, hurry. They exited the cave after a while. He asked in surprise, what? Is this the library of an ancient wizard? He folded his arms and turned away, asking, what the hell is going on? Jerome threw his hand out and shouted, doesn't he sound happy at all? This is a huge discovery. This is the legacy of an ancient family, the cornerstone for reviving forgotten ancient magic, and the ability to transcend the fifth circle. Then the MC widened his eyes in surprise and said he felt some kind of energy. Jerome? What's that in his bosom? He smiled awkwardly, then said, this nonsense, my lord. He didn't tell him because it was pointless. Before he could finish speaking, the protagonist magically snatched a bag from his belt and began to open it. He said that people's curiosity increases when they see something hidden. Then he asked in surprise, this? He looked into the bag and asked, are they just stones? He replied that he hadn't tried to hide it on purpose. It's a mana stone. It contains compressed mana and magic. The protagonist looked at the stone and asked, are they mana stones? He then placed the stone on the table and asked, what's so special about these stones that he decided to hide them? He replied, but actually, he's a fourth circle mage now. With these words, he began concentrating energy in his hands and added, he's almost reached the fifth, but he hasn't been able to go higher for a long time, so he thought the stone might help. The protagonist looked at him and said thoughtfully that he understood that it wasn't easy to overcome such a barrier. He could imagine how it felt. He replied that he thanked him, my lord. So, before he could finish, MC added, that's precisely why this is absolutely unacceptable. Jerome looked at him in bewilderment. then put his hand to his chest and shouted, "Wouldn't enhancing his abilities benefit Kurlin? He's asking him. He has to allow it." But the protagonist firmly refused, adding, "Yes, with a mana stone he might be able to advance further. But what will he do then? Will he run off to find the next mana stone? The speed of reaching the next level isn't the point. Far more important is the pursuit of true understanding. Growth is achieved through hard work and time. There are no shortcuts." Jerome clenched his fist, then relaxed it, and looking at this, thought, as annoying as it was, he was right. After all, he had reached the 4th circle on his own. He remembered how, not long before, his grandfather had placed his hand on his shoulder and said that magic doesn't tolerate haste, that he must go slowly, step by step, and he would understand everything. That's what magic is. In the present tense, he said that at some point, he began to forget his grandfather's instructions without realizing it. MC thought he had almost decided that he would have to force it on him, but fortunately, he understood without it. Then he asked, "So what else can this stone be used for?" He replied that it was suitable for almost any type of magic. For example, for strengthening mana, creating barriers, or communication spells. Then the protagonist abruptly rose from his seat and shouted, "Communications? He means that with a mana stone, even a mage isn't needed for communication?" He answered, "Exactly." He held the stone in his hand and added that if he cast a communication spell on the mana stone, even a person without magic could communicate with it. And this specimen is top-notch. With a stone of this level, they could even establish communication with the Zeba Empire across the sea. MC asked, "Jerome, does he know what the most important thing is in governing a country?" He replied that he wasn't sure. The protagonist replied, "The speed of receiving information. Whoever collects and transmits information faster dictates their own rules." "Jerome, he must immediately transform all the mana stones into communication stones." He replied, "Yes, my lord." After a while, they went outside and MC was holding the stone in his hands. A voice was heard from there. "Hey, is it Jake? Can you hear him?" Osborne looked at it in surprise. The protagonist smiled and said, "Yes, Jake, he can hear him perfectly." "How far is he?" He was sitting on an ice wyvern and, smiling, said, "So he is now over the plain 10 kilometers from White Castle. The connection is excellent. No interference, my lord." At this moment, Jerome called the protagonist. He said, "Excellent. There is a signal. No interference." The communication stone test was successful. After all, they can maintain communication with these stones. At that moment, Jake shouted, "Wow!" The protagonist started calling him and told him to come back. He said, "Triple dive with a spin." Then the protagonist called Osborne and told him to increase the range of the tests as soon as Jake returns. Jerome shouted, "My lord, he will break the communication device so much." At that moment, he heard a voice, "Teacher." Sabine dismounted from the ice wyvern and ran up to him, shouting that she was here. He smiled and said, "Great, she should come in." After a while, everyone gathered in the office, and Sabine asked what was wrong with Lord Edmund's letter. MC looked at the notes and replied that it wasn't. Then he looked at her and said that he had asked her to send him information about the political situation in neighboring countries, and he had done his best. He thought about it, but the name Inos mentioned in the letter gave him a strange feeling. He asked if the name Inos meant anything to them. Schwartz said he hadn't seen it himself, so it might not be certain, but rumor had it that he was a great swordsman. The others looked at him in surprise and shouted, "What? A great swordsman? Isn't a great swordsman higher than a common swordsman? There shouldn't be anyone higher than a swordsman on this continent." The protagonist then gestured for silence. Everyone began exchanging glances. Then, the protagonist closed his eyes and thought, "In the Central Plains, a great swordmaster is called one who has reached the realm of enlightenment. One who has reached the realm of enlightenment can create the material embodiment of a sword. What a disappointment that only about 10 people here have reached the level of sword aura. Life without worthy opponents for a warrior is terribly boring. The fact that a master of the enlightenment level has appeared, even if he won't be his equal, he wants to meet him." With these thoughts, he smiled madly and thought, "The strongest in this world." Schwartz added, "Perhaps it doesn't matter, but he'd heard something strange." MC asked, "Strange?" He replied, "They say when he fights he exudes the scent of plum blossoms." The protagonist thought in surprise, "Plum blossoms, sword mastery with the fragrance of a happy blossom. This is the Manhwa sect. Only they know this technique. No way. Could it be that he's not the only one? Has anyone else from the Central Plains come to this world?" At the time, he was busy unifying the Central Plains. He extended his hand and said, "Manhwa sect? A sword that exudes the scent of plum blossoms. A fine sword, but the opponent is not his level. Zhongpunjin, the head of the Manhwa sect." At that moment he was hanging on an icy branch and said, "Mudok, you bastard. If his disciple were here, everything would have turned out differently." The protagonist looked at him and asked, "Is he talking about the one who ran away a couple of days ago?" In response, he shouted that he didn't run away. He disappeared from solo training. It was as if he had evaporated from this world. In the present, MC rested his head on his folded hands in front of him and thought that this seemed like a stupid excuse. "Really?" Then Jerome said, "My lord, is that all that was in the letter?" He replied, "Nothing particularly important. Perhaps the kingdom sent an inspection team." The others looked at him in bewilderment and shouted, "Inspection? My lord, what the hell is going on?" He looked at them in surprise and asked if this was cause for panic. They replied, "Of course. There are only 2 reasons for an inspection visit: a royal stroll or the arrest and execution of traitors." Jerome rose from his seat and added, "In any case, we must prepare. When did they say the commission would arrive? The protagonist waved his finger and said, today at 1 way. Is that 1 p.m. local time? In other words, right now. At that moment, a huge number of warriors gathered near the castle. Jerome went to the window and, looking at them, said, what? Really? They've come? Sabine was surprised. Even knights are here? Then Justin walked forward and shouted, Lord of White Castle, Baronet Blizzard. He must come down immediately and give the inspection a proper reception. Then MC approached him and said, haven't seen you lately, Justin. He smiled, pointing to his hand, and asked if his hand was okay. Justin grabbed his hand and clenched his teeth in irritation. At that moment, those remaining in the room were surprised. What? When did he manage to get down there? But more importantly, was it Justin? At that moment, Jerome thought, is he out of his mind? Lord Blizzard? Is he seriously planning treason? Meanwhile, the protagonist smiled and said, she can no longer hide. She must come out. Princess Escaled Her Highness. She said, Lord Justin, he must stop threatening. Then she came closer and, removing her hood, asked how he was doing. Baronet Blizzard. After a while, she looked around and happily said, wow. The protagonist said, this is the crystal cave he wrote about. She was surprised and said, breathtaking. Then she added, hot springs, she wants to see that too. He replied, okay. The inspection team arrived, ostensibly for a royal inspection. As soon as she read the letter, Escald begged her father to let her go with the group. At that moment, MC remarked that she was still as stubborn as ever. That talisman, frankly. Before he could finish speaking, she shouted, the matter is closed, okay? He looked at her and thought, even in such small details, she was exactly like in her previous life. He had been through a lot, fought, conquered the world to avenge Huan, and after a long journey, he finally met her here. And although her appearance had changed, the fact that he was by her side again was happiness. After some time, they arrived at the right place, and Ascald, leaning slightly, said, so, here are the hot springs. How beautiful. At that moment, the protagonist extended his hand to her and, hugging her, said that, in his opinion, she was even more beautiful. She looked at him in surprise and asked, Baronet? Then he said that he really missed her, Huan. She pulled away from him abruptly and asked, Huan? He looked at her, frightened. She asked, who is it? He raised his hands and said that he apologizes. Escald, it just burst out. She said, Baronet Blizzard. She liked his gaze. She felt warmth in its directness. She lowered her head and added, but today she finally understood something. Baronet Blizzard, is this affection for her or for that woman? He looked at her in bewilderment and tried to explain himself in confusion, but she turned and said, no, he doesn't have to say anything. Tears streamed down her face. She headed for the exit and added that he shouldn't bother. She already understood everything. He extended his hands to her, then clenched his fists, and thought that, for a moment, he was speechless. Huan and Escald. Even if he'd told her about reincarnation, she still wouldn't have understood the feelings he carried through the years. He was walking through the forest when a man with a sharp blade leaped at him from behind, weapon drawn. After a moment, Justin turned slightly and said, Arbon. He bowed and asked, did he call him Sir Justin? He asked in return, how did it go? He replied, the ambush was a success. Justin smiled. Meanwhile, the pendant had been torn from the protagonist's neck and was lying on the ground. At that moment, Escald entered the room, noticing Justin killing several knights. He smiled, looking at her, and said that he apologized for the late visit, Princess Escald. She looked at him in fear, and then reached for the doorknob, trying to close it, but he severed the handle with a sharp swing of his weapon, then cut the door itself into many pieces. The next second, Escald flew back. He approached her, lifting her chin with his fingers, saying that she had been rude, Your Majesty. She brushed off his feelings, and then fell for the first person she met. She indignantly shouted at him to do it again. He had caused chaos over such a trifle? Baronet Blizzard would not let this go. He smiled, stepped away from her, and waved his hand, saying that even now she was still thinking about him, that he was dead. She looked at him in surprise, and he added that he had sent a group of elite assassins after him. At that moment, MC resolutely rushed forward, shooting down everyone and everything in his path. He stopped next to Escald and asked if she was injured. She looked at him fearfully and said that she was unharmed. And he, Baronet? At that moment, the protagonist frowned, feeling the energy from Justin's remaining sword. He swung his hand sharply, but the sword hit his arm. MC dodged to the side and thought, is he controlling the sword with chi? The next second, the sword burst out of the window and flew far ahead. The protagonist placed a hand on Escald's shoulders and said, Justin, you bastard. It looks like he prepared thoroughly. At that moment, he, clad in armor, walked forward, holding his sword in his hands. Not long before, Sergio had asked if he wanted to finish off that Blizzard bastard. Justin replied, yes, father. Please. He must let him use his elite group of assassins. They are capable of eliminating even a swordmaster, so go with them. Before he could finish speaking, his father firmly refused him, saying that it was not enough. He grabbed the sword, emitting powerful energy, and said that if he intended to kill him, he must prepare properly. A sword controlled by the wielder's mana and creating magical armor. With this, even a great swordmaster could be killed. In the present, Justin grinned madly and started laughing loudly, cutting through a huge rock in front of him and shouting, how can he do that, idiot? Things are different now, right? It's even good that those idiots screwed up, because now he'll finish him off himself. MC blocked this blow, and Escald cried out in alarm, Baron, his hand. And he blocked her path with his hand, and told her not to come closer. She should stay in a safe place. She put her hand to her chest and asked, will he come back? He turned to her, smiling slightly, and told her to just hide and not worry. The next second, he jumped out of a hole in the wall, and landing in front of Justin, said, he's certainly changed since last time, Justin. but he's still just as unremarkable. In response, Justin swung his weapon and shouted, "Empty moralizing again?" The sword flew forward, and the protagonist swung his hand, deflecting it. The next second, Justin himself was in front of him, swinging his weapon, but the protagonist blocked his attack with his hand, and then swung it, knocking the opponent back. Justin shouted, "He has to stop talking nonsense, Blizzard." At that moment, he grinned madly and thought, this is it. He has nowhere to retreat. He's already exhausted after fighting the mercenaries. The perfect chance to kill him. He swung his weapon and shouted, "This is the end for him, Blizzard." But the next second, MC launched his attack, hitting his arm directly. Justin, looking at the wound, thought, idiot, the same wound as before. He dropped to his knees, clutching his wounded arm, and let out a loud cry. And the protagonist said, "Great." He couldn't hit Eskald at this distance. He replied, "Did he deliberately feign injury to draw him away from the princess?" He concentrated energy in his hand and replied, adding, "A cornered beast is dangerous. Even a mouse will bite a cat if it's pinned against a wall." A rat like him dared to touch Eskald. Justin leaped into action the next second, shouting indignantly, how dare he underestimate him? The next second, the protagonist pointed the hand he'd concentrated his energy in at him and said, "No, he's just being careful. He can't lose everything." The next second, an incredibly bright flash of white light spread across the area, and Justin was kneeling before him, his body trembling. He asked in surprise, "What happened? His mana, he couldn't gather it?" MC noted that trying was useless. He had just destroyed his Dantian. From now on, he would never be able to use mana again. Justin looked at him in horror and swung his fist, screaming loudly. But the protagonist slapped him across the cheek and told him to spend the rest of his life repenting. Now he would know what it was like to be weak. Then he looked at the sun and said, "It's so late, it's time to go back. She's waiting for him." Sometime later, Justin and several other warriors were kneeling behind bars. Justin's plan was thwarted, and this is what happened to the instigator. His body trembled. He said, "Mana, this can't be." "Why, how?" The protagonist smiled and thought that now all that was left was a date with Eskald. Then he widened his eyes in surprise and turned around sharply, noticing Eskald holding Jerome's hands. He thought, what's going on? About 15 minutes ago, MC raised his hand and shouted, "Great, it must be around here somewhere. They're starting the search. Whoever finds it first will receive a generous reward." The people scattered around, and Jerome thoughtfully asked, was this where he was ambushed and lost his precious pendant? The protagonist confirmed it, and he said, he found out they were experienced killers. How did he fight off their attacks? MC sighed and asked, experienced? Well, they move quietly, but overall, weak. If he had been in better shape back then, he wouldn't have received a scratch. He replied, yeah, impressive of course. At that moment, Eskald said that she thought so. He lost it because of her. They turned to face her, and the protagonist said, "Princess Eskald." Tears streamed down her flushed face, and she said that if he had rushed to look for it right away, maybe he would have found it, but he couldn't, because he went to save her. The protagonist folded his hands in front of him and said that it wasn't her fault, princess. Then he pointed his finger at Jerome and said that only that bastard Justin was to blame. Right, Jerome? At that moment, Eskald looked at him in surprise and asked, "Jerome? It couldn't be Count Jerome von Carowin?" She ran up to him, grabbed his hand and asked, "What is the Count doing here?" She heard that he had gone missing. He smiled awkwardly and said, "It just happened that way." He pulled away from her hand and said, "Your Highness." He understands that she is happy, but such a boisterous greeting is a little embarrassing. At that moment, MC put his hand on his shoulder and, smiling, asked, "The two of them seem to be quite close." "Jerome," he shouted, "he got it all wrong." He asked, "Really?" But to him, it seemed like everything was quite clear. At that moment, Lencia approached Eskald and asked, "Your Highness, perhaps we should clear up the misunderstanding?" The protagonist, still holding Jerome, asked, "What? He, whom the princess respected the most?" Eskald smiled and said that was true. He was a truly outstanding person. Jerome was an aristocrat who cared about the people. She felt so sorry when he was exiled to this wilderness. He couldn't imagine how painful it was to find out that he is missing. At that moment, the protagonist looked at his subordinate and said, "I see." He looked back and asked, "Who even boasts about their good deeds?" Then the protagonist asked, "But why is she speaking in the past tense?" She answered shyly, because now she knew him. They both blushed with embarrassment, and the protagonist said, "Princess." She abruptly ran in the opposite direction and shouted, "Oh right. He was looking for the pendant, right? She'll look over there." The maid ran after her and shouted, "Your Highness." A few seconds later, she stopped among the trees and, trying to catch her breath, looked down. She was surprised to notice a sparkle in the snow. At that moment, the maid ran up to her and shouted, "Your Majesty." Eskald said, "Lencia." She picked up the pendant and asked, "Isn't this the thing the baronet was looking for?" She replied, "Yes, this is it." She would inform him immediately. Eskald thought, judging by the way he looked then, it was probably connected to that girl named Hwyan. At that moment, the maid said, "Princess Eskald. She has the same expression on her face as the baronet." She was surprised, right? She replied, "There's no need to rush, Your Highness. He probably thinks about her as much as she thinks about him." At that moment, Eskald looked at the pendant in her hands and smiled. She thought she had been jealous at first, but now she was simply curious. What kind of woman could have captured the heart of such a wonderful man? What kind of woman was she? Not long before, Chunhak had shouted, "They must remove this immediately. A flower blooming in the name of true love? Nonsense." He turned around and shouted, "She already has a fiancé. Stop being distracted by such nonsense. It's better for her to prepare for the wedding he arranged." Hwan reached out to the broken vase and the fallen flower. Then she rose to her feet, placed her hand on her chest, and said, "Father, he must open his eyes. Lovers who make the flower of love bloom are blessed as true soulmates." Tears streamed down her face, and she lowered her gaze, adding that even after witnessing such a miracle, he still insists on a political marriage. It seems the alliance is more important to him than his own daughter. At that moment, his hand trembled, and Huan added, "Just as he once abandoned her mother for the sake of the alliance, so he did with her." Before she could finish speaking, he shouted, "Enough! Guards, they must lock her up. Don't let her into the ice palace until the wedding. They must not take their eyes off her." The men grabbed her by the arms and she shouted, "Father!" She thought it would have been better if she hadn't returned then. The next second, Eskald opened her eyes. She was lying on the bed, her face illuminated by the light from the window. She sat up, looking out the window, and wondered if this was a dream. Sometime later, Eskald and the maid came to the hot springs, and she wondered, who was that woman from her dream? At that moment, MC came up to her from behind and asked, "Is something wrong, princess?" She was surprised, then turned around and, holding her hands out in front of her, said, "Nothing, Baronet." She lowered her gaze and added, "Really, nothing. He has nothing to worry about." Then he turned around and, smiling, said, "Princess, how about a little trip together? To unwind." She was surprised. He said, "A trip?" After a while, an ice wyvern flew up to them. Lenzia grabbed her head and trembled with fear. The princess looked at the creature in surprise and said, "Wow, is that an ice wyvern?" She spread her arms out to the sides and, smiling, said that she had never seen so many tamed ice wyverns. And the protagonist smiled and said that they were trained from hatching. They are very friendly. There is nothing to be afraid of. At that moment, Jerome approached them and said, "My lord, everything is ready for departure." He replied, "Excellent." He said, "Have you prepared that very thing?" He confirmed it. The next second, Condole leaped forward. Eskald screamed in fear. Jerome apologized and said he didn't mean to scare her. "That's Condole the Yeti." At that moment, Condole raised his paw in greeting, and Eskald, bending down before him, asked in surprise, "Yetis, they say? The legendary people from the snowy plains?" She picked Condole up in her arms and, smiling, said she would never have thought they were so small and cute. Jerome looked at her and said he was glad she liked him. He remembered how, not long before, the protagonist had extended his hand to Condole and said that she might be scared when she saw a Yeti. Jerome, he must shrink it with magic. He sighed and replied, "Magic isn't omnipotent, of course." In the present, Eskald placed Condole on her head and continued to smile happily, and then the protagonist asked, "So, are they going?" And then he called Lilith. He climbed onto the ice wyvern, then extended his hand forward and said, "Princess, she must take his hand." After that, she took his hand, and together they mounted the creature. The next second, they took off. The princess closed her eyes and thought, "It's scary. This is her first time rising so high, but since he, the baronet, is here, nothing will happen, right?" At that moment, the protagonist placed his hand on her shoulder and asked, "Princess, would she like to look ahead?" She hesitantly opened her eyes, and then looked ahead in surprise, seeing the bright sun hiding behind the clouds. She looked around and said, "Oh gods, incredible beauty." The protagonist asked, "Did she feel better, princess?" She smiled and thought that he had always taken care of her. Then she looked at him and, smiling, said that it was all thanks to him. He also smiled and told her to hold on tight in that case, princess. She was surprised, and he shouted that they would fly faster. Then she screamed in fear. After some time, Louis said, "My lord, you should have at least warned me in advance." The protagonist approached her and asked how she thought he could contact her from such a distance. Then he smiled and added, "Louis, she simply needs to pass on all the information from the trade to Jerome. He is counting on her." He was surprised. Everything for him? And he, my lord? The protagonist smiled and said that he would have lunch with Eskald at a local restaurant. He must finish everything before he returned. Louis said that she understood. Jerome asked, "Want to know his opinion?" Meanwhile, Eskald approached the railing and, looking forward, smiled. At that moment, MC approached her and said that he prepared this for her. "Do you like it?" She replied, "Very much." Then she noticed the pendant on his neck and thought, "A flower in his pendant, baronet. She feels like she's seen it somewhere before." Then she remembered the dream and woke up, hearing the protagonist start calling her. He asked if she was okay. She apologized and said that she was just thinking. She remembered a strange dream last night. He asked, "A strange dream?" She replied that there were people there, in unfamiliar clothes and houses that she had never seen before. She was in her early 20s, a girl with pale skin and dark hair, with calmness in her eyes. But in that dream, sadness was reflected on her face, because she was in love with one man, but her father tried to marry her off to another for political gain. All in all, a very strange dream. Then she laughed awkwardly, and the MC, picking up the pendant, smiled and said, "It really is unusual." Then she added, "And it seems she was desperately calling out for someone in the dream." That's right, she kept repeating, "Gaga." The protagonist thought only one person called him Gaga, Hwayan. The protagonist clutched his pendant to his chest and was silent for a moment. Eskald turned to him and asked if everything was all right. He replied yes. He'd simply paused for a moment. Let her forgive him for that. The food was getting cold, and they should begin eating. Eskald informed him she had a request. Every time he called her princess, she felt a distance between them. If he didn't mind, from now on, he could simply call her Eskald. She was happy to ask, and Mudok looked at her in surprise, recalling the outline of Hwayan's body. He smiled and replied, "Okay." After a while, they were finishing their meal, and Jerome asked if he'd enjoyed the food. He'd finished his business with the Tenston trading house. Eskald asked again, have they been to that trading house? She'd never heard of that name before. Was there such a place in the Drake Kingdom? The protagonist, perplexed, perplexed, replied that he hadn't told her about this. Tenston wasn't located in Drake, but rather in the kingdom of Gaia. Escold's eyes widened in surprise. This kingdom is a powerful nation in the northwest of the continent, ruled by queens for generations. It's even called the Land of Women. The Royal Knightly Order of Gaia, composed entirely of women, is particularly renowned here. Their strength rivals even that of the Wyvern Knights of the Zeb Empire. They've achieved much, but she didn't expect it to reach this kingdom. Her arrival wouldn't cause any diplomatic complications, right? Jerome tried to say something when suddenly the Yeti fell onto their table. Escold covered her mouth with her hands and apologized to Jerome, asking him to continue. Jerome, in turn, told her not to worry about it. They were currently supplying that kingdom with ice ogre skins, which were in high demand. Luna noticed this and suggested opening a workshop for Caranol's company here and establishing direct trade. The protagonist suggested that leather already sells well, so was there any point in them producing these items? He replied that in Gaia, the queen is on the throne, and most of the nobles are women. If they started making clothes and bags to suit their tastes, it would set a fashion trend and significantly increase profits. Luna also said she knew a leather craftsman from Caranol. If he agreed, they could start right away. The protagonist reflected that, as expected, appointing Luna as head was the right decision. He replied, "Okay, he'll get the necessary raw materials, and they can get down to business." Jerome thanked him and bowed. Their leather is so popular that everything sells out on the day of delivery. At that moment, the protagonist abruptly turned away, and Jerome looked ahead with him. A large explosion thundered in the distance of the city, and everything erupted in bright flames. Jerome realized it was near their warehouse, too close. If the wind shifted, the flames could spread. Mudok decided to check on his own and asked Jerome to watch Escold and stay with her. Jerome asked again, was he really going to go alone? It was too dangerous. Escold shouted that she would come with them, and Mudok warned that it wouldn't take long and he would be back soon. A moment later, he jumped from the balcony to the ground, and Escold shouted after him that in that case, they would come with him too. Jerome looked at her in surprise, and Escold continued shouting that they couldn't just sit idly by. Jerome shouted, "What is she talking about?" Escold screamed to go faster after the baronet. Meanwhile, at the very sight of the fire, the girl clutched her head and, with tears in her eyes, screamed, "No, her store. She dedicated her entire life to this. Let them bring more water. There's someone inside." The flames continued to spread everywhere and didn't disappear. The protagonist, arriving at the scene, thought the flames were much stronger than he thought. Suddenly, someone called out to him, and he turned around abruptly. It was Escold and Jur, who had come to his aid. Escold apologized, saying she was too worried to simply wait there. He thought he couldn't blame her, because if their places had been reversed, he would have done the same. They heard someone screaming for help, and the protagonist realized there was a person in the building. Escold called him by name, but he silently looked toward the building and suddenly leaped high into the air to climb into the flames. Everything inside was gradually destroyed by the bright flames, and Mudok found himself inside the house. When he arrived, he looked around and, using his magic, cast a spell, the Divine Ice Palm. Thanks to the ice that began to spread throughout the building, the fire gradually died down, and in the middle of it, he spotted an unconscious girl. He touched her neck to check for a pulse and realized she was still breathing. He grabbed her in his arms and realized she was very lucky to have survived such a fire. The house began to collapse due to the bright flames, and all the parts of the structure began to fall directly on Mudok's head as he tried to exit the building. Suddenly, a sharp shard approached his eye, and he was stunned by what he saw. Using his magical powers, he extinguished the fire with ice. Jerome realized it was magic of the 8th circle. No, it was even ice magic of the 9th circle. When Mudok emerged from the building with the girl in his arms, Escold's mouth opened in admiration and joy. She cried, "Baron?" One day, the queen and her subordinate were sitting at the table. He reported that they had detected signs of rebellion. She grabbed the glass and asked again, "Rebellion? Who dares to act like this and defy her?" The subordinate cried out, "Your Highness." He extended his hand to her, but a moment later she still lost consciousness. After a while, the girl opened her eyes and found herself in bed. She looked around and wondered where she was. She saw an open crack by the door and looked inquiringly through it. When she entered the common room, she saw the guys gathered there. Luna was pleased to see her and asked if she was awake yet. How was she feeling? The girl looked around and wondered what this place was. Luna replied that it was the Carilun firm. The girl thought about it, having heard that the firm had recently become popular due to the leather trade. But still, how had they not recognized it? There was no one from the Kai Kingdom here? Luna replied, "No, they are all from a village in the north of the Drake Kingdom. That's why their company is called that." The girl wondered who saved her. She replied that it was the Lord sitting there at the table and pointed at him. It was Baron Blizzard. The girl looked at him with curiosity and, coming closer, asked, "So it was he who saved her?" She was very grateful to him for this deed. Her name is Scylla. The people around were dumbfounded with surprise and looked at each other. Luna screamed, "What did she just say?" Jake sat up and asked, "Who is that?" Luna started shouting that he was an idiot, that he needs to learn everything about the Kai Kingdom. Jake covered his face with his hand, and Luna announced that Princess Scylla is the second princess of the Kai Kingdom, She reached the level of a swordmaster at 25, and now leads the Royal Knightly Order. She is the most famous person in the kingdom. Luna apologized for their rudeness, Your Highness. Scylla replied that it was fine, since they weren't from the Kai Kingdom, and she'd forget they didn't recognize her. Eskild looked down at the floor, thinking that of all people, she should have met a foreign princess. Hiding her identity would lead to a diplomatic scandal. Blizzard noticed her shaking hands, and Scylla announced that she would personally offer them a reward for saving her life. Once they finished eating, they would accompany her to her palace. Blizzard replied that with all due respect, he would have to refuse, as he had to return home. Scylla asked, confused, what he had just said. Luna realized that this was very bad. Refusing a royal reward in the Kai Kingdom was considered a grave insult. She bowed again to the princess and informed her that their lord must be nervous in front of her, Princess Scylla. They urgently needed to change the subject before things got off track. By the way, how did she, the princess, end up in a burning building? Scylla silently replied that it was Baron Dayton. She had supported him so much up until this point, and he had dared to try to kill her. But she decided not to tell anyone what had happened, and replied that nothing of the sort had happened. The coward who was afraid to confront her had tried to poison her. Luna, dumbfounded, asked again, who tried to poison her? Scylla replied that someone had set the building on fire, and was probably there to make sure she was dealt with. So one way or another, she had to repay them for saving her. So let them name the reward. Blizzard asked again, a reward? Scylla was stunned again, and he replied that it looked as if she was the one who wanted something from him. Scylla screamed at him for being an insolent idiot and mocking her right now. Blizzard responded by saying that she must be very hungry since she hadn't eaten since yesterday, so she should sit down and eat with them. As Scylla began to eat, she wondered if he was really refusing to accept his reward. The food was quite tolerable for her. If he hadn't been her savior, she would have thrown him in jail already. Suddenly, she turned around and saw a sword sitting in front of her, near the kitchen cabinet. She wondered whose sword it was. Blizzard replied that it belonged to him. Scylla wondered if he knew how to handle such a weapon. It seemed he was an aristocrat with knightly experience. As a knight captain, she wondered how this man wielded a sword. She screamed, Baron, let him duel her, after eating. Everyone at the table was stunned by such a request, and the protagonist replied that he refused to obey such an order. He does not fight those weaker than himself. Scylla was dumbfounded with anger, and asked again, weaker? Was he talking about her? She clutched the knife in her hands in rage, and wondered if he really didn't know she was a master swordsman. In the past, foreign male knights had refused to fight her, simply because she was a woman, but getting them to agree was easy for her. This time, she smirked and asked again, was he afraid of losing to her? Eskild, like everyone else at the table, gaped in shock, and suddenly Mudok rose from his seat and announced that they needed to go outside. He had to teach her a lesson. When they reached the clearing, Scylla announced that the duel would be conducted according to knightly rules. Aura was forbidden, and the first one to disable the opponent wins. Did he agree to such conditions? Blizzard replied that everything would be as she wished. Jerome adjusted his glasses and, turning to the baronet, asked him not to forget that the princess stood before him. Any scratch could lead to international conflict. He replied that he understood everything, and that he should stop chatting. Scylla asked confidently, is he finished talking? She had met many such people, and they had all fallen at her feet. Now she eagerly awaited the contortion on his face. Confidently, she grabbed the sword in her hands, and suddenly it glowed with a bright light. The protagonist looked intently in her direction, and a moment later, Scylla was right beside him. A serious battle began between them, and Scylla realized that he had parried her sudden attack, meaning he wasn't bluffing. With these thoughts in mind, she continued her attacks, but the protagonist abruptly turned around and, using his powers, parried another attack before retreating. The two opponents exchanged glances, facing each other, and Scylla continued her attack, reflecting on how he was doing it almost motionlessly, effortlessly, and how he was able to parry all of the swordsman's attacks. This man was incredibly skilled. With these thoughts in mind, she continued the fight, but the protagonist managed to jump aside from her attack again and flew into the distance. When he looked down, he carefully observed Scylla's every move, attempting to destroy her opponent with sharp movements. A moment later, they were far apart, and the protagonist used his technique to destroy his opponent. He looked into the distance and considered, like a master of style, a penetrating copy who had achieved enlightenment, a mad flurry of continuous strikes. If he simply parried the attacks, everything here would be in ruins. A glance lingered between them again, and he decided to end it all with one blow. At the moment of battle, Scylla attempted to kick him, but was suddenly struck squarely in the stomach. Blizzard grabbed her by the neck and flipped her over, slamming her into the ground several times. She screamed, Blizzard. Her face was filled with anger, her teeth clenched in hatred, as the protagonist brought the tip of his sword to her throat. They remained in their position for a moment, and Blizzard asked her to admit defeat. Scylla screamed, no, not again. Jerome tried to intervene, saying they had both fought brilliantly. He clapped his hands and suggested that perhaps they should return inside and continue their meal. Scylla replied that if he didn't agree to a rematch, she would file an official protest with the Drake Kingdom. Jerome was dumbfounded. He had hoped that wouldn't happen. Blizzard replied that admitting defeat was part of a warrior's valor, and she, the princess of a great power, was acting like a child. child. Scylla rose to her feet and asked again what he had just said. Was he talking about her? She grew even more enraged and, using her magical powers, began screaming loudly. What did he even know to say such things to her? Suddenly, the tip of the protagonist's sword appeared in front of her again, and she froze. Everything around her froze again, and she knew she had just lost twice without even noticing him move. At that moment, Mudok asked her, how do they treat saviors in their kingdom? Had it never occurred to her that he held back because she was a princess? She should think about it carefully. Which of them had behaved with dignity? Scylla knelt on the ground, her head bowed in sadness, wondering why she couldn't defeat him. If she accepted defeat, all her achievements would evaporate. She recalled childhood memories of holding a gold medal and shouting, "Mom!" She won first place in the fencing tournament again. Her mother responded in amazement, "Wow, their daughter is truly a miracle. She'll become stronger and be able to protect her mother and sister, and she'll also become the Sword of Gaia." And she'd been that sword her whole life, protecting the kingdom. She'd become the one no one could cross. That's what she'd worked so hard for. And who was this man anyway? The protagonist looked down on her and was silent for a long moment. Suddenly, Eskald approached him and called his name. Mudok ignored her and told Scylla to choose her opponents wisely from now on. "Miss Eskald," he said. "Since they were returning to Carolyn tomorrow," he suggested, "let's take a stroll around town." Eskald was delighted and replied, "Yes," after which Mudok put his arm around her waist and said, "Jerome, let him tell Jake to buy him a couple of swords. All his blades have become dull." Jerome replied that everything would be done by the time he returned. Scylla watched the scene and abruptly called out to them, the two of them. Jerome and Luna were stunned, and Scylla, approaching them, asked if the woman next to him was the wife of a blizzard baronet. Jerome replied, "No, he can't really reveal the details, but she is a noble woman from a noble family." Scylla recalled their relationship and wondered if they weren't married yet. After these thoughts, she turned to Luna and threatened to prepare the carriage, as she wanted to return to her palace. Luna replied that she obeyed her orders, "Your Majesty." At that moment, Scylla grew angry and clenched her fist, realizing that since becoming a swordmaster, she had never met someone stronger than her. His name was Blizzard, and if she had met such a man earlier, would she be different? Returning to the palace, she instructed her trusted men to find Baron Dayton. He had been found dead in his own basement, a note in his hand. Judging by the text, his family had been taken hostage. The bottom of the note was torn off. It likely contained the name of the person who ordered the assassination. The killer destroyed it after the massacre. Continuing her search for the person behind the assassination attempt, she found no clues or a name, but there was still one suspect. Sometime later, Scylla returned to her palace and was met by a maid who informed her that Princess Scylla had arrived. She sat at the table reading the letter. It was the first princess of Gaia who said they hadn't seen each other in a while. Her name was Rohan. Sometime later, when Scylla sat down at her table, Rohan shouted loudly, "What? Baron Dayton arranged this assassination attempt?" Scylla replied that it was indeed so. He slipped something into her wine and then started the fire. If that man hadn't saved her, she would most likely have died. Rohan jumped up from her seat and shouted, "Someone, let them bring Baron Dayton here immediately." Scylla replied that there was no need. By the time she reached him, he was already dead. Most likely, whoever tried to kill her covered their tracks. Rohan immediately approached Scylla, hugged her, and said, "She is my beloved little sister." She had been too careless, thinking that because she was a master swordsman, she would always be fine. The main thing was that she was still alive. How glad she was about that. At the moment when she said this phrase, she looked at the back of Scylla's head with a terrifying expression on her face and bright red, angry eyes. Scylla, meanwhile, wondered in her mind, was she really upset that she hadn't died? Even though all the evidence pointed to her, she refused to believe it without good reason. She recalled their younger years, when they had had fun and were close friends. Suddenly she remembered Blizzard's features and wondered how he would have acted in this situation. Suddenly she froze and screamed, "By the way, sister?" She grabbed her by the shoulders, and Rohan wondered, "What's wrong?" Scylla asked, "Wasn't she planning to go with the delegation to King Drake's birthday party?" She answered, "That's right." And Scylla asked if she could go in her place. Rohan backed away a little and asked, "So what if?" After all, she always avoided such events. Let her not say that the one who saved her is in the Drake Kingdom. Suddenly, Scylla was stunned by what she heard, and Rohan asked again, "So she wants to see him, huh?" Scylla lowered her gaze and suddenly stood up, shouting angrily, "That's not true." 3 days had passed since they returned from Tenston to Carolyn. After Justine's attack, they feared the ice flower and tamed wyverns would be discovered by the enemy. For security reasons, diplomatic meetings and receptions were moved to the palace they had previously used. Today was the day of Eskald's departure. Time had flown by too quickly, and so much had happened since then. A flood of memories flooded his mind, and as he left the room, he opened the door slightly and said, "At least today everything is calm." Suddenly, Jerome appeared behind him, clutching a multitude of objects. He shouted sharply, "My lord, Captain Scylla is about to attack. They need to immediately begin implementing the plan to strengthen the army." At that moment, Eskald approached them and said that if she confessed, she would also be worried. After all, she was the princess of the kingdom of Gaia, and worried that this could result in a diplomatic scandal. Blizzard looked ahead and realized he had seen this many times before in the Central Plains. The proud look of a true warrior, she wasn't one to blab about it. He lowered his gaze and asked Eskald not to worry about it. Victory was ultimately his, and he was sure she understood everything. But if something were to happen, she should use this item for communication. He handed her a special box, and Eskeld covered her open mouth with her hand in surprise. It was a communication stone made of mana stone. With this stone, they could transmit messages without the help of a mage. Even the distance between the Drake and the White Palace was no obstacle for this stone. Eskeld cried out, "Is this really possible?" Mudok asked her to contact him at any time. After a while, they emerged outside, and a maid announced that it was time for them to leave. "The carriage is ready." Mudok approached Eskeld and whispered in her ear that the world had not yet learned of such stones, and that she should use them secretly when no one was around. In case Justin is up to something, Jake will keep an eye on her from the air. Eskeld smiled and thought that she could immediately see that this was no simple thing. Just like that handwritten letter. His actions and words revealed his attitude toward her. She smiled and shyly thanked the baronet for the item. After these words, she climbed into the carriage and rode away from the palace. The protagonist watched and followed her with his eyes, then realized that now he was only a baronet, an unbridgeable gulf between him and the princess. Like heaven and earth, he needed to rise higher to earn the right to be near her. Perhaps it was time for them to visit that very place. Jerome wondered what he was talking about. After a while, he adjusted his glasses with his hand and wondered in horror what was happening here. They entered a room containing many destroyed people, some still conscious. Jerome screamed, "Who are these people?" Mudok replied that these were the ones who tried to kill him. Jerome asked if he was talking about the mercenaries who worked for Justine. The protagonist replied, "Yes, that's them." Jerome asked again, "Does Justine know about this?" Mudok replied, "No, he probably thinks they're all dead." He locked them up without food to see how long they could last. It had only been 10 days. Many cried out for help in trembling voices. Compared to the assassins of the Central Plains, their skills and endurance were simply insignificant. Suddenly, he noticed something amiss and took notice. Only those two guys were worth anything. He turned to Jerome and asked him and Shuart to bring them some food. Jerome replied that he understood everything, and Mudok began to think that it would take time for them to become anything. Jerome, meanwhile, informed Shuart that he should try to complete the task as quickly as possible. After some time, they fed the people, but Shuart warned them to eat slowly, otherwise they would be ill. Jerome suddenly turned to the protagonist and asked why he had left them alive. He replied that he was planning to turn them into an assassination squad. Jerome, frightened, asked again what he meant. Why would he need that? Suddenly, he realized something and asked, was he really planning to sick them on Gaia before the invasion? If not that, then the Ice Wyverns, now assassins, were he really planning such a rebellion? What was he even thinking? Mudok only smiled his sinister smile and bared his teeth. Sometime later, they returned to the room, and Jerome turned to the protagonist and asked if the Ice Wyverns and the assassin weren't too serious. The inspection had only gone smoothly thanks to the princess, and next time, they could be accused of treason. The protagonist ignored Jerome's comments and became lost in thought. He remembered how Eskeld had asked him a question with hope. Would he come to His Majesty's birthday? The protagonist declared that from the king's birthday, he would enter the central political arena. Jerome shouted, "What is he talking about?" He replied that since Eskeld was a princess, he needed to at least become a duke. To do so, he would have to face many enemies, and therefore creating an assassination squad was essential. He turned to Shuart and asked if the Blizzard Knights had assembled. He replied, "Yes, my lord," as he had ordered, and gathered them at the entrance. He is the commander of the Blizzard Knights. After a while, Mudok shouted, "Assassins, attention." He gave them two options. First, they could become his subordinates, or they could die right now. But at the moment, they were too weak for his army. Everyone in the basement turned their attention to him but said nothing. Mudok continued to say that he had prepared a training program for them, and that they should take the weapons behind him, because knights were waiting for them outside. They must kill them. 3 weeks later, many knights were surrounded in a snowy forest and fighting their opponents. One of the knights grabbed his enemy and, with the help of 2 others, destroyed him. He pointed his sword straight at the boy's face, who screamed in fear, when suddenly the knight picked up a stone and said, "One is ready. Today they can eat." The boy clutched his chest and cursed. One of the knights noticed Mudok standing at the end of the spruce tree and shouted at him to sit there. Mudok grinned, thinking that 3 weeks had already passed since the joint training of knights and assassins. The rules were simple. Participants were given emblems, and capturing or breaking an opponent's emblem was tantamount to death. Defeat occurred when one side lost all emblems. It sounds simple at first glance, but nothing teaches better than competition. The losing side would be without dinner, so they wouldn't slack off. But the knights asked, "Aren't they supposed to actually kill?" He replied that imitation would suffice. Both sides needed training, and everything had gone quite well. He stood at the summit and watched the battle unfold again. Jerome had cast a tracking spell on all the assassins, and if anyone left the designated area, a signal would flash. He noticed a red signal among the fir trees, which was on one of the guys who was trying to escape. The protagonist said, "He's done this 10 times already, Miller. He's still trying to escape from here." He clearly said that next time would be his last. Miller replied that he didn't have time to play these games, and they fought again. A moment later, he was destroyed and lying face down in the snow. Another member of the team apologized to him and asked him to be magnanimous. It was the assassin captain, Baker. The protagonist asked, "Baker, why is he so persistent in trying to escape?" Baker replied that he had said he needed to take revenge on an enemy. The protagonist asked him again, "What kind of enemy?" Baker replied that Miller was different from those who became assassins for money. When he was a child, someone killed his entire family, leaving only him alive. He received information that the culprit would be at a celebration in the capital next month. Mudok remembered Eskald and thought about the celebration in that capital. Sometime later, Miller found himself in bed and, abruptly waking up, jumped up. The protagonist reported that at King Drake's birthday party, the guard would consist of several hundred mages and knights. Does he think he can commit murder and remain undetected? Miller asked again, had the captain really told him everything? He existed solely for revenge and didn't care about his own life. He only wanted to kill the enemy. The protagonist turned around and replied that he believed him, but he couldn't even approach him, let alone take revenge. It wouldn't do any good. He'd simply die like a dog. Miller frowned and remained silent. Mudok mentioned that as an aristocrat, he could attend this celebration, and Miller asked him again where he was heading with the story. He replied that he was offering him a deal. He would help him take revenge in exchange for becoming his loyal servant. Miller was dumbfounded by this and asked again, why him? There were many assassins here who were better than him. Mudok replied that Baker had said that no one else had become a top-class assassin at 25. He also highly values his potential, though he's not quite good yet, but he'll definitely get stronger, and that's why he absolutely needs him in this squad. So, is he willing to make that deal? The protagonist extended his hand, and Miller remembered his murdered family lying in a pool of blood. He then rose from his seat and replied that if he could take revenge, he'd do anything. Mudok replied that in that case, they had a deal, and he should get ready, because they were leaving in a few days. Suddenly, Sabine entered the room, mentioning that she'd made ice cream. Miller blushed with embarrassment when he saw this girl, and the protagonist replied, of course, they should hurry before it melts. He clutched his chest, wondering how much this girl had affected him. Who was she? Sometime later, in the kingdom of Icarus, Duke Sergio shouted at his son that he was a fool, that he'd lost even with such an incredible artifact. He tried to object, when suddenly his father shouted, silence. Justin bowed his head in disappointment, and Sergio wondered if Blizzard was continuing to get on his nerves. He called his servant Roxlin, and asked if he could handle it. Roxlin replied that the Count shouldn't worry about it, as he would definitely stop Blizzard. After a while, the protagonist said that he was finishing his report, so they need to move 6,000 inhabitants of the new territories from outside the city to Carolyn, and he says they have 6 ice wyvern eggs? Max, the captain of the White Castle's guard, appeared before him. He said, that's correct, my lord. So when will the inhabitants be moved? The protagonist slumped in his chair, put his feet up on the table, and said in a relaxed tone that they would deal with Jerome a little later. There was something more important. Jerome asked again, what did he mean? He replied that he didn't know what to give Tomilov III for his birthday. Everyone around him stood dumbfounded, and the protagonist wondered why they were all reacting so strangely. His gift had to be better than Count Icarus's, at the very least, right? If they had any good suggestions, they should tell him about them. Max asked again, how about Ice Ogre leather? It was popular among merchants and winter was coming. His Majesty would be delighted to receive it. The protagonist wondered if that was too simple. Did they have any other ideas? One of his subordinates raised his hand and asked what about flowers? The protagonist was dumbfounded and angrily asked if he was joking. The man replied that he meant unusual flowers, and ice flowers only bloom during the Carlin, so they were truly special. Jerome adjusted his glasses and remarked that these flowers only grow in extreme cold and would hardly be able to be cultivated in the capital. Schwart also joined the conversation and said, in that case, they have no choice but to give this. Everyone was surprised and asked, this? He replied, this, when suddenly a subordinate burst into their office and shouted, my lord, he can't take it anymore. It was Jake, shouting that he couldn't take it anymore. Those idiots have blocked all the roads. Mudok grew sad and said boredly, what are you talking about, Jake? He should explain everything in more detail. He's talking about the head of the city of Tot, Roxlin. Until now, they've been paying unfair tolls and usage fees, but now he's completely blocked their road. The protagonist asked if they couldn't go around or fly in on ice wyverns. He replied that they have carrying capacity limits, so they need to go by land. Jerome explained that to get from Carlin to the capital, they would need to cross the city of Tot. Since they don't know they have ice wyverns, they must have blocked their routes to Earth. Blocking routes just before a celebration reserved for the aristocracy means their goal is likely to prevent them from visiting this city. The protagonist surmised that he must be hiding something. But why is he trying to block him? He thinks Viscount Roxlin has increased his power with the help of Count Icarus. Justin recently returned and Count Icarus most likely had something to do with it. They simply have no choice. If they provoke them first, they must respond. Jerome asked, of course, but he's not thinking about a territorial war, is he? Mudok asked, a territorial war? It's literally a war between territory owners. As long as they don't violate royal laws, even the king can't interfere. However, to start a territorial war, they must inform the king. They must also officially declare war on the enemy. The only way to avoid officially declaring war would be if they completed it before word reached the king. In that case, they would report it only after forcing the enemy to surrender. Mudok thought it was perfect timing, the perfect chance to test what they had been preparing. He shouted at Shuart to leave only a minimum force in the territory and prepare to depart. He shouted back that he understood the order and was getting down to business. After that, the protagonist ordered the assassin squad to remain on standby for now, and to first send Miller alone on reconnaissance in the city of Tot. Max replied that he understood, after which, the protagonist pointed his finger towards Jake and told him to prepare a squad of wyverns for dispatch. He shouted, "What? But their squad only has 20 men. Isn't that too few to be involved in a territorial war?" The protagonist asked again, "Too few? And he really is the commander of the Wyvern Knights? Even so close to the Wyverns, he still doesn't trust their power?" Jake was stunned by what he heard and couldn't respond. He realized he was right. After all, he was one too. But his wyverns weren't weak. They would show their enemies the power of the wyverns. After the speech, the protagonist turned to Jerome and said that for the tyranny against the inhabitants of Carolyn and the blocked routes, he must declare war. Jerome replied that he refused, and Mudok repeated that he had said so, when he suddenly turned around and asked what he had just said. Jerome replied that it was a bet with an uncertain outcome, and risking the lives of their people was too reckless. Viscount Roxland still held 6,000 undelivered citizens as hostages. If they attacked first, they could be in danger. Moreover, the forces of the city of Tot outnumbered theirs tenfold. If Tot received support from Count Icarus, they would be in an even worse position. Mudok replied that they needed 2 days before they could respond. They would have already ended the war in those 2 days. Jerome was dumbfounded by this, his mouth hanging open in surprise, and then began shouting, "How could they do this in 2 days? That was simply impossible." The protagonist passed him and informed him that he was the strategist, so he shouldn't show any doubts in front of the troops. Jerome turned away from him and thought, yes, since it was him, he could exceed his expectations and perform another miracle. The protagonist left the room and announced that they must prepare Lilith for him. After these words, he turned to the soldiers when he stepped outside and declared that this was a declaration of war on Carolyn. Sometime later, all the prisoners were being led out of the palace with their hands bandaged, and one of the men asked what they were accusing him of. The knight held his sword to his throat and announced that they would arrest everyone from Carolyn. This was the Viscount's order. The subordinate reported that they had detained all the inhabitants of Carolyn, as ordered. The Viscount asked again if there was anything unusual. The knight replied that the merchants who had previously gathered at the palace gates no longer appeared. He replied that these fools had finally realized they wouldn't open the gates. Without food supplies from outside, Carolyn, bound by ice, couldn't hold out for long. The mountainous terrain prevented access to the capital without passing through Tuds. The inhabitants of Carolyn were likely starving, and soon there would be a gathering of nobles, to which everyone was obliged to attend. If he didn't show up for the king's birthday celebration, Blizzard would lose his title, and then he would seize Carolyn. It was his perfect plan. Roxland decided to go against Duke Icarus, whose power exceeded that of the king. It was tantamount to treason, and if he pulled it off correctly, he would become a marquess. That was his goal. After a while, he turned toward the window and wondered if there had been a shadow there, or had he imagined it? His subordinate also gaped in shock, looking toward the window where they saw a huge moving body. It was Lilith, who had smashed the window, sending shards flying all over the Viscount's room. The Viscount became enraged and wondered if it was a wyvern. They were only found beyond the Lazar Ridge, so where did they come from? Suddenly, Mudok appeared and asked if he was Roxland. Roxland asked again who he was. Sweat poured down his face from fear, and he shouted for him to state his name immediately. The protagonist said, "He is the Lord of Carolyn." Roxland was stunned by what he heard, and realized that the person standing before him was Baronet Blizzard. At that moment, Mudok reached into his inner pocket and used his magical powers to cut off Roxland's ear. He dropped the letter, which stuck into the tiles on his floor, and declared that it was a declaration of war. He would return in an hour. Roxland didn't respond and looked at him in fear, when suddenly several knights appeared in the room and asked if he was safe. Roxland looked toward the vanished enemy and at the broken window. The protagonist, along with Lilith, headed away from the city. One of the knights was stunned and screamed, "It's a wyvern! What's it doing here?" Roxland lowered his gaze and turned to his subordinate, then angrily punched him in the face. The knight fell to the ground and, rising slightly, blood trickling from his mouth, asked, "What's going on?" He kicked him in the stomach again and shouted that they were useless scum. All they knew how to do was collect their pay. Where were they when he was attacked? He was furious and turned to the other knights to burn it, tell them to dress the captured Tods in military uniforms and give them weapons. His subordinate asked, "He meant combat gear?" Roxland confidently answered, "Yes," then said with a furious expression that he wanted to see Blizzard's face when he realized he had killed his own people with his own hands. His subordinate was dumbfounded with fear, and there was an awkward silence in the room for a while. Then Roxland grabbed the letter and shredded it into tiny pieces, shouting that he must frame him. How dare he start a war with him? Tell everyone to inform the Todd's Knights that from this moment on, he declares war on the Carolyns. The one who distinguishes himself most will receive a generous reward. The knights rejoiced at this opportunity and shouted with delight. Meanwhile, behind the protagonist, his subordinate, Miller, asked, "Did he hear that?" He clasped the magic stone in his hands and said, "Yes, it was all clear and distinct." After some time, fighters appeared at every turn around the city. Many people trembled with fear and terror. A girl and a child trembled with fear, and Roxland, with a fierce expression, mentally expected Blizzard to give the order to kill his people and experience despair. Suddenly, several wyverns arrived on the kingdom's territory. The protagonist, standing on his Lilith, looked confidently ahead and shouted for them to attack. A moment later, the wyverns began to fight, and many defenseless people in the city wondered what was happening. Roxlin too was frozen with horror and asked, "What is this?" A multitude of birds appeared in the sky, approaching their palace. He shouted, "Could that be a squad of wyverns?" They began to attack their palace, easily attacking the entire city and the surrounding knights. All the buildings began to crumble, and stones flew everywhere. The girl shielded her child with her body and also screamed in fear, tears in her eyes, when suddenly silence fell between them. She turned and saw Jerome himself protecting them, forming a magic circle. He shouted, "Blizzard Knights, soldiers in the fortress, residents of Caroline, first platoon, they must evacuate the residents to safety. The rest must quickly penetrate the ruined wall. They must show the army of this city the power of the Carolines." After the order was given, the subordinates and knights began to fight their enemies. Roxlin was dumbfounded by what he saw and heard, and wondered how he knew the soldiers outside the fortress gates were prisoners. And when did Caroline even become so strong? The wyverns were literally devouring people and knights. The protagonist was already in the center of the city. He landed and looked confidently ahead at the knights. They wondered where this monster had come from. Was it their imagination, or was he alone here? They decided to attack him all at once and rushed into battle, when suddenly Mudok used his magical powers and, with a flick of his fingers, destroyed his opponents. He brushed away the smoke and walked toward the fortress. That was all that remained. He looked into the distance into the forest at the frightened and trembling knight. Roxlin screamed, "What are they doing? They should fight now." Across from him, only a few trembling knights remained, terrified. He screamed, "Can they really call themselves knights after this?" He sent a man to the Duke of Irucus asking for reinforcements. If only they could hold out until they arrived, then his victory would be assured. One of the knights grew angry and turned around, elbowing Roxlin, who fell to the ground and began screaming in pain. The knight yelled at him, "If he wants to die, then let him die himself, you pig." Roxlin turned around and screamed in fear. What did they just say? He suddenly saw the wyvern's eye right in front of him, and then protagonist appeared. Mudok remarked that Lilith shouldn't eat that garbage, as it would give her indigestion. He approached Roxlin, who addressed him by name. He frowned and immediately fell to his knees, declaring that he had been wrong and was admitting defeat. He couldn't disobey the Duke of Icarus's order. Please, let him spare him. He was begging for mercy when they suddenly reported that they had captured a soldier heading for the Duke of Irakis's domain. Roxlin was dumbfounded by what he heard and realized the situation he was in. The protagonist spoke. It must have been difficult for him to lie, knowing he himself didn't believe it. For daring to oppress his people, he would atone for his guilt with his life. With these words, Mudok used his magical powers to destroy the enemy and directed a bright beam of light in his direction. Jake was dumbfounded, wondering if he had really repelled the Lord's attack. Mudok turned and asked what he was doing. It turned out to be Jerome, standing nearby, using a magic ball. Jerome addressed him by name and informed him that no matter how terrible a crime a noble might commit, the right to decide whether he deserves to live or die belonged solely to the king. The protagonist frowned and continued listening to Jerome, who declared that if he killed the Viscount now, their situation would become extremely difficult. Roxlin shouted that he was absolutely right, that he was completely ignorant. The protagonist realized it was time for him to appear, and yet he did. It was Wolmer, Roxlin's servant. At that moment, Roxlin rejoiced and shouted that he was an incredible fool. Did he really think he'd sent a messenger only to Duke Icarus? Territorial wars should be reported to His Majesty and conducted under the supervision of a representative of the royal family. But he hadn't reported it to the kingdom, so he sent his Wolmer. It seemed he wanted to secure the king's surrender before the king learned of it. His plans will be ruined by his own arrogance. He laughed, and Jerome was dumbfounded, realizing that this simply couldn't be true. There were bound to be soldiers on the road to the capital. How had he managed to get past them? The protagonist frowned, but suddenly a smile appeared on his face, and Roxlin wondered, what? Had he completely lost his mind? The protagonist said that now he could reveal his true face. At that moment, Volmer began to peel off his skin, causing everyone around him to be stunned by the horror they felt. It turned out that Miller was hiding behind Volmer's mask. Roxlin wondered, but how did this happen? Since when had this happened? Miller punched his chest and declared that he had fulfilled his task. At that moment, Mudok informed him that the Code of Laws on Territorial Warfare contained a clause that permitted an attack without prior notice on anyone who had violated royal law. Roxlin was stunned by this, and the protagonist continued to report that he had sold the inhabitants of Curlin into slavery. Slave trading is prohibited in the Kingdom of Drake. After these words, he used his magical powers, and Roxlin realized he'd gone to great lengths to claim this position. If he lost his title lands now, his life would be lost, and Duke Icarus would simply kill him. Fear appeared in his eyes, and he turned and ran toward the forest, screaming that he didn't want to die. But when he looked back, he saw Mudok appear above him, glowing with a bright magical light. His leg was trapped in an ice block, unable to escape, and he screamed, "My leg!" The protagonist clenched his fist and urged him to grit his teeth, when suddenly Roxlin froze in fear, and a moment later, fell from a powerful blow to the eye and flew far away. Much blood was spilled from the blow, and he collapsed on the ground nearby. Mudok looked closely at his immobilized body, as did all his subordinates, and turning around, he declared that it was Karalun who had won this war. He smiled, and everyone around him rejoiced at this outcome. After a moment, everything quieted down. Things proceeded quite smoothly. Roxlin, having lost everything he owned, was exiled from his lands, and a few days later, he went missing. Tot was annexed to the Carolines, and he intended to entrust the management of the new administrative district to Jerome, but he replied that he absolutely did not want to do it. He had enough work without it, and if he included this in his duties, he would organize a strike. Mudok asked again, but if not Jerome, then who should he appoint for this post? He thought for a moment and suddenly realized he had the perfect candidate. Thus, on Jerome's advice, Roxlin's former vassal, Volmer, was appointed head of the Todds. Meanwhile, Volmer was behind bars, and the protagonist, of course, could not fully trust him, so he introduced 2 knights who would send him a report every day. And that moment had arrived. The birthday of Tomilov III. The kingdom of Drake looked quite festive. The weather was beautiful outside, and one of the knights standing at the entrance said he wanted to join in the festivities. A second knight standing nearby replied that he should be patient, as their additional payment for their work would be coming soon. Suddenly, he noticed a shadow appearing above him and wondered where it was coming from. A multitude of wyverns arrived, and the knights cried out, "Is that really them?" A monster invasion was underway, and they should hurry to raise the alarm in the city. Mudok, who had arrived in the city, announced that they should stop. He dismounted from his wyvern and announced that he was Baronet Blizzard of Carolyn. The knights asked in surprise, "He's a baronet? So he's the magical guy who saved his majesty? Were these wyverns tamed?" The protagonist pulled an invitation letter from his pocket and announced that he had arrived to visit his majesty. After some time, the palace was in a stunningly festive mood. Everything sparkled with gold and wealth. Many people in beautiful attire had gathered for the celebration. One of the representatives announced that Baron Blizzard was entering. The doors opened and Mudok entered the room and looked around. Those around him stared at him, commenting on what an incredible man he was. They said he saved his majesty, right? Someone had heard he could use magic higher than the 5th circle. At that moment, Scylla noticed his presence and asked, "So he's come?" The protagonist turned to her and she replied that she was glad to see him again. How was he doing? He replied that he was managing well, and an awkward silence ensued. Then she asked, shouldn't he ask how she was doing? He handed her a glass of drink and told her to back it up. His assistant said that at parties, girls always drink first. She looked closely at the liquid in the glass and, after an awkward silence, drank it, thanking him. Afterwards, one of the event's hosts announced that Her Highness Princess Daphrine of the Kingdom of Hyzen and Count Inos had arrived. Those around began to comment on Princess Daphrine's unchanged beauty. Was this the same Count Anos whom Liard II had matched with the princess? They were quite compatible. The protagonist wondered if Anos was the one mentioned in Edmund's letter, the great swordsman. Scylla wondered if they knew each other. The protagonist said nothing and mused that for some reason he felt out of place and replied that he didn't know him. Scylla remarked that now that he mentioned it, the woman he was with that time wasn't here. He asked again, was she curious about her? Scylla replied, no, she was just asking because she didn't know many people here. He asked her to wait a bit, as she always made dramatic entrances. The servant announced that the main star of the event had arrived, His Majesty, King of the Tomals III of their kingdom, Drake. At that moment, the gates opened and the king entered with his daughters, among whom was Eskald. Scylla, upon seeing her, was dumbfounded with horror. Could this woman really be the princess of the kingdom of Drake? Was this the dramatic entrance he was talking about? At that moment, Eskald lifted her dress to sit down on a chair near the throne, when she was suddenly dumbfounded by what she saw. She saw Mudok among the crowd, standing with Scylla. She was furious and wondered what she was doing here. She had heard that the first princess, Kai, would be arriving. She also didn't like the fact that she was standing next to the Baron. The people around him began to congratulate the king on his birthday. The king thanked them for coming to celebrate his birthday. He hoped they would all have a wonderful time and raised his glass. Eskald turned to him and asked what gifts he would receive this year. She was already very excited. Tomalov grinned and said, yes, he suggests starting with that. He was informed that a gift from Duke Icarus, His Majesty, would now be presented. Sergio approached with a box in his hands, and opening it, revealed a ring. This ring would protect him from now on. It could neutralize all offensive magic below Circle 4. The king realized it was an artifact. The protagonist heard about this and wondered, an artifact? Scylla noted that this meant an object imbued with magic. Since magic above Circle 9 does not exist in their time, these are priceless relics. If this is an artifact imbued with high-level nullification magic, then it's simply invaluable. The king thanked him for such a rare gift, and the duke replied that he congratulated him again on his birthday, His Majesty. Everything was as expected of Duke Sergio. He had brought something truly incredible. Could there be a gift that could surpass this one? As he pondered this question, he realized that none of the subsequent gifts could outshine the Duke's. At the last moment, Mudok appeared on stage, bowed, and the host announced that Baron Blizzard's final gift would now be presented. It was a large box, and Mudok asked, have you been well, Your Majesty? The king replied, Baron Blizzard, I'm glad to see him in good health. He replied that it was all thanks to his grace and revealed that the gift he had prepared was the skin of an ice ogre he had personally hunted. The king took it in his hands and asked again, is it the skin of an ice ogre? If so, Then was he talking about those ferocious ogres from the northern lands? Mudok replied that it was indeed so, and said it wasn't much, but please accept his sincerity. The king replied, "Thank you." He would make winter clothing from the skin to wear during the cold season. Those around him wondered if it wasn't strange to bring something like this as a gift. How pathetic and inappropriate for a man of low birth. Mudok rose to his feet and said that, in fact, one skin didn't seem enough, so he brought another gift. Everyone was suddenly surprised, and the king was dumbfounded when he saw the unknown items in the box. He asked, "What are they?" Mudok replied with a smile, "They're monster eggs." The king was dumbfounded and asked again, "Monster eggs?" The people around him also began to wonder, why would he give something like that? Sergio shouted that this was extremely disrespectful. "Your Majesty, this was an assassination attempt on the royal family. Guards, what are they doing there? Why are they standing there? Let them throw the Baron out of here." The protagonist stood there without a trace of confusion, and the king suddenly shouted for everyone to stop. A deathly silence fell over the hall, and the king asked if he could inquire about his intentions. Baron Blizzard. He replied that they were ice wyvern eggs, and smiled. The king and Sergio were dumbfounded with horror, and asked again what he had just said. Could it really be true? That ice wyverns were a species of wyvern unique to Caroline, 1.5 times larger than normal wyverns. Attempts had been made to breed and tame them since ancient times, but their ferocious nature and the difficulty of obtaining eggs made this practically impossible. Taming a normal wyvern confers immense power. The story of how the once small kingdom of Zeb, with the help of its wyvern army, conquered neighboring states and transformed them into a vast empire, was a sensational event. Taming ice wyverns would greatly increase the combat power of the Drake Kingdom. He thanked him and asked if he knew that finding eggs wasn't as difficult as raising animals from them. The protagonist calmly replied that it was indeed so. Raising baby ice wyverns is no easy task, but there's a catch. He called Lilith over, and instantly an ice wyvern flew to the window. MC remarked that he tamed this wyvern when it was still a hatchling. He'd pass on the training methods to the royal trainer. If, when the wyvern hatches, they let it remember the king's face well, it will recognize him as its parent and follow him. 2 of these eggs are destined for beautiful princesses. The ice wyverns will become formidable guardians of the royal family. Tomilov was surprised to note that he'd taken care not only of him, but also of his daughters. He's a truly thoughtful man. Now the Drake Kingdom is just one step away from becoming as powerful as Zeb's empire. This is the best gift he's ever received. He thanks him from the bottom of his heart. The protagonist said that if he's happy, then he's content. Escald smiled, thinking about the message he'd sent a few days ago asking him to wait. So that's what it meant. Sergio nervously wondered how he'd even gotten the wyvern eggs, but he prepared something for him. He called out to the king and said he had something important to tell him. Did he know that 2 days ago, Baron Blizzard had sent armed forces to Viscount Roxland's domain? Confused, Tomilov asked why Caroline would attack Todd's. Sergio replied that he'd started a territorial war. A war started without a report is punishable. For the impudent man who started a war without authorization, he demands severe punishment. The king said that if this were true, the situation would become much more complicated. Escald worried, wondering what to do. This could ruin public opinion of the baronet. The protagonist called out to Tomilov and asked if slave trading was legal in the Kingdom of Drake. He replied that no, it was forbidden. The protagonist pulled out a document and noted that it confirmed Roxland's organization of the slave trade. He had captured its inhabitants and sold them into slavery. His people were traded, and what lord wouldn't be angry? Sergio furiously thought that Roxland was a greedy pig. He had secretly been engaged in the slave trade? Escald noted that war could be declared against anyone who violated the kingdom's laws without a report. Or was he wrong? Tomilov said that this was a compelling reason, so he would make an exception and waive punishment. He also declared that Todd's was now annexed to the land of Caroline. The princess asked if, since the Blizzard Baronet's territory had increased, he should be granted a new title. The king agreed and motioned for him to approach him. The protagonist approached the throne and knelt. Tomilov declared that from that moment on, he named him Viscount. Sergio, watching this, furiously thought that he would do anything to destroy him. After this, the protagonist went out onto the balcony to get some fresh air and reflected on how, because of the crowd of aristocrats, he hadn't even been able to talk to Escald. But he was finally here. Just a little more and she would be with him. Suddenly, Inos came out onto the balcony. MC looked at him and thought that this was the Count from the Kingdom of Hyzen. He furiously noted that he had finally found Mudok. The protagonist, in shock, realized that he knew the language of the Central Plains. Inos closed the door and noted that he was his master's enemy. He had been searching for him for a long time. He grabbed the sword and magical energy formed around it. The protagonist thought it was the scent of plum blossoms. He remembered Zhang Punjin saying that if his student had been here, everything would have turned out differently. MC nervously wondered if this was the student he'd spoken of before his death. They dubbed him the best young talent in the Central Plains. Li Jinshan. A fierce battle ensued. Inos charged his fist with his magic and delivered a powerful blow that sent the protagonist flying. Immediately after, the boy tried to finish him off, but Li Jinshan suddenly lunged and ended up behind him. The protagonist remarked that the rumor about him being the best young talent in the Central Plains was true. Inos replied, "Don't put on airs." He'd been searching for him for 3 years. Rumors led him to his ship. Hiding there, he waited for an opportunity to kill him, but suddenly a powerful storm blew in. A light descended, and Li Jinchang came to his senses here. He hadn't forgotten his revenge for a single day. Finally, he would take his head. Now he could unleash the full fury of the volcano. The boy gripped his sword tightly and prepared for a powerful attack. MC thought nervously that this technique was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Perhaps even he would have a hard time deflecting it. Suddenly, Scylla came out to them and said with a smile that she'd been looking for him. What were they both doing here? He replied with a smile that it was the first time in a while he'd met a fellow countryman, and they'd chatted a bit. Ainos, with a serious expression, wondered, was this girl the second princess of the Gaia kingdom? Was she close to Mudok? Killing him in front of the princess would cause him problems. He was annoyed, but this time it was best to retreat. The guy apologized and added that he'd leave first, letting them converse calmly. Scylla replied that it was nice meeting him. After that, he entered, walked to the door, and, using the thought transmission skill, said that he'd deprived him of everything he held dear, and he too would destroy everything he cherished. Property, loved ones, everything, indiscriminately. First, the one he looked at with a gaze full of love, the princess of the Drake Kingdom. The protagonist exclaimed furiously, "Don't dare touch her. She has nothing to do with them." Ainos replied that it depended on his behavior, so he should behave well. Scylla noted with a smile that she thought this was a serious conversation. What happened between them? The MC, with a serious face, went into the building and replied that he was leaving. He had urgent business. Suddenly, she grabbed his clothes. He turned around in confusion and asked if she wanted to say something else. The girl excitedly replied that it wasn't that important, but how rude of him to leave when she found him herself. He should learn some etiquette. The protagonist asked with a serious face, "So, the princess has nothing better to do?" Distinguished guests from every country had arrived to celebrate His Majesty's birthday. Since he was a representative of Gaia, shouldn't she communicate with them? Why did she always bother him? The girl, horrified, wondered if she was bothering them. Were the other men trying to get her to say a word? Why was this man different? She replied, upset not to let him be mistaken. She simply wanted to congratulate him on becoming a viscount, and that was that. The protagonist calmed down and, apologizing, noted that his words had been unnecessary. He truly needed to leave on urgent business, and he thanked her for the congratulations. After that, he entered the main hall. Scylla approached the glass door, and seeing him standing next to Ehild, wondered if he had met her first. Would he have liked her? Well, now was not the time to think about that. She needed to take care of her life first. The girl approached the balcony railing and thought that the most important thing now was to escape her sister, who was about to kill her. She would return to the kingdom and do everything she could. Suddenly, she noticed Princess Daphne and Jerome sitting together and wondered who that man was next to her. She had seen that face somewhere. She remembered. Was it Blizzard's assistant, Jerome? What were they doing here together? A little earlier, Daphne remembered how her brother had indicated that she would be going to the kingdom of Drake as an ambassador, along with Count Ainos. She thought that if not for her brother's orders, she would not be here. The girl muttered under her breath that she wanted to run away quickly. Suddenly, at that very moment, Jerome uttered exactly the same phrase. Daphne exclaimed in fear. "Who is here?" He apologized and said that he didn't think anyone would be here at this hour. The girl replied that he didn't need to apologize. She was just a little scared. The guy introduced himself and added that he was Viscount Blizzard's assistant. Daphne also introduced herself and said that she was pleased to meet him. Jerome was horrified, wondering if this was Princess Heian, renowned throughout the continent for her irresistible beauty. He knelt down and, fearfully apologizing, said he didn't recognize her. Daphne replied that everything was fine. She didn't care about such things. The boy replied that he would go then. He looked at her and thought he saw something sad in her face. Jerome asked if he could sit here too. He was waiting for the Lord to return from the celebration, if his presence wouldn't inconvenience her. The girl, finding him very attractive, became very shy and replied that he could do what he wanted. After that, they began to talk about pressing matters. Jerome complained to her that Blizzard was getting into trouble, and he was the one cleaning it up. He really wanted to run away from him. Did she understand? Daphne noted with a smile that it seemed he had a lot of unspoken things to say to the Lord. He became shy and pointed out that he was the only one talking. She replied with a smile that everything was fine. She was interested. The guy asked why she said she wanted to run away. The princess, upset, replied that her brother was forcing her into an arranged marriage. She didn't want to dedicate her entire life to developing the country. This was probably too difficult a conversation, right? They were chatting so casually that she didn't even notice. Jerome replied that everything was fine. He wondered if he, a simple servant, could do anything to help the princess. If he could do anything, then he would use his mana to help her. Daphne became very embarrassed and wondered why her heart was beating so fast. She couldn't look him straight in the eyes. She thanked him, pulled away a little, and mused that he must be a mage since he was using mana. Suddenly, Ainos approached them with his guards. He remarked that he had finally found her. But who was this man? Jerome replied that he was just a mage passing by. He nervously wondered if this was the great swordsman. The boy bowed and said that since her guards had arrived, he would allow himself to leave. The count glared at him and asked if she knew His Majesty was planning a grand ceremony once the celebration was over. So let her begin by opening her heart to him. The girl nervously considered that her brother hadn't even consulted her. She said she would go first. Jerome, hearing this, wondered if she had a political marriage with Ainos. Daphne looked at him and, using telepathy, smiled and said that they would meet again in 3 days at this hour. After this, the girl girl and her guards left. Meanwhile, in the castle, Eskald was musing that small talk was tiring her. The protagonist approached her and, extending his hand, asked if she would dance with him. She smiled and readily agreed. Tomalov, watching them, called out to Cotton and asked if the two were close enough, or if he only thought so. He replied that he thought so too. The king looked at the girl and noticed he hadn't seen her smile so broadly in a long time. Can he answer him honestly? Does he think Eskald cares about Blizzard? Cotton replied that the Viscount was said to be doing well, but did he think that was possible? Until recently, he had been a commoner. Even for a Viscount, considering a relationship with a princess was unthinkable. No matter how outstanding his fighting skills, everything had its limits. It would be difficult to understand the complex relationships and interests of the aristocracy. He shouldn't harbor false hopes. After some time, the protagonist flew to Edmund on a wyvern and asked how he was doing. It seemed he now had something to live for. He grinned and replied that he had more than just that. Thanks to him, he was now the best merchant in the kingdom. Every day he felt a surge of strength. Why were they standing here? Let him come inside. After that, they entered his study and poured tea. Edmund noted that he had become a viscount by winning the territorial war. So much had happened in such a short time. The protagonist replied that he had come to ask him for something. He needed to find a mansion. It had to surpass even the Icarus mansion in its luxury and splendor. Edmund smiled and said that he understood. It would be ready soon. He thought that he had finally begun. They would answer to the Akasa trading house and Duke Icarus, who had destroyed their royal trading house. This man could definitely defeat him and rise even higher. All he could do was provide him with funds so that there would be no shortage of funds. Suddenly, Edmund began to doubt and wondered why he was alone. Where was his servant? He was a viscount now, after all. The protagonist replied that he was carrying out his special assignment. He must find out who was behind the murder of the Miller family. Meanwhile, Jerome himself hid in the cafe and wondered, was he a slave? He entrusted him with everything. Is Princess Daphne okay now? Why does she want to meet in 3 days? At that moment, Leon, the head of the Information Guild, approached him, remarking that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Jerome shook his hand and replied with a smile that he had too handsome a face to die. He chuckled and said that even if he died and was resurrected, his prince complex would still be there. So, what information did he come for? The guy put a bag of treasure on the table. Leon remarked that it was a bit much for surveillance. Was the target a big shot? He replied that he was simply fulfilling a request, so he himself did not know everything. The target's name was Miller Kramer. Leon, horrified, said that now he understood why the amount was so large. He wanted to kill him. Jerome, perplexed, asked what that meant. He wanted to know if he knew that everyone who investigated the Kramer family murder was dead. He hadn't heard anything about it. They would pretend their conversation never happened. Jerome slammed the table and said he'd pay double if he got the information. Leon paused and remarked that it had been over 10 years. Maybe everything was fine now. They'd see what they could do. Jerome sat down and wondered what had happened to the Kramer family. Even Leon, the head of the Information Guild, was afraid. Was someone truly dangerous involved? After some time, he met with the protagonist and explained that the Kramers had held the title of Count. Miller was the second son, and their family was famous and influential in the kingdom. 10 years ago, the entire family was poisoned, and only Miller was lucky enough to survive. The protagonist asked if they'd managed to find the killer. Jerome agreed, and added that it was a certain Baron Gideon. Edmund suddenly noted that the Baron probably wasn't the main culprit. He was just a puppet in his hands. There was a real culprit who had ordered their poisoning. Sometime later, when it was already dark, Miller was thinking that today he would kill Baron Gideon and complete his revenge. Suddenly, the others came to him. Confused, he asked why his lord had come at such a time. Edmund introduced himself and remarked that he remembered him as a child. He had grown very much. Count Kramer supported them. Let him tell what really happened that day. It was true that Baron Gideon poisoned them, but the one who ordered it was Duke Icarus. Miller, perplexed, said that this could not be. What benefit did he have in Kramer's disappearance? Edmund replied that the largest trading association in the kingdom was Akasa. The actual owner was Duke Icarus. To raise Akasa, Icarus needed to eliminate the most successful association at the time, Roll, and the Kramer family. Miller, horrified, asked, "Does this mean he worked for the man who killed his family?" He laughed hysterically and started walking toward the exit. The protagonist asked where he was going. The guy, with a serious face, replied that he would kill Icarus. He noted that with his skills alone, he couldn't kill him, as he was a master swordsman. Miller furiously shouted that he didn't care. MC asked, "He understands that his actions are foolish, right?" He assumed his battle form and exclaimed, "What do you think he should do? Is he going to stop him?" The protagonist conjured an ice sword and replied that if he really wanted to leave, he should defeat him first. Miller armed himself and said that if that was the case, then that's what he would do. He quickly dashed forward and began to continuously attack him with magic projectiles, when suddenly the protagonist appeared behind him with lightning speed, and he mused that the attack aimed at vital points and the economy of his movements showed how diligently he had trained all this time. Miller, noticing him, tried to kick him, but he quickly dodged and instantly struck him directly in the vital point. The pain caused the guy to collapse on the floor. MC noted that he had touched a vital point, so he wouldn't be able to move for half a day. Suddenly, Miller began to stir and tried to get up. He noted in confusion that he hadn't shown him where these points were. How did he do that? The guy asked. Didn't he just show him? The protagonist wondered, surprised, that he had copied something he had only seen for a moment. Miller tried to stand up completely, but ultimately fell to the floor and lost consciousness. He called out to Edmund and noted that he had lost consciousness, so he should carry him to his room. And when he came to his senses, he should find him. The merchant asked if he was going to punish him. MC replied that no, starting tomorrow, he would personally teach him how to hit vital points. As expected, his eyes were right. Miller is a diamond in the rough with exceptional talent. With proper training, he could become a first-class assassin. Of course, it will be a long road. Suddenly, the crystal on his belt glowed. The protagonist took it in his hand and asked, "What happened?" Eskold contacted him, asking for help and adding that it was very cold here. He screamed in horror. "Where is she now?" Not hearing an answer, the protagonist quickly set off on his way and asked her to wait a little. Where could she be? Although it was only slightly cool now, Eskold had said she was cold. If so, he needed to find the coldest spot nearby. Chances were high that she was there. He scanned the area with his eyes and, looking at the house, wondered what he'd found. MC then quickly ran there and, seeing the girl, asked if she'd accidentally locked herself in. She replied that she'd come to check on the ice wyvern eggs he'd given her, but hadn't been able to get out. He pointed out that he'd also said that the barn where the eggs were kept had a temperature-lowering spell cast on it. Why had she acted so rashly? Eskold apologized with a smile and asked, "He came thanks to the communication stone, right?" The protagonist hugged her sharply and said he never wanted to lose her again. She blushed and hugged him back. Suddenly, a strange sound was heard from the barn. They looked in that direction and saw a baby wyvern hatch from one of the eggs. The MC smiled and asked if she could please clean the slime off the ice wyvern's body. Then he would consider her his mother. The girl smiled and wiped the wyvern, noting how soft and fluffy it was. Did he remember her now? He replied that she should at least introduce herself. Eskold greeted the wyvern and said it was nice to meet her. In response, the beast smiled and squeaked happily. The protagonist said he thought the hatchling was female. She asked if he could tell by its appearance. He noted that ice wyverns, like chickens, are identified by their cloaca. He thought she was born healthy, so let her raise her well. Eskold thanked him admiringly and replied that she would raise her beautiful and healthy. Sometime later, after the king's birthday, a formal title conferring ceremony was held. Thus, Mudok officially received the title of Viscount, and a Grand State Council was immediately announced. This is a meeting open to all the kingdom's aristocrats. Typically, at this event, members of the small state council are elected, and the affairs of the aristocrats are considered separately. When the day arrived, Tomilov announced that the first item on the agenda for the current Grand State Council was the election of members of the small state council. If they had anyone in mind, they should raise their hand and name one. Arista raised his hand and said he recommended Duke Icarus. Another baron also raised his hand and said he recommended Count Slave. MC, watching this, thought it was harsh. It was clear without words who was in Icarus's retinue and who was loyal to the king. Now that he had become a Viscount, there was no one who could recommend him. Suddenly, Sergio raised his hand and said that he recommended Viscount Blizzard. He had demonstrated his abilities well. He believed he was qualified to become a member of the small state council. Or did anyone object? The other barons began to support him in surprise. Eskold wondered in disbelief that he had first sent the Viscount to the northern lands, and now he was recommending him for membership in the council. What was he planning? Sergio, with a sly smile, said it was a unanimous decision. He congratulated him on joining the royal circle. He reflected that the small state council met weekly, so once a member, he wouldn't be able to travel far abroad. And here he had a multitude of people serving as his eyes and ears. Now he had no need to expand his sphere of influence. Let him try his best, while the web tightens around his neck. Sometime later, Eskold, sitting in her room, reflected on how after the meeting she had signaled him to come to her room, but he hadn't come. She exclaimed in fear, wondering if he hadn't understood. The protagonist appeared on the windowsill with lightning speed and replied that it was possible. So what did she want to talk about? The girl asked why Duke Icarus had recommended him to the council. He replied that he didn't know. Did she have any theories? Eskild said absolutely not. But it was hard to believe he would do it without a reason. This was the man who openly sent assassins after her father and sent him far north. Clearly, he was plotting something behind their backs. But once he became a council member, they would be able to see each other more often, right? For that, they should thank Icarus. He was the one who would stop at nothing to achieve what he wanted. What would happen if he wasn't careful? MC replied that he would handle it, as always. She shouldn't worry so much. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door. Eskold worriedly told him to hide somewhere. She turned around, but the protagonist had already left the room. 10 days ago, Jerome met with Daphrin and asked if he had heard correctly. She wanted to escape, but where? She replied, anywhere. Could he take her somewhere where she wasn't known? The guy replied that he was a servant of Lord Carlin, and if it turned out that he helped her escape, a war could break out between the countries. Daphrin asked, did that mean his promise was a lie? He promised to use his mana and help her. Didn't he remember that? This was the first time in her life. She traveled beyond the borders of the Heisel kingdom and spoke with people from abroad. After her father's death, Her brother locked her in her room and allowed her out only for special occasions. No matter how beautiful her clothes or delicious her food, the word freedom was unknown to her. And then came her political engagement to Count Inos. She tried to love him, but he was nothing more than her brother's devoted dog. He was a man who cared nothing for her feelings and thoughts. He looked at her in that way, a cold gaze, like her brothers, who saw her as nothing but an object. The only person who had ever looked at her differently was him, and only him. She apologizes for causing inconvenience. It was naive of her to take that promise to heart. The princess burst into tears and, after saying goodbye, began to leave. Jerome stopped her and said that after all, no. Or maybe he could do it? No, after all, it wouldn't work. The boy hesitated again and stopped her again. Daphne exclaimed angrily, "Will he do it or not? Let him just say it." The boy agreed and wondered why she had suddenly changed. The girl smiled and thanked him. He said he would tell her the meeting place. In 10 days, he would wait until sunset on the 3rd floor of the Blue Cat Cafe east of the castle. No one could find out about this. They hadn't seen each other or spoken today. Afterwards, Jerome came to the protagonist's office and said he was going to Todd's for an inspection. He asked if he wanted to go alone. The boy agreed and excitedly added that he needed to check on Wolmar's handling. The protagonist noted that everything was correct. It was important. Fine, let him go first. He would also come after the next meeting. Jerome exclaimed that no, even on horseback, the journey would take at least 5 days. It would interfere with his attendance at the small state council. He would compile a report after the trip. He replied that it would take a day to get there on a wyvern. So what was he talking about? Jerome chuckled excitedly and said, "Yeah, right, there are wyverns." He'd completely forgotten it. MC asked what had happened. He hasn't been himself all week. He asked, "Is he talking about him?" "No, that's nonsense." The protagonist said that he'd assign him to deal with Todd's. Jerome thanked him, left the office, and thought about how tomorrow would be. Before, he would have refused, but now, this was madness. He had to stop immediately. After some time in the castle, Escald wondered what Icarus was even thinking. There was no reason to recommend the Viscount to the small council of state, but if the Viscount said he'd handle it, then everything would be fine. Right? They approached the entrance to the council chamber, and a guard shouted for everyone to greet His Majesty and Her Highness. Escald entered, and seeing the protagonist, gestured greeting. Tomilov approached his desk and announced that they would begin a small state council. The first item on the agenda was the matter of Duke Icarus. The man himself called out to everyone and said that what he wished to discuss today was related to Her Highness's marriage. Escald cried out in confusion. What is he talking about? He bowed his head and apologized if she found this too unexpected. Icarus noted that she had already turned 20 this year, and the situation was such that there hadn't even been a proposal yet. This had never happened in any royal family. He was concerned that the royal line might be interrupted. Therefore, he officially insisted on hastening Her Highness's marriage. One of the barons stood up and shouted, "How dare he spout such nonsense under the pretext of concern?" His face made it clear. Everyone present became enraged, saying that the Duke had said this openly because he was concerned about the future of the kingdom. So they were saying that everyone else wasn't concerned? Cotton slammed his gavel on the table and shouted for everyone to be quiet. Escald snatched the gavel from his hands and struck it furiously with the same command, causing it to break. After that, everyone calmed down and sat down. She handed over the broken pieces of the gavel and apologized for it. The princess called out to the king and asked why he wasn't saying anything. He replied that she should sit down. Escald asked if he agreed with this. Hadn't he promised that she could choose her own husband? Tomilov shouted menacingly that this was the fate of all royal children. She should stop this infantilism. The princess grew angry and started to leave the hall. Cotton called out to her and pointed out that the meeting was not over yet. She left silently, without even closing the door. Sometime later, Escald, sitting in her room with Lencia, asked what she should do now. The only person she liked was the Viscount. She replied that nothing had been decided yet. She shouldn't be categorical and not let go of his hand. The girl exclaimed that nothing had been decided yet. They clearly wanted to marry her off to Sir Justin so he could inherit the throne. The Tomilov family had 3 princesses, and by law, they had no right to inherit the crown. Duke Icarus would do whatever it took to achieve his goal. Since that was the case, maybe she should just tell everyone that her husband would be no one but Viscount Blizzard. The maid stopped her and told her to maintain her dignity. Escald screamed furiously, asking how long she could maintain that dignity. She couldn't stand it anymore. Lencia grabbed her and exclaimed that it was impossible. She understands her feelings, but if she does this, the kingdom will turn upside down. The princess replied, let her go. Everything inside her is already upside down. What difference does it make now? Suddenly, in the corridor, the protagonist exclaimed terrifyingly to the maid, "She is eavesdropping at the door of Her Highness's chambers? Whose spy is she?" The girl replied fearfully that it was not so. She was simply cleaning near the door. Escald came out to them and asked what was going on here. He replied that he came because he was worried about her, and she was eavesdropping near the room. The princess inquired if the Viscount was telling the truth. The maid, horrified, replied no, she was simply cleaning. She noted that she had not seen her before. She came here knowing that her chambers were here. The girl replied that she was sorry. Today was the first time she had been sent to this part of the palace. She still has poor orientation and must have gotten lost. Escald told her to stay out of her sight. Next time she wouldn't let it go like that. The maid thanked her and added that she wouldn't go near that place again. When she left, the princess called out to Lencia and told her to keep an eye on her. The protagonist wondered if she would just let her go. The girl replied that she had no good reason to punish her. Until they found out who was behind it, it would happen again. He asked if she had any guesses. Escald replied that there was only one person, Icarus. Most of the nobles and servants in this palace were bribed by him. Therefore, no matter what he did, no one could object. MC, with a serious expression, thought that he knew the royal family's power was weak, but he hadn't expected this. The princess asked what she should do. If things continued like this, she would marry Justin, as Icarus wanted. He replied with a smile that she shouldn't worry. He would speak to His Majesty himself. She asked if he had a way. The protagonist, with a sly smile, agreed and added that he had an idea. Sometime later, guards were searching the entire city for Daphne. At that moment, Jerome, sitting in the designated place, said worriedly that it seemed she wouldn't come. Suddenly, the girl herself burst into the room, asking how long he had waited. The guy looked out the window and saw the guards. She anxiously took his hand and asked what they should do. At this rate, they would be caught. Jerome extended his hand and told her to come here. He blocked the door with a table and chairs. Daphne, perplexed, noted that a blocked door wouldn't stop the soldiers. The guy replied that he had expected something like this, so he had brought some things with him. At that moment, the guards began knocking on the door and shouting for them to open it. She excitedly announced that they were already here. What should they do? Jerome picked up the scroll and motioned for her to hold on tightly. He recited the spell and instantly teleported them both to Todd's. Meanwhile, Tomilov, in his chambers in the castle, was thinking about how he'd succumbed to the influence of just one aristocrat. If his ancestors had seen this, they would certainly have been displeased. He shouldn't have been angry with Escald. What a pathetic father he was. Suddenly, the protagonist knocked on the door. He allowed him in and took the paper. He greeted him and said he hoped all was well. The king sighed and replied, well, he knew it himself. He wasn't in the mood for peace. The protagonist asked if he was going to hand over the princess and the kingdom to the duke. Tomilov, with a serious expression, told him to watch his language. He was sorely mistaken if he thought he'd forgive him for saving him. He replied that he had a solution. First, let the guards leave. Immediately after that, the king kicked all the guards out of the room and then said, "Let him speak." MC handed him a roll of paper and asked him to please officially publish the document he'd written. Tomilov looked at the contents of the document and noted that this way they could avoid marrying Justin, but it would simply buy them time and not solve the problem. The protagonist said he knew it was a trap. The hunter sets the trap and simply waits for the prey to fall into it. Sometime later, he arrived in Todd's and saw Jerome with Daphne. The guy excitedly said he'd explain everything. After that, they sat on the sofa and told him everything. The girl excitedly said she wouldn't inconvenience him. Please let her stay. MC noted that she was the princess and ambassador of the Heisen kingdom. Did he understand what that meant? Jerome apologized and added that he wouldn't let this cause trouble. He should please allow the princess to stay. He thought for a moment, agreed, and added that they could stay as long as they wanted. Daphne asked if he really didn't mind. She would definitely repay him. The protagonist replied that he didn't need to. He wasn't so poor as to charge a runaway princess. If even timid Jerome had dared to do such a thing, how could he turn her out? They shouldn't worry. He would keep their affair a secret. The boy became very embarrassed and exclaimed that it was disrespectful to the princess. The protagonist asked why he was angry again. Just let him admit it. He needed to discuss something with Jerome. Would she leave them alone? The girl agreed and thanked him for his hospitality. When she left, the boy apologized and noted that he had unwittingly made a promise to the princess, and he had no choice but to bring her here. He will take responsibility and return her to the kingdom of Heisen. MC, perplexed, asked why. Jerome exclaimed that if word got out that the princess was here, a war could start. He replied that he wasn't asking his servant, he was asking a real man. Is that what he wants? The guy became shy and replied that he didn't know. Suddenly, a call came through on the communication stone lying on the table. The protagonist took it and asked who it was. Edmund introduced himself and excitedly exclaimed that something important had happened. Princess Daphne of the kingdom of Heisen had been kidnapped. Count Inos had appealed to His Majesty for help, and now the entire kingdom was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. He replied that he already knew about it. If he had nothing more to say, he would hang up. Edmund said there was more. His Majesty had published a document with the official conditions for marriage with Princess Escald. The protagonist replied that he knew about that too. He'd written the document and given it to the king. If that was all, he'd disconnect. Jerome, perplexed, asked what was going on. He explained that he'd set traps to catch his prey. Now he was waiting for him to take the bait. MC reflected that Sergio had been doing whatever he wanted in the kingdom up until now, but that wouldn't continue. After a while, the Duke himself angrily exclaimed that the princess had announced she would only marry a young aristocrat who would bring glory to the kingdom within a year. How could they just announce such conditions without prior approval? Gideon replied that, as they say, a cornered mouse will kill a cat. Sir Justin, unless he manages to achieve glory, would hardly even become a candidate. But they didn't have to force him to meet those conditions. Why don't they simply eliminate everyone who fits the bill? Currently, only the eldest son of the Count's House of Slave, John, and Viscount Blizzard meet the condition. He will send an assassin to the former. The Duke inquired what to do with the main character. Gideon replied that he had received some information. If His Grace manages this correctly, they can push Blizzard and Princess Escald to the brink of disaster. The next day they began a meeting in the castle. Cotton said the first question was the Viscount's new appointment. Did anyone have any suggestions? Sergio raised his hand and said that Blizzard had proven his mastery in martial arts, and as far as he knew, due to Lord Logan's injury, the position of deputy head of the Order of the Phoenix was vacant. He would like to propose the Viscount take the position of deputy head. MC reflected on the fact that the Order of the Phoenix was the strongest knightly order in the kingdom, commanded by Count Torio. It was an elite order. If someone was truly good, they were accepted regardless of race or title. So even among the top-notch squads, it was considered the best. But it was unlikely that Sergio would give him a good position. What was the catch with the Order of the Phoenix? The protagonist thanked him with a smile and said he was far from perfect, but he would fulfill the duty entrusted to him. The Duke chuckled and remarked that he was the very picture of modesty. Who, if not him, could handle this? Another suggestion occurred to him. Did the king know that strange rumors were circulating in the castle? A week ago on Monday night, someone had seen Princess Escald and the Viscount leaving the barn together. Everyone immediately tensed at the news. MC nervously wondered if this was the very day he had saved her from freezing. Tomalov inquired if this was true. He calmly agreed. The king furiously asked how this was possible, a man and a woman in a barn at night. He had to explain himself immediately. The protagonist replied that Her Highness had gone into the barn late that night to check on an ice wyvern egg and had found herself locked inside. He had simply saved her. Sergio asked who could confirm this. According to witnesses, they were in each other's arms. Did he deny that too? The protagonist responded angrily. He would ask him to refrain from further insults to the princess and his honor. Nothing had truly happened between them that day. The Duke said he wanted to believe him, but words alone were not enough to convince people. If word spread beyond the palace and people began to doubt the princess's chastity, it would be bad. Tomalov angrily slammed the table, stood up, and declared that they would conclude the small state council for today. As Sergio left the room, he called out to Blizzard and said that as long as he lived in this castle, he would never escape his sight. Sometime later, Escald found herself in a terrible nightmare and found herself near the barn. Unknown voices began to say that this girl had abandoned her parents and gone over to the barbarians. She did not honor those who raised her. They felt sorry for Lord Meng. She wondered, perplexed, what they were talking about. The dark entities approached her and began to ask, is it she? It was she who was in the barn last night. What a disgrace. The princess has no dignity whatsoever. It's disgusting. Escald, horrified, replied that nothing had happened between her and the Viscount. The dark entities began to grab her, repeating that it was disgusting. After this, the princess awoke in her room, terrified and covered in sweat. After some time, the carriage approached the estate. The butlers opened the doors and gestured for them to enter. Arista entered and looked around in surprise. Forsway happily said, Lord Arista, welcome. Arista said, Lord Forsway, is this really Viscount Blizzard's mansion? Forsway replied, at least that's what everyone says. Arista replied that if he wasn't mistaken, it used to be the Kramer family's mansion. Forsway asked if His Majesty had perhaps lent the mansion to the Viscount in gratitude for saving him. Of course, how could he have bought such an expensive mansion? Even Duke Icarus couldn't afford such a thing. At that moment, the butler entered the hall and ordered everyone to greet Viscount Blizzard. Everyone froze in anticipation. An MC entered and said, he thanks all the distinguished guests who have come from afar. This reception is dedicated to conferring upon him the title of Viscount and his accession to the small state council. He is Lord Carolyn, deputy head of the Knightly Order of the Phoenix and the owner of this mansion, Blizzard. After a while, someone looked at him and asked, is this really the Viscount's mansion? How could someone who was recently a commoner achieve such a feat? He heard he was the sponsor of the Royal Trade Association. MC thought it was the right decision to entrust this to Edmund. Whether he was a supporter of the king or not, seeing this mansion would change anyone's attitude toward him. To change the opinion of the aristocrats under Icarus's influence, it is important for him to show that his financial power is superior. After all, what drives them is power, wealth, and authority. Rowan cried out, Lord Blizzard, thank him for inviting him to this wonderful reception. Mudok thanked Lord Rowan for coming. He said, but the princess is nowhere to be seen. MC replied, she said she couldn't come because she was feeling unwell. Rowan said with a slight mockery, I wonder what events caused her to feel unwell. The guy behind him laughed and MC frowned in irritation. Rowan said, he knows, sir. There have been rumors lately about his relationship with the princess. Is it true? MC clenched his fist in irritation, when suddenly, Vincent appeared in front of him and ordered him to take his words back. Isn't insulting the princess a mockery of the royal family? If this reaches His Majesty's ears, it won't end with an easy reprimand. Rowan turned around discontentedly and said, they'd better take care of their own territories. The guy told him to go. Vincent said, they started spending time with Duke Icarus, and seemed to have decided that they were something. He ordered Viscount Blizzard not to take it to heart. MC looked at his hands and said, thank you, Baron Vincent. If it weren't for him, he might have lost his temper and killed them. Vincent laughed loudly and said, Sir Blizzard, and he turns out to be a funny guy. This is an incredibly funny joke. Mudok looked at him puzzled and said, but this is not a joke. Vincent said that as a resident of the kingdom, he cannot silently listen to insults addressed to the princess. MC asked, by the way, is there something wrong in their territory? Vincent grabbed his head and asked, is it because of Lord Rowan's words? Monster attacks have been happening for several months. Despite the fact that they have erected fences and strengthened security measures, victims continue to appear. He feels guilty before his subjects. MC asked, did they ask for help? Vincent said, well, even the royal army could not cope with them. He must solve the problems of his land himself. Mudok said, it seems that this is the first thing he will do as the deputy head of the Order of the Phoenix. His first mission is to suppress the monsters in Baron Vincent's territory. He looked at him in surprise and thought, he will help him exterminate monsters in small holdings with absolutely no benefit to himself. And with the support of the Knights of the Order of the Phoenix, Vincent bowed and said, thank you, truly thank you. MC replied that it was the Baron's kindness that helped him engage the knights. He looked at the burning spot on his chest, and turning around, said that he had urgent matters to attend to. He would be going. They would see each other during the campaign, Lord Vincent. He left the hall, took out the crystal, and asked what had happened. Jerome replied, Lord, they had caught him. The first target, as expected, was the eldest son of the slave family. MC asked where the killer was now. He replied, in the basement of the outbuilding at the back of the mansion. After a while, he began to descend into the basement, holding a lantern in his hand. He saw Miller, who had removed the bag from the tied-up man's head. He said that he had paralyzed him with the technique he had taught him. It looked like his acupressure points had been properly sealed. MC asked, had they removed the poison? Miller replied, yes. The self-destruct poison hidden in the tooth was removed. It had been removed. Mudok released his mana and said, then. He placed his hand on the villain's head and released his mana, causing him to scream loudly. After a while, his body went limp, and then his eyes glowed red. He asked the master to give him an order. Miller asked in surprise, how did he do that? MC folded his arms across his chest and said, let him say his name. The name of the person who commanded him, and all useful information. The guy replied, his name is Sis. He received an order from Duke Icarus to kill John's slave. Mudok exhaled and said, as expected. He ordered Sis to return to Icarus and tell him that the assassination was successful, and to report to him daily about his every move. Sis replied, I understand, master. Miller asked, what is this? A mind control spell? MC replied, it's a spirit magic technique, Mahangan, the art of soul absorption. Miller asked again, soul magic? Mahangan? He asked to teach him this technique too. Mudok replied, no. Mahangan is a brainwashing technique used to select new followers in cults. Unless a person has clearly reached a level of power superior to their opponent, the technique won't work. Even if he teaches it, there's almost no one he can use it on. Miller said sadly, yes. MC folded his arms and told Sis to go. He quickly broke into a run and said, yes, sir. Mudok thought, Icarus, now it's his turn to attack. Sometime later at the estate, Sis asked, Duke, did he summon him? Sergio turned around and asked, did he do everything properly? Sis replied, yes, he dealt with John's slave. Sergio replied, I understand, he can go. Sis bowed and thanked him, and Sergio ordered him to wait. Kirsten, let him check if the suggestion is still working. The spirit appeared in the room and said, yes. He reported that the spell was still working. Sergio wondered if his fears were unfounded. He asked again, yes? He drank the wine to the bottom, leaving a couple of drops and thought, Blizzard, now it's his turn. The next day, news of John's slave's death spread throughout the capital. The reason, a fall from a horse. In their time, such things happen often, but the timing was too bad. Rumors spread quickly like a snowball, but the public couldn't know that John's slave was actually alive, and that this was all Saul Mudok's plan. After a while, MC and Miller were walking through the forest. Miller said thoughtfully, chaos must reign in the capital now. Mudok replied that it was. After all, the only candidate besides him was killed. Everyone is most likely thinking, perhaps Duke Icarus killed him. Miller said he was curious about something. Why can't the truth be revealed right away? The evidence against him is obvious. Can't they catch him now? MC replied that to make it sure, there should be no rush. He is very cautious. If they don't want to let him escape, they need to prepare more thoroughly. But there is a more important reason. Miller looked at him questioningly, and Mudok said, the rumors about Eskald have disappeared. Miller froze in surprise, and MC said, the fire is put out by a bigger fire. Now the topic of discussion was Icarus. Miller watched Mudok go and thought, he only thought about revenge, but this man was looking much further. After a while, they stopped, and Miller said, something unusual is happening here. MC asked again, is that true? There is definitely something strange behind this. Miller replied, no, that's not what he meant. Mudok looked at him questioningly, and Miller pointed down and said, he's talking about the field. Too clean, as if there were no people here. MC said, but he also knows how to leave no traces. Miller replied, he's a hired killer. And even he, if one of his legs is damaged, will leave traces. MC asked, does he mean he moves through the air? Suddenly, an arrow was aimed at them, and the guys jumped in different directions. MC asked, are those feathers? The enemy jumped onto the roof of the hut and said, so that's where that fishy smell comes from. The dirty people have arrived. The guys looked at him, and Miller asked, didn't he know either Viscount? MC replied, yes, he didn't know. He didn't think Logan would be half human. Logan said, is this the emblem of the deputy head of the Order of the Phoenix? He came on the orders of the head of the Knightly Order? He ordered his death. Miller frowned with displeasure and looked at him from under his brows, thinking, oh my god, he misunderstood. He needs to tell him the truth. MC asked mockingly, What if that's the case? Miller and Logan widened their eyes in confusion upon hearing this. Miller asked, "What is he doing? Why is he lying if it makes him angry?" MC replied, "This is a test to see if he is strong enough to work under him." Logan quickly flew up and drew his arrow. He said irritably, "Human, he will kill him." He fired his arrow towards MC, who ordered Miller to leave. He drew his sword and thought, so what is he waiting for? A battle with a birdman. What will his fight with a birdman be like?